Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today. Chapter 26, The Count's Daughter Returns. Days turned to weeks as time flew by. During this time, Berenger had been primarily overseeing the growth of the militia. By now he had met his minimum infantry goals, 4 companies of 100 men each. The artillery battery was properly taking shape as well, with 80 men and 5 guns. It would not be long until he had reached his minimum goal, but in his mind that was not good enough. He now desired a full-sized battalion and 2 artillery batteries before the war began. Though their training continued, it was done in such a manner that, when observed by outsiders, highlighted the limitations of the weapons. As such, Lambert never once felt the need to report the mass use of hand cannons and field guns to his allies, and Sieghard had no desire to conscript Berengar's forces into his standing army, which all played perfectly into the young lord's hands. Berenger was in a perfect mood today, as today was the day in which Adela returned from her trip to her homeland. Not only did he miss the company of his little fiancée, but he also desired the gold and silver hoard she would bring with her in payment to the 10 tons of steel he had sold to her father. With it, the next phase of expansion could begin to take place. Berenger, alongside his family and Linda, had stood outside in their courtyard to greet the young lattice arrival. After a long while, the banners of House von Graz appeared in the distance. Her family's coat of arms was a divided field of azure and sable in Perbend division. On it, in or swan with argent beak, feet, and eyes was emblazoned. It was a truly magnificent and detailed coat of arms, unlike that of the House von Kufstein. Their coat of arms was rudimentary in comparison. It consisted of a Perbend division in sable and or with an argent bend across its center. It was remarkably similar to the black, white, and red shield decal seen on German helmets in World War I and II during Berengar's previous life, with the exception of the red being replaced by gold. Despite House von Graz's far more complex design, Berenger felt a certain sense of pride in his own family's banner. It reminded him of his great-grandfather from his previous life, who served in trenches of the Great War as a soldier in the Kaiser's army. After the German Empire's collapse, his family fled the fatherland for greener pastures in America. As Berenger reminisced about his past life, Adela's caravan had arrived inside the courtyard. The moment her luxurious carriage stopped in front of the family, its doors swung open and the little girl jumped out of the carriage and into Berengar's arms, wrapping around his waist like a spider monkey. The young lord barely had enough time to stabilize himself as he caught a hold of his fiancée, who pecked him on the cheek with her precious lips. "I missed you. Did you miss me?" was the first thing the girl said as she clung to her fiancé in front of his family. While the family was stunned by the outburst, Linda had a pouting expression on her face. Now Berengar's fiancée had arrived, she would have less time with her lord and master to herself. Luckily, everyone was too stunned by Adela's actions to notice Lindy's sulking eyes. She would have a hard time explaining the look on her face if her fiancé had caught wind of it. After Berenger had pried himself away from the young girl's grasp, he asked her the question which was on everyone's minds. "So, is it all here?" Adela quickly recovered and realized the degree of affection she had just showed Berenger in public. As such, her cheeks quickly flushed with embarrassment. Nevertheless, like a proper noble lady, she calmed her heart and pointed to the servants carrying large crates filled with silver and gold. It was not until all of them piled up did she boldly declare, "My father is a man of his word. The agreed amount of our transaction is in these crates in the form of gold and silver ingots. Count Otto von Graz wishes to express his thanks for supplying such a large amount of steel and looks forward to future cooperation." Berenger smiled as he ordered a few of his family's servants to check the authenticity of the crates. Though he trusted Adela's words, he was still a cautious man and had each ingot inspected. Only after its worth was confirmed was the mass of gold and steel transferred to the treasury. He now had the ability to invest in the textile industry, expand the capacity of the mines, and by extension, his steel surplus, which would come in handy for the many inventions he had planned. Once the irrigation system was fully in place, he would have many unemployed farmers who could begin work in the mines or the factories. Things were truly going according to his plans. After Adela's arrival, the family threw a feast to celebrate her return. She thoroughly enjoyed the lavish cuisine she had so desperately missed during her absence. Berenger found the young girl's appearance as she devoured the food with a satisfied expression on her doll-like face to be incredibly cute. However, Linda could not help but glare at her rival. Even if she would never be the wife, Linda still did not like to see Berenger show his young fiancé such a different side of himself that he showed to her. Her menacing gaze did not go unnoticed by Adela. She could not understand why Linda disliked her so much. It must be the fact that the two brothers were feuding after all. It's not as if they were currently fighting for the affection of the same man. After the meal was over, Berenger immediately got to work. Though he wanted to spend the day with Adela, pockets needed to be filled with coins to ensure his engagement ceremony was well supplied, his forces well equipped, and his factories manned. His father would normally handle the investiture into the mines, but the Baron had been delegating more and more responsibility to his son and heir recently. As such, Berenger quickly found himself managing the mines, which worked perfectly for his plans. It also meant that his father was testing him. If he could handle such a monumental task efficiently, he might be able to earn the title regent. Maybe his father was also aware of the upcoming war and was beginning to make his preparations. For now, Berenger could not know the truth of the matter. Thus he handled his business as best as he could. Supplies were brought in to improve the mines, and blueprints were drafted by mining safety standards and improvements from the industrial era. The last thing Berenger wanted on his hands was a collapsed mine. As such, he practically overhauled the system in place overnight in which the mines had used for centuries. One of these critical inventions was the safety lamp, which would provide adequate lighting in volatile areas where other lamps and candles could be hazardous. Mining was dangerous and backbreaking work. The least Berenger could do was apply safety standards and equipment and an adequate paycheck to compensate the workers for the work hazards that may appear. What would really speed up the process of mining was dynamite. Though he knew the chemical equation to create such a thing, he lacked a knowledgeable chemist and a production facility to manufacture it. He seriously needed to get his hands on an alchemist which he could personally tutor in chemistry, but unfortunately there was none within a small region like his family's. However, he decided it was better to have a chemical laboratory he could utilize within his spare time than to have no ability to produce chemicals whatsoever. As such, he put aside a small portion of the mining funds to construct a chemical laboratory and the equipment necessary to outfit it. As long as he requested the funding under the guise of miscellaneous mining innovations, his father would approve it. Thus the young lord quickly drafted the plans necessary for such production. Though he had limited spare time nowadays, he needed to produce supplies that required basic chemistry. It was better to have a system in place before he had a proper chemist than a proper chemist and no means of production. While he was in the middle of his work, he heard a knock on his door, which he quickly responded to. After opening the door, he saw his darling little fiancée dressed in a pastel pink velvet gown and a tray of snacks in her hands. She knew her fiancé was busy with work, but she still desired to spend some time with him, even if it was just watching him a snack while he was hard at work. A large German cheesecake sat on the tray, which the young girl had begun to divide up into pieces for the couple to consume. After taking a bite from the delicious cheesecake, Berenger could feel a tear forming in his eyes. It was exactly as his mother used to make. After all, it was her recipe that he remembered. Nevertheless, he could not help but feel a sense of longing for his old home. He started to wonder how his family reacted to his death. He had been too busy with work and school in his adult life to visit home often. Eventually, he drifted apart from his family. He began to lament that he had not spent more time with his parents before he passed. It was a shame. He was an only child and had perished in Afghanistan. His parents were sure to regret that he had never produced grandchildren for them. As he began to think about his grieving parents with no grandchildren to comfort them, the tears in his eyes began to produce more rapidly, which did not go unnoticed by his loving fiancée who sat next to him. Adela noticed the tears streaming from Berengar's eyes and tried to comfort him. She had no idea what would cause such a strange reaction. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Berenger wiped the tears from his eyes and smiled. He felt ashamed of himself for crying in front of a little girl like Adela. Yeah, I'm fine. The taste brings back memories." Adela did not know what memories he could be referring to. As far as she was aware, these recipes were his inventions. They had never been seen before. At this moment, Berenger finally realized he had not answered the girl's question from when she first returned and looked softly into her eyes as he spoke truthfully with her. "I did miss you, Adela. I'm sorry I wasn't able to say so earlier." The young lady immediately began to blush as she heard his words. She was not expecting him to say such a thing. For the next half hour, she shared the snacks with Berenger, and by the time they were finished, she was satisfied with the small time she spent with her fiancé. She was finally able to figure out if he felt anything during her weeks of absence. The young girl thought that she was lucky to have such a loving fiancé. If she knew he was cheating on her with his brother's fiancé behind her back, she probably would not have such thoughts. However, she did not know, and Berenger intended to keep it that way. It was best not to have your wife find out about your concubine if you could avoid it. Who knows what reprisal he might face if she were to become aware of his complicated relationship with Linda. So he continued to lie to his little fiancée, and she continued to believe him. After some time, Adela had left Berengar's chambers and Berenger focused on his work. All of his plans for the mines and the industry he had drafted were either delivered to Ludwig for implementation or sent to his father's desk for approval. The engagement ceremony's plans had been put into action by competent people beneath his father's command, and the family's coffers were filled to the brim. With it, another day's work had come to an end. He sighed heavily as he sat back in his comfy leather chair and watched the moon in the sky above. Any minute now, Linda would knock on his door and beg for attention, and he would spend the rest of his waking hours disciplining her for being so obviously jealous at Adela's arrival. It was good to be a noble scion, even if he was merely a baron's son. Chapter 27, Visiting the Mines. As the rise of dawn awoke Berenger from his slumber, he quickly got dressed and left Linda by her lonesome in his quarters as she still slept. Today would be a hectic day for Berenger as he personally visited the mines to oversee their expansion. He did not even have time to work out this morning. For the next couple of weeks, Berenger would be at the mines near the village of Wildskana. Wildskana was currently under the direct control of one of Sieghard's vassals known as Lord Ulrich von Wildskana. It was a perfect chance to leave a favorable impression on the miner lord and his family. After all, the rumors of Berenger being a petty, indolent, and sickly young lord were still prominent outside of the town of Kufstein and those who have had direct contact with him. After grabbing a quick snack in which the chefs woke up early to prepare for his journey, Berenger left his family's estate while only leaving a letter to inform them of his absence. He was a man of action, and since he had decided to oversee this venture personally, he would not waste time with parting words, especially since he would only be gone for a few weeks at most. As he stepped into one of his family's carriages and looked back at the window to his room in the tower up above, he could see Lindy's heavenly figure gazing down at him as she waved goodbye. Evidently, his absence had awoken the beauty from her precious sleep. Berengar's parting gift to her was the kiss he blew in her direction before stepping into the carriage, which swiftly took off from the castle and regrouped with the supply caravan down in the town below. He would travel for several hours before reaching the lordship of Wildskana. When his caravan arrived, Berenger stepped out of his carriage to greet Lord Ulrich and his family. He had sent a letter in advance to inform the lord of his arrival. As the baron's son and heir, he still had to follow the proper etiquette when approaching his family's vassal territory. After stepping out of his carriage, the expressions on the family's faces went from forcing a gracious smile to deep shock. Berenger had appeared far different from the last time they had met. Though they could not see the extent of his fitness beneath his fine doublet, they could tell that his skin had a healthy glow and that his cheeks were no longer sunken. Evidently, the sickly boy they once knew had recovered from his childhood infirmity. Berenger approached Lord Ulrich, who bowed before him. After all, despite his preconceptions about Berenger as a person, the young lord was still the son of the baron and, as such, held a higher position than him. "My lord, it is a great honor to host your stay at our humble abode." Lord Ulrich was a man in his early 30s, and his wife was nearly 10 years younger. They were a young couple, and Ulrich had recently acquired the title of lord from his late father. He was not exceptionally handsome, nor was he sufficiently strong. He was truly an average guy all around, at least from an aesthetic perspective. The man had mid-length dirty blonde hair and ocean blue eyes with a trimmed beard to match his hair color. His skin was not as fair as Berengar's, nor was it as tanned as the commoners. His wife shared a strikingly similar appearance to Ulrich, and Berenger began to wonder if they were related in some way. In her hands she held an infant boy, which was the third son of Ulrich. Kneeling next to the couple were another two boys who were in their formative years. The little tykes gazed up at Berengar's with a sense of wonder. This was the first time they had met a family member of the baron, and they were well aware of the position he held in the household. Berenger motioned for the family to rise as he put on a charming smile. "You honor me with your kind words, Lord Ulrich. I'm merely here on business and will be spending most of my time at the mines. However, I will not turn down the hospitality you have shown me. Be aware that I may otherwise be preoccupied to become acquainted with your fine household fully." Berengar's words were chosen wisely. He did not wish to offend Lord Ulrich or his house, but he also needed to make it clear that he would be swamped overseeing the expansion of the mines. Thus he would not be able to entertain his hosts properly. On the other hand, Lord Ulrich nearly sighed in relief as he heard those words. The last time he had met Berenger, the young lord had acted like a spoiled brat of lower intellect. He wanted to avoid wasting time with such a wastrel if at all given a chance. However, Ulrich was quite shocked by how Berenger was behaving. It was quite different from his old self. Ulrich quickly dismissed his family when Berenger made it clear he wanted to head to the mines as quickly as possible. He personally elected to guide the youth to the mines. If this petty young lord was overseeing the expansion of the mines in which Sieghard had ordered, it was best for him to stay close by and prevent any mishaps. As the two noblemen got into the carriage and departed for the mines, Ulrich could not help but ask about the project. "So, what are the plans for expanding the mines?" A smile appeared on Berengar's face as he began a long discussion about the new safety standards, which included a more robust support system to prevent mine collapses and the safety lamp. He also demanded proper work hours and sufficient payment, which the baron would personally take care of. There was also the ban on child labor in the mines, in which Berenger had gotten approval from his father. Eventually, Berenger informed Ulrich that he would be using gunpowder to blast certain areas of the mine open, revealing new veins to extract the ore from. Because he did not have dynamite, Berenger had to use gunpowder and lots of it to expand the mining shafts rapidly. It was a risky move, but he was willing to take it. As long as it was done properly, he could mitigate the risks of the mine collapsing on the workers. Luckily for him, he had been stockpiling black powder for use in his militia. He had an overabundance of it, which he felt fearful leaving lying around in his own territory. Thus Berenger had opted to bring quite a lot of it with him to aid in blasting open the mines. After hearing all of Berengar's plans in great detail, the man could not believe that the petty, dull, and indolent young lord he knew years past had come up with such an extensive plan to overhaul the mines. It would take weeks to implement, but if it were done successfully, the productivity of the mines would skyrocket, especially since Berenger brought with him some of the unemployed farmers to act as the additional workforce. Until Berenger could build steam engines and a proper rail system, he would be forced to relocate families to the territory ruled by Lord Ulrich to increase mining productivity. Berenger also handed the Lord a set of documents that contained all the details of his 4-field system. He would also supply the Lordship's fields with enough fertilizer to last the season. However, Berenger had no plans to inform Ulrich about the irrigation system at the moment. Until the fields of Kufstein could properly field the irrigation system itself, he would not lend the knowledge behind its implementation to Ulrich. For now, he wanted to increase crop yields in his vassal's territory, and gifting the 4-field system to his vassals posed no major disadvantage. Even if Ulrich leaked it to other regions, the increase in food production throughout Europe as a whole was a good thing. His plans to be the breadbasket of Austria would still come true even if everyone else found out about the 4-field system, as that was not his only agricultural innovation that would result in massive growth. When Ulrich looked over the designs of the 4-field system, he could not believe his eyes. He had to ask the question on his mind at that moment. You came up with this?" Berenger smiled gracefully when he responded to Ulrich. "I came up with the theory, but I had some help from a good friend testing it. We won't know how effective the results are until this year's harvest. However, I myself and many others are fairly certain there are at the very least no disadvantages to this system." The man could not believe what he was hearing. Berenger had gifted him this information without asking for anything in return. This knowledge would greatly affect his crop yields and, in turn, the income his land would garner. Why would Berenger give this tremendous knowledge away for free? What do you want in return for this information? Berenger continued to smile as he assured the Lord that there was nothing he wanted from exchanging information. "There is nothing I want in return for these designs. The more food we produce in our lands, the better it is for everyone and the fewer farmers we need. The unemployed farmers can then be put to work in the mines. I have great plans for the resources those mines contain, and I will need every hand I can get in producing it." Ulrich struggled to believe Berenger was so benevolent. He was truly gifting him this knowledge free of charge merely so that his commoners were more productive? The Lord had a hard time grasping such a concept. Of course, he had no way of knowing how grand Berengar's plans were for the industrialization of the barony and its vassal territories. As such, he could hardly think of the need for a massive workforce. Ultimately, after some time to think for himself, Ulrich accepted the plans and promised to have the 4-field system and the use of the phosphate fertilizer he had been gifted implemented as soon as possible. "I humbly accept the designs and will do my very best to implement them as quickly as I can." Berenger smiled graciously at the man's humble demeanor. Lord Ulrich truly knew his place in this world, a quality he could not say everyone had. After a long conversation about the ongoing changes in Kufstein, the supply caravan finally arrived at the mines, where they saw a camp set up outside of its entrance. Many of the miners had a difficult time returning to their families with all the work they were required to do, and as such had built a shantytown outside of the mine's entrance, which the miners referred to as Miner Village. Berenger found himself disgusted by the conditions these poor peasants were forced to live in and vowed that he would at least make some improvements to their temporary housing. After all, with the 40-hour workweek being introduced as one of Berengar's many safety and wellness innovations, they would no longer be forced to work until they dropped from exhaustion. After getting out of the carriage in which the 2 noblemen had ridden, the miners stood at attention as they noticed the arrival of their lord, who ruled over the territory they found themselves dwelling in. It was sporadic for him to visit the mines, and many men did not react. Berenger, however, was the first to speak. As you were. He had many things to handle in the upcoming weeks and did not have the time to mingle with the locals. Eventually, dozens of men started getting out of the caravan and bringing supplies over to improve the mines. Seeing the handsome and well-dressed men standing next to their lord and giving commands, the miners with more common sense took it to mean that Berenger was their boss and swiftly obeyed his orders and got back to work, only asking each other and the newcomers about who the man was with the slick-back golden hair. After several hours, the miners became used to Berenger giving commands as he stared at a map of the mines and their current excavation process. It would be a long and arduous journey to get these mines up to code. However, Berenger would be damned if he failed to return in time for his engagement ceremony. As such, he once more burned the midnight oil. It was not until the whistle blew and the miners returned to their shacks did Berenger finally get some rest. He would work as long as the miners did and lead by example. That was always how he had handled things when in a leadership position, and would not change now just because he faced the dangers of the mines. Berenger lied down in a makeshift cot under a lean-to shelter as he gazed up the moon and stars above, thinking about his past and present life. Eventually, he fell to sleep thinking about the 2 lovely girls waiting for his return. Chapter 28, Cave-In. By the time dawn arrived, Berenger was already awake and hard at work overseeing the mine's construction. He acted like a true overseer as he issued orders left and right. If one way within the vicinity, he could feel the ground shaking and the sounds of explosions as he commanded the workforce he brought with him to blast their way through the solid portions of rock with gunpowder caskets. The debris was rapidly cleared and support beams were put in place to prevent a collapse. This was how Berenger spent the entirety of his time during the initial week after his arrival. He would personally go into the mining shafts to inspect the progress several times a day at regular intervals. Berenger had personally led these men through the current overhaul of the mines and had championed their cause for better working conditions. As such, he felt as if he was safe among these hard-working men, for in their eyes was a level of genuine respect rarely afforded to someone of Berengar's status by the common people. It was the same gaze the people of Kufstein gave Berenger every time they laid eyes upon him. Berenger felt happy knowing that he had made a positive impact in the people's lives under his family's dominion. He did not think for one second that the people whose lives he had improved would turn on him. After all, who would harm their benefactor? Ulrich had visited the mines several times throughout the week and was amazed by Berengar's progress. If things continued as planned, Berenger would be able to complete the project in a total of 3 weeks, which was slightly over his initial projection. Nevertheless, it gave Berenger ample time to prepare for his upcoming engagement ceremony, in which he had personally handed Ulrich his invitation. Everything seemed to be going as planned, that is, until 3 days after the second week of the project had begun. One afternoon, while Berenger was going through one of his regular inspections, he was led rather deeply into the mine by the foreman he had placed in charge. Despite this, he initially did not feel any sense of danger. After all, this man was one of many who had directly benefited from Berengar's labor reformations. By the time Berenger had reached the end of the mine shaft, he had begun to feel a bit suspicious. He had not encountered any miners for the last 300 yards aside from the foreman he traveled with. After coming to a volatile section of the mine shaft, the supervisor turned around while holding onto his safety lamp. The bright flame illuminated the eerie smile that spread across the man's lips as he mouthed the words, "Your brother Lambert sends his regards." As soon as the man said those words, Berenger instantly realized he had been led into a trap. He had been surrounded by allies for far too long and had forgotten a valuable life lesson from his previous life. Greed and avarice will always prevail over good and virtue as long as the price was right. Even the most honorable of men would do the most despicable things. He had no way of knowing it at the time, but this man who under Berengar's guidance had seen his life and that of his families vastly improved had been paid an extensive sum by Lambert to lead Berenger to his death. Before Berenger could react, the man sprinted behind him towards the exit. A second after passing him by, a blast went off, collapsing the tunnel upon the young lord. Then everything went dark. Hours passed before Berenger regained consciousness. He was pinned under a giant stone and had difficulty breathing. His body was aching, and he could feel blood dripping from his forehead. There was no light nor sound, only the feeling of pain reverberating throughout his body. Debris filled the air, causing the young lord to choke as he cursed himself for being foolish enough to follow the man alone into the mine shaft. God fucking damn it. This is what I get for trusting people so easily. After venting out his frustration, Berenger attempted to lift the stone that was lying across his chest. The large stone must have weighed 150 pounds, and under the circumstances, he had a hard time lifting it off of his chest. Luckily for him, he had been using his bench press extensively over the past few months and had made significant gains in that time. Through much effort, he could lift the rock off his chest and slide it to the side, allowing him ample space to breathe. As the young lord looked around to get his bearings straight, he could see very little. However, a few yards away, he could see the light shining through the cavern, which gave him hope. At least there was fresh air circulating through the cut-off region. Hopefully, the others would notice he was missing and send a rescue party. The biggest problem he currently faced was that he had nothing to drink, which meant if the search party could not find him within 3 days, then he was destined to die again, and so shortly after, he had reincarnated in this world. That, of course, was assuming that a search party would be sent after him. After all, if the foreman betrayed him, who's to say the others weren't in on it as well? Things were not looking good for Berenger at the moment. As such, he spent the next 30 minutes looking for an escape route. When he found out that he was well and truly trapped, he could only rely on the grace of God for his salvation. The night after Berenger was trapped in the mineshaft, Lambert opened a letter in his chambers addressed to him by Lord Ulrich von Wildskana. The contents of the letter were as followed. Dear Lambert, son of Sieghard von Kufstein and the rightful heir to the barony of Kufstein. With great pleasure, I inform you that your brother has been trapped within a mineshaft and currently has no means of escape. It will only be a matter of days until you are officially recognized as the heir to your family's lands. I congratulate you early on succeeding your father and gaining the title Baron of Kufstein. I will make sure to be at your wedding in the coming months. I trust you know what to do with this letter after you have finished reading it. Sincerely, Ulrich von Wildskana. After reading the letter, Lambert lit a candle and was about to set it ablaze when Linda walked through the door to his bedchamber. Seeing what the young boy was about to do, she felt as if something had gone terribly wrong and immediately inquired about the details of his latest scheme. Is that a letter from my father? Lambert pulled the letter away from the flame and handed it over to Linda with a deeply satisfied smile spread across his lips. Better, it is a letter from the Lord of Wildskana informing me that has taken care of our little problem. Linda hardly listened to Lambert's little narration as she studied the contents of the letter. When she read about Berengar's precarious situation, she could not prevent herself from breaking into tears, which Lambert immediately noticed. Confused and suspicious, Lambert got up and approached his fiancée with a concerned facade. What's wrong? Are you all right? Finally noticing that she was choking back tears with her free hand over her mouth, Lynn began to wipe the tears from her eyes and did her best to reclaim her calmness despite the wavering of her heart. Yes? Of course, these are tears of joy. We are one step closer to our goal. Lambert, though initially suspicious, ended up believing the heavenly beauties act. However, before he could further advance their relationship, she tossed the letter and pushed Lambert aside. If you'll excuse me, I need to write to my father about our success. With that said, Linda rushed out the door. It was only after she was out of sight that she began to break out into tears, which crashed down around her as she ran to the only person she knew who could save Berenger if he was still alive, that was. Ludwig stood in his shop operating the trip hammer as he pounded an ingot of high-carbon steel into the form of a sword. Though it had been many years since he last built a sword, it was something he would never forget how to do. The masterpiece's design he was working on was referred to in Berengar's many records as a sidesword. A design that would usually not be made for the next 100 years, yet due to the many projects Berenger had spent time designing existed solely in the form of blueprints until now. Initially, when Berenger was started learning swordplay, he wanted a proper sword designed for himself. Though he later scratched the idea, the design still existed within the confines of the old engineer's shop. Ludwig and his team of smiths, engineers, and metalworkers had all banded together to create a wedding present for Berenger. Though it was years away, they rarely had downtime, so after hours, they would spend a little bit of time each day working on their masterpiece to present the young lord as a token of their appreciation for everything he had done in their lives. Here in Kufstein, Lambert had no allies among the common population, and the level of respect they had for Berenger was beyond the means of simple bribery. Everything was calm and quiet on this evening, and only Ludwig was currently still in the shop working on the design of the production of the exquisite sword. Just for Berenger, he had made the weapon out of crucible steel. Due to Berengar's innovations, he created a small crucible furnace solely for the production of fine crucible steel to be used in presentation-grade swords. Crucible steel was not common in European countries in either timeline but was largely used by Eastern civilizations, the variations of which had different names such as Damascus or wood steel. Berenger had always mentioned how beautiful crucible steel swords were and had much desired one for himself, even though he felt the sword would soon become largely ceremonial. While Ludwig was in the process of creating the sword blade, he heard the doors to his shop swing open and immediately looked up at the disturbance. Linda, the heavenly beauty, Lambert's fiancée, was standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her face and a nervous expression as she shouted at Ludwig in a pleading tone. You have to help him. You have to save Berenger. This perplexed Ludwig, as the man had heard on several occasions when drinking with Berenger that there was a cabal of nobles conspiring against him to remove him from his inheritance, and it was all led by Lambert. He could not understand why Lambert's fiancée would say such a thing and was immediately suspicious. He instantly stopped what he was doing and backed away from the girl who had a crazy expression in her eyes. Help him how? Save him from what? Linda struggled to find the words to say and tried to calm herself down. After several seconds she was able to articulate her thoughts properly. Lambert, he got the Lord of Wildskana to collapse the mines on top of him. He might be dead already. Ludwig could see the genuine look of concern on the beautiful girl's face and was deeply confused by this. He accidentally let his thoughts slip through his tongue. You're Lambert's fiancée, why do you want to save Berenger? Linda instantly became aware that Ludwig knew about her fiancé's intent to assassinate Berenger and could not come up with an excuse for her actions. As she stared at the old man who was waiting patiently for her answer, she had no choice but to tell the truth. After all, Ludwig was Berengar's dear friend and could be trusted, right? Because I love him. Ludwig heard this and could not help but mumble beneath his breath. Fucking nobles? However, he could tell from the look on her doll-like face that she was telling the truth, and as such he sighed heavily. All right, I'll go gather the boys. If he's still alive, well, save him. If not, well, let's not think about that. With that said, Ludwig rushed off to gather the men and supplies he needed to mount a rescue expedition. If the Lord of Wildskana was on Lambert's side, then there was no way his own men, the miners, would help in the search for the young lord. He had no hope but to gather as many people as he could as quietly as he could. His first stop was to Eckhard Berengar's second-in-command of the militia. They needed to be rallied and quickly. If Ulrich were really on Lambert's side, he would not allow excavation to occur, and the rescue force needed an army loyal to Berenger to protect them in case things turned bloody. If he reported this matter to Sieghard, he would need proof to obtain his help. Even if he could convince the Baron, it would become a political battle between a Baron and his vassal. By the time help arrived, the young lord would be dead. When Eckhard heard the news from Ludwig, he did not hesitate to muster the militia. By midnight, an army of 600 men and 6 cannons were on the march to the lordship of Wildskana, alongside the hundreds of volunteers whose aim was to rescue Berenger. Just as the young lord was about to lose faith in the bonds he had sewn with the commoners, they would reward him in a greater capacity than he could ever ask of them. Chapter 29. The Age of Nights has already passed. Under the cover of night, the army in which Berenger had formed rapidly covered the distance between Kufstein and Wildskana. By the time the dawn had arrived, they had occupied Mining Town and detained Ulrich's workers. The sappers in the field began to construct fortifications surrounding the mining towns. By the end of the day, the makeshift town would resemble a miniature version of fortifications used during the siege of Petersburg from Berengar's previous life. The volunteer militia manned the fortifications while others interrogated the workers that had been detained. Eckhard personally oversaw this effort. He began by speaking to the workforce Berenger had brought with him, which was far more loyal to the people of Kufstein where they had grown up. However, they were unaware of the assassination plot, but when they heard that Berenger might be stuck in the mines, they quickly revealed the only information they knew, which was that the foreman had led Berenger into the mines during a routine excavation and that they were oddly ordered to withdraw. Nobody saw Berenger again after that, but a large explosion was heard which they had assumed was regular construction. When Berengar's workers had asked the foreman about their lord's whereabouts, the man claimed that Berenger had left to visit Lord Ulrich. After hearing such information, Eckhard immediately seized the foreman who had already been detained and violently tortured the man for the information regarding the exact location where Berenger had been trapped. After some good old medieval justice, the man sang like a canary and the rescue operations had begun. Meanwhile, Berenger was trapped inside the confines of the collapsed shaft. He had no food or water and was slightly injured. It was a miracle that no serious injury had occurred. He was slightly concussed and possibly had a broken rib. Luckily, it had not punctured his lung, or else he would long since have passed from this world. His throat was dry as he had not quenched his thirst since before the caveat, and while stuck in the darkness with no way out, he began to become deeply paranoid about the forces conspiring against him. He swore that if he survived this ordeal, he would personally lay siege to Ulrich's castle and drag him to the dungeons by the throat. There was simply no possibility the Lord of Wildskana was not involved in this attempt on Berengar's life. Shortly after having such thoughts, he had heard a muffled voice behind the rubble which he could barely recognize as belonging to Ludwig. "My lord, can you hear me? Are you alive in there?" With a hoarse voice caused by dehydration and breathing in the fumes of the debris, Berenger managed to converse with the man behind the wall. "Ludwig? Is that you? How the hell did you find me?" Ludwig had an enormous smile spread across his face when he heard that the young lord was still alive. He began to speak awkwardly as he confessed to how he found out about his current predicament. "Aye, it's me. Though I'm not one capable of judging the actions of the nobility such as yourself, your brother's fiancée revealed your current situation to me as she begged me to save your life." Berenger could not help but chuckle, but groaned in pain as he did so. He had definitely fractured a rib, and it made breathing difficult and laughing agonizing. "Dear Lord, do I love that woman. She came through for me once again. I'm seriously going to need to reward her this time." Ludwig could tell by the tone of Berengar's voice what the young lord was implying and could not help but sigh. It is good to be young. After getting out those words, he decided to inform Berenger of what was transpiring. "Just hang on, I've got hundreds of the villagers to come to your rescue. You should be out of there in no time." Berenger quickly realized the problem with this. There was not the slightest possibility that their actions would go unnoticed by Ulrich. After all, this was his land that they were currently standing upon. When the Lord found out that there was an ongoing attempt to rescue the target of his assassination, he would undoubtedly send his army in an attempt to cover his tracks. As such, he began to give orders to Ludwig. "Ludwig, my friend, you need to get Eckhard to muster the militia. When the Lord of Wildskana finds out what you were doing, he will surely send his army to eliminate you all." Ludwig could not help but chuckle. He knew what Berenger was thinking and had already acted accordingly. "Please rest assured, my lord, Sir Eckhard and his men are already here fortifying the position as we speak. All 600 men and 6 guns are currently in a position to defend this mine with their lives." 600 men and 6 guns? Fucking Christ, I need to give these guys a raise. They are working way too hard. Berenger thought to himself as he laid down and waited for rescue. For now, he had no choice but to wait for the excavation to be complete. If Ulrich showed up with his meager army during this time, he would be in for a rude awakening. The might of his militia was not to be underestimated, though the feudal forces of this world were sure to do so. A soldier in the field was in the process of cleaning his musket. This musket was personally designed by Berenger and was named the 1417 land pattern musket, and it was quite an anachronistic design. It utilized a 46-inch barrel much like the infamous Brown Bess used by the British Army for a length of time, and a similar flintlock design. Yet, the stock was closer in design used by the early doglock muskets utilized by English forces during the English Civil War. As such, the firearm maintained quite the Renaissance aesthetic. The primary difference in the design of the stock was that it had been cut off shorter at the end of the barrel to allow for the attachment of a socket bayonet. The stock also had sling swivels, and each musket was equipped with a leather sling. The 46-inch barrel was bored in a .58 caliber and had iron sights similar to the 1861 Springfield rifled muskets used by Union forces during the American Civil War. The reason for these two things was that they were all manufactured with the intent to be rebaired and rifled for the use of the .58 caliber mini-ball projectile when the factory could handle such an extensive workload. It was truly a unique design, blending components of 3 eras of musket development from Berengar's past life. This was a weapon designed with 2 purposes in mind: waging war in the most efficient manner available and looking good while doing it. The soldiers who wielded this mighty weapon were using their downtime to clean their muskets and ensure everything was functioning properly. It would not be long before Ulrich and his armies arrived. Though they had quite the defensive position as well as a numerical advantage, most of these men had never seen a battlefield before. Those who had been in the field were now officers and NCO respectively and formed the veteran backbone necessary to lead their men properly. Against a professional and experienced force, things might not go so smoothly. As the sun began to set, the soldier cleaning his musket pointed into the distance as he saw a scout on horseback riding off towards the castle. A scout? Where's the marksman? Take him out now. Berenger had implemented tactics from modern doctrine and installed a designated marksman with a long rifle into each platoon to engage targets a larger distance. The marksman was already aware of the target and had loaded his rifle in the meantime. When he finally was able to get a shot off, the scout was at a distance of roughly 250 yards, though that was not a problem for the rifle he wielded, which was a replica of the one Berenger had used to take out the assassins during his hunting trip. Slowly but surely, the dirty peasant, clad in earthly linen clothing, lined up his sights, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. After a thunderous explosion and a puff of smoke, the mini-ball projectile was sent down range and pierced the back of the scout, who was riding off to report to his master to inform him about the occupation of the mining town. A massive hole appeared in the man's torso as the mini-ball pierced through his brigandine breastplate as if it were made of single-weave linen. Ultimately, the horse was frightened by the blast and, with no concern for the rider which had fallen of its back bleeding out into the dirt below, rode off towards the castle from which it had come. When the horse returned without a rider, it immediately invoked suspicion. As such, Ulrich knew something had happened to the scout he sent to oversee the rumors of an occupying force at mining town. He had no idea how large the force was or who it belonged to, but an enemy force had seized the land right under his nose. This was an insult to his authority, and if he could not handle it himself, he would only lose the trust in the baron whose son and heir he had just assassinated. His first course of action was to muster his troops. As a lowly lord, he only had a dozen or so knights under his command and at most 100 men at arms. Still, his warriors were well experienced, and he had little doubt what he was facing was merely a pack of brigands. When he finally arrived with his army, he was shocked to see many peasants armed with what appeared to be oddly shaped spears. He was unaware of the invention of the musket or the earlier hand cannon for that matter. It was an especially rare piece of equipment during this time. As such, he vastly underestimated the forces in which Berengar's allies had brought to aid him. Lord Ulrich approached the fortifications and inquired about the identity of the peasant rabble who dared to offend him. "I am Lord Ulrich von Wildskana, under whose authority do you trespass on my territory and occupy my mines?" Eckhard stepped out in front of the defensive line and approached Ulrich. Unlike the rest of his troops, he was properly equipped with the munitions-grade half-plate armor prototype. Adorning his head was a Sturmhaube or Bergonet, a type of helmet that would normally not be developed for the next century or two. Ludwig was able to sneak a few sets into production for the officers and NCOs of the militia. In Eckhard's hands was a musket with its bayonet attached, which he rested on the ground as he chatted with Ulrich. "I am Sir Eckhard, retainer to Lord Berenger, son and heir of Sieghard von Kufstein, the baron who presides over these lands. It is under his authority that I am here." Ulrich's face instantly turned ugly. This meant Berenger was still alive and somehow could muster such a force to come to his rescue. Things were not going well. Luckily, Berenger would only know that Lambert was behind this plot and had no proof of his involvement. As such, Ulrich tried to play it cool. After all, the forces he was up against were practically 6 times the size of his own. Even if they were unarmored peasants armed with sticks and spears, such numbers still posed a threat. "As far as I'm aware, Berenger left back towards his home a while ago without paying proper respects. Why would he order you here?" Eckhard spit in the general direction of Lord Ulrich, which was an enormous slap to his face. "Cut the crap, my lord. We know you are responsible for the cave-in. I suggest you lay down your arms and surrender to justice. If you confess to the actions of the real mastermind behind this plot, I promise in the name of my liege, Berenger von Kufstein, you will be granted leniency." This response shocked and outraged Ulrich. There was no way of knowing that he was involved in this plot unless Lambert turned on him or someone in his employ did. Though why Sieghard would send this rabble to bring him to justice instead of his own army, Ulrich could not understand. The truth that he was incapable of understanding was this was Berengar's private militia and was fully capable of bringing down the lord and his army. Hell, they could even lay siege to his castle if they wanted to. Ulrich threatened Eckhard further in an attempt to strike fear into the hearts of the peasants who followed him. "When I return with my levies, I will teach you a thorough lesson in the art of war." Eckhard chuckled at Ulrich's comments, which thoroughly provoked the lord. "What's so funny?" Eckhard stared at Ulrich with a look of contempt as he spoke the blatant truth. "My lord, you could attack this position with 10-fold the numbers you currently possess, and the result would still be the same. If you march on this position, only death awaits yourself and those who are foolish enough to follow. If you run and hide in your castle, I promise that we will follow you, and when we tear down those mighty walls in which you cower behind, I will personally see to it that Berenger is the one who rips you from your seat of power by the throat." Eckhard was clearly the victory in this war of threats that was currently ongoing between a fallen knight and the Lord of Wildskana. The more Eckhard spoke, the more Ulrich was enraged by his words and made foolish comments. Really? How do you expect to accomplish this without any knights or men-at-arms? Ulrich felt with this statement he would make the militiamen under Eckhard's command back down. Still, when he looked in their eyes, he was shocked to find the same look of determination and disdain Eckhard had so boldly displayed in his presence. Were these peasants mocking him? Eckhard's final words to Ulrich before he retreated was this: "If you do not surrender, I swear to show you that the age of knights has already passed." With that statement spoken, Ulrich snorted at the remarks and returned to his holdings. While the excavation for Berengar's rescue was ongoing, the Lord of Wildskanaw called upon the peasants in his territory and raised his levies with 1,500 men. Even if the cost of the battle was the death of all his levies, he makes certain to take Berengar's life. Chapter 30, Symphony of War. It took the entire night for Ulrich to raise his levies and properly equip them with what little equipment he could spare. It's not like their lives mattered to him in the slightest. Of course, the levies had no idea who they were fighting or why such a significant number of them had been conscripted. Most of them had never held a spear before in their lives. If they had known they were going against Berenger, the son and heir to the Baron of Kufstein, and were essentially acting in open rebellion, they probably would have taken a stand against Lord Ulrich. Unfortunately, they did not know their opponent and merely did what they were told in fear of persecution. As the sun rose on the next day, the sound of excavation could be overheard by the forces resting in their trenches. The rescue men worked day and night to free Berenger, and now they had finally achieved their goal. As the wall of rubble collapsed around Berenger and the light of their lamps shone into the room, he shielded his eyes, as his eyes were not adjusted to such brightness. Then he felt a hand clasp on his shoulder, and he looked up, barely making out the haggard old face of Ludwig, who was covered in soot. "My lord, I'm glad to see you're okay." Berenger began to chuckle and cough from the debris particles which filled the air. "Apparently, I'm hard to kill," he said with a wry smile on his face as Ludwig dragged the young lord to his feet and began walking him out of the mine shaft. "Now let's get you to a field medic and see if we can do anything about those injuries of yours." After exiting the cave, Berenger saw the hundreds of volunteers and the militiamen cheering for him as if they were watching a general return from triumphant conquest. In either of his 2 lives, he had never witnessed such a scene before. Maybe he was a little too rash to lose his faith in the common people. Some fresh air did wonders for the clarity of his head as he sat down on a stool and had a field medic disinfect his wounds, which stung horribly as the distilled alcohol killed the bacteria that had begun to fester. The moment Berenger founded the militia, he was sure to start up a production line for first aid supplies and medikits that those who became field medics could use to save lives on the battlefield. It was by no means a surgeon's kit, but it got the job done. He would never send an army to war without medics alongside them to aid the wounded. As such, the medics received both infantry training and basic medical training, or at least to the best that Berenger could remember. He never was trained as a proper medic, he just knew some basic first aid from his time fixing himself up after some scraps in his old life. After all, in his old life, the American health system was atrocious and had sooner suture himself than go to the emergency room and shell out hundreds if not thousands of dollars for it. What he learned in his old life he passed on to his field medics, so at the very least, they could save some lives from minor injuries. After being treated by the medic, Eckhard approached him, who patted him on the shoulder and informed him of the situation. "Lord Ulrich has conspired against you with your brother to bring your demise in these mines. The foreman we captured spilled everything he knew about their plot. Last evening Ulrich approached us and demanded we leave. Of course, we refused, and he vowed to return with levies. How should we proceed?" Berenger was currently shirtless with many bandages wrapped around him. His body was covered in soot, grime, and dust which blackened his otherwise flawless milky white skin. The pomade in his hair had collected the filth of the cavern like moths to the flame. If one was not familiar with the young lord, they might have mistaken him for someone else. Berenger took a sip of water from the canteen he was provided and exhaled deeply. He felt like his entire mouth was filled with dirt and iron after inhaling the debris particles for the past few days. After gargling the water and spitting out the filth, he looked up at Eckhard with his reply. "How should we proceed?" "We kill them all, of course. Every man who marches on this position is guilty of treason. I do not care if they simply follow orders. Let us show these traitors what happens when they march upon a trench line filled with 600 guns and the brave men who wield them." Berenger shouted his command loud enough for all the nearby militiamen to hear once more. The cheering began, but this was not the cheer of men thankful that their lord and commander was safe. This was the cheer of men who were about to lay waste to their enemies and who reveled in it. Though when Berenger stood up and raised his hand, silence quickly followed as he began his speech. "I look around me, and who I see are not peasants, nor serfs, nor commoners, but the people of Kufstein, brothers, fathers, and sons. Under my leadership, we have made great progress towards a new era where a man's worth is not determined by the class he was born into but by the hard work and effort he puts into his community. Many of you have been raised from the life of a serf, breaking your back every day in the fields so that you may grow crops for your masters. Now you work in factories and are afforded good wages and proper living conditions. The men out there want to take my life, but more importantly, they want to take away the life you have made for yourself, which I have worked alongside you all to implement. I ask you not to put your lives on the line for some petty grievance in which I, your lord and commander, have suffered, but to preserve the way of life that we have all built and continue to work towards. Today is the day we stand up to those who would oppose the dawn of a new era, the dawn of the industrial era. Though it was not some epic speech of a lifetime, it was more than enough to rally the men who had begun to question their position in the line of defense and bolster their courage. As soon as Berenger had finished his speech, the enemy's horn roared in the distance, and with it, an army of 1,600 men came marching towards the fortifications. However, by now, the defenders were fully enthralled by the rallying cry of Berenger and would defend this position with their lives if need be. The militiamen rushed to their positions and began to load their muskets, rifles, and cannons. Berenger could not stand idly by and walked over to Eckhard, who was busy commanding the forces to their positions. "Major Eckhard, I require a musket," Berenger said in an authoritative tone to his second-in-command, which baffled the old knight. Berenger had not eaten in days. He barely had enough time to hydrate before the enemy showed up. He was covered in cuts and bruises. He was slightly concussed and had a fractured rib. Yet the fill-covered young lord stood there, demanded a musket so he too could join the action. Eckhard, of course, could not help but voice his complaints. "My lord, do you really think that's a good idea?" Berenger glared at Eckhard with a tyrannical stare as he boldly declared in front of his forces lined against the trenches with their muskets raised. "I will not sit idly by while the men under my command put their lives at risk in the face of the enemy. Now tell somebody to fetch me a musket." Eckhard could not help but admire Berengar's spirit. Even in his condition, he chose to fight and die alongside his troops. He was truly a young lord worth following. Before Eckhard could even bark the command, a man came over with a musket and paper cartridge box tied to a belt and presented them to Berenger while kneeling. "My lord, I have acquired what you asked." Berenger grabbed a hold of the equipment and attached the belt shortly after. He bit open a paper cartridge and began to reload his weapon. While he was in the process of it, he barked at the soldier who had brought him his weapon. "Rise, I do not need every soldier to kneel at me every time they are in my presence. A salute is fine enough. You should have learned this in your basic training." The man quickly snapped to attention and saluted. "Yes, my lord." Berenger returned the man's salute before giving him commands. "Good, now take me to the front lines. I want to be among the first line that gets a shot at these bastards." The militiaman was assigned to a support unit. He was initially thankful, but after seeing his lord and commander's enthusiasm for battle, he could not help but feel sorrow that he would not get to fight at the front line by the side with the young lord. After leading Berenger to the front line, the man returned to his support unit with a gloomy expression. Berenger, as the highest-ranking officer, had seized direct command of the front line, something in which the troops were pleased. Meanwhile, Ulrich stayed behind his troops with his house guard. He was a cowardly man who refused to get his hands dirty on the field of battle. Alongside the house guard were the knights and men-at-arms, essentially the entirety of his professional force. Ulrich's plans were simple. He would have the peasant levies charge at the enemy's defenses. After all, they completely outnumbered Berengar's militia. When the levies had removed the cavalry traps placed in front of the trench line, his knights and men-at-arms would ride through mining town and slaughter Berengar's remaining forces. While Berenger was covered in dirt, grime, and filth from the mines and had no proper armor nor even a doublet to wear, Ulrich was covered head to toe in steel plate armor in the style which was common during this time, which would later be referred to as the Cherbourg style. Currently, the visor to his great bassinet was open as he watched his peasant levies march towards the fortifications. He had very few archers. However, once they were within range, they would rain a volley down upon the unarmored defenders, allowing his levies to rush towards the trenches. His plan was all supposed to go smoothly. It would allow him to defeat Berenger and his militia and cover his tracks successfully. So when his archers advanced into the 400-yard range, which was still far beyond their capabilities, he did not in the least expect the cannons that were hidden under cover would begin to rain fire upon them. When the 6 cannons echoed with thunder as the canister shot flew out of their bores and rained upon the archers, piercing their gambeson and mail armor as if it were made of tissue paper and scattering their limbs across the field, Ulrich nearly fainted from fright. He had never before witnessed cannons, let alone muskets. Instantly, what little archers he had were decimated into piles of mincemeat, their bodies no longer recognizable. The first part of his plan was completely and utterly destroyed. However, the cannons did not stop there. They quickly reloaded and fired a second bombardment of canister into the peasant levies, reaping the lives of dozens, if not hundreds, in the process. Their blood flowed onto the fields like a river and fertilized it in the process. At this point, the morale had already been broken among the levies and they began to panic. Even the war horses of the knights and men-at-arms began to become frightened. As Lord Ulrich saw his ranks breaking, he swiftly commanded the knights and men-at-arms to hold the line at any cost. "If those peasant bastards start breaking ranks, ride them down. They will move forward or they will face the consequences." The knights and professional soldiers heeded their lord's command and rode down their own routing levies. Very quickly, the peasant levies began to understand where they stood and were pushed forward out of fear into the line of fire. Though the cannons continued to sound off, taking the lives of dozens if not hundreds with every step, the levies rushed through it, knowing their only way out was forward and into death. Even Ulrich figured once they got close enough, those frightening thunderous weapons would have no effect. Berenger, on the other hand, was making sure his men did not fire in panic. Instead, with each bombardment of the cannons, their morale grew rapidly. Many even stared dumbfounded at how effective their weapons were. Hold your fire. Hold your fire. Do not fire until you see the whites in their eyes. This was a phrase Berenger continued to repeat to his musketeers as they held the line with their fingers firmly on the trigger. Despite the cannons blasting the ranks of the levies and the hundreds of losses, there were still close to 1,000 troops who rushed towards their position. The number was staggering and frightening. Nevertheless, they knew Berenger would not steer them wrong as they waited until they were given the command to fire. Finally, when the first line of Ulrich's levies were within 25 yards of the trench line, Berenger shouted at the top of his voice, "Fire!" With that, the echo of close to 500 muskets went off in unison, each musket ball finding its way into the body of an enemy. Limbs were torn apart, holes the size of a fist were punched through chests, and the blood-curdling screams of those unfortunate enough to survive filled the air as the militiamen rapidly reloaded their muskets. By now, the average militiaman could reload their musket within 20 seconds after all were reloaded, including Berengar's. He would give the commands of ready, aim, and fire as the symphony of war continued to rage upon the battlefield. Despite losing hundreds of men with each volley, the peasant levies pushed on as their escape route was cut off by Ulrich and his professional soldiers, who by now would not dare move forward. Ulrich finally understood the absurd comment Eckhard had made to him the day prior. The age of knights is already past, as he gazed upon the horrendous destruction wrought upon his army by Berengar's volunteer militia. Luckily, he was out of range of these crazy weapons. He began to feel as if the wrath of God was raining upon him as his army collapsed and began to rout. No longer fearing the men at arms behind them that were essentially acting as Soviet commissars and reaping the lives of those who fled. Right as Ulrich was about to give the command to retreat, he once more heard the thunder of the cannons and the whistle of the shot in the air. However, this time it was not a canister that was fired, but a solid ball. The 12-pound cannonball flew in his direction and punched through his chest, blowing his body apart. The lord who supported Lambert in his attempt to assassinate Berengar's life was completely and utterly dead. Berenger laughed as he saw the man's body torn apart by the massive cannonball, as he thought to himself, "Getting shredded by artillery fucking hurts, doesn't it?" Instantly conjuring up the scene of his death in his previous life. Nevertheless, Ulrich was now dead and his forces were routing. The knights and men-at-arms knew better than to stay in the confines of Kufstein, where they had just acted in rebellion. As such, they took off on their horses, fleeing the barony and Tyrol altogether. Nobody would ever believe what they claimed to have witnessed on that battlefield, and it would be a long time before such a scene resurfaced. Meanwhile, Berenger could not get rid of the orchestra of war that had filled his ears throughout the battle, despite the loud cheers of his men celebrating a battle that was won without a single casualty. Berenger had an epiphany and would one day in the distant future be quoted saying as follows, "It was on that day when 600 men defended their position with their guns thundering in the dawn that the Grim Reaper was conjured. When I saw his ugly face, I recognized that I was not a dealer of steel and textiles but thunder and death. At that moment, I came to a sudden realization about my fate. One day I would be emperor." Chapter 31, The Aftermath. After the battle had occurred, there was much cause for celebrating the overwhelming victory gained by the militia forces. Having gotten their first battle out of the way with the new weapons, the men comprised of Berengar's forces were entirely confident of defending their territory from any invading force and, more importantly, in Berengar's command. The fact that the young lord stood at the front lines facing down wave after wave of enemies alongside his troops would be spoken throughout the villagers of Kufstein for months to come. Berenger, on the other hand, promised a great celebration after they cleaned up the battlefield. They could not very well allow hundreds of corpses to lie on the fields to rot. As such, after much effort, the militia had dug a series of mass graves where they buried Ulrich and his forces. Berenger would have difficulty explaining his overwhelming victory to his father if he told the whole truth. Despite the desire to brag about his feats, he decided to lie about the battle and completely downsize the results. Because the men-at-arms and knights had by now fled the confines of the barony of Kufstein, and the peasants who fought against them were round up, lined against the wall, and executed. There were no witnesses to the events that transpired aside from the forces loyal to Berenger. And as long as he gave the order to keep the telling of their war stories to what he had instructed, there should be no problems with the leaking of how effective his firearms were. The story Berenger told to his father about the attempt on his life by Ulrich, the mustering of his forces, how they built the defenses and defended the position from a few hundred peasant levies. The lord's professional forces were very different from reality. Berenger spun the events, making it seem like Ulrich was unaware of hand cannons and foolishly attacked the hill with a few men. The missing peasants were explained by running away from their homes and families in fear of reprisal from the baron. It was a stretch, but judging by the fact that the knights and men-at-arms also fled the region, Sieghard had no choice but to believe it. As for the death of Ulrich, Berenger made it seem like a stray shot had pierced his skull. When the visor to his helmet was open with the lord's death, his forces collapsed and routed. Sieghard sent a team to investigate the fields to confirm this information was true, but found no traces of the mass graves and only the small ones Berenger had used to mislead the baron and his brother Lambert. As far as anyone was aware, the battle was quite small and was set between 200 of Berengar's militia dug in at the mining town and armed with hand cannons against 300 of Ulrich's men who fled with the accidental death their lord. After all, in this feudal world, it was considered unacceptable to kill a nobleman outright if it could at all be avoided. Men of higher birth were afforded the privilege of ransom. There was no mention of the use of cannons due to Berengar's previous misinformation. The cannons were considered to be static weapons and largely immobile by the uninitiated. Thus he did not want to reveal how effective they really were. After Ulrich's untimely demise, his son and heir, who was only a small child, was named Lord of Wildskana. As he was so young, he needed a regent, which Sieghard placed from a dedicated member of his own court to ensure the loyalty of the young lord who was now his vassal. He would not allow the grieving widow of the boy's traitorous father to skew the future lord's allegiance to his liege. As for the foreman who was captured, he was Berengar's only viable witness in Lambert's schemes against him. However, unfortunately, as the man was led to the dungeons of the castle of Kufstein, he was shortly thereafter found dead from asphyxiation. It was ruled a suicide as the man had supposedly choked himself to death with the chains that bound him. Berenger, however, knew that this was clearly the work of Lambert and his allies cleaning up their mess. The only witness he had to his brother's ploy was Linda, and Berenger refused to play that card. She was a valuable spy not only against Lambert but her father as well. He would not expose such a precious asset against his enemies in a rash attempt to expose Lambert's machinations. It became apparent that his father's army and the guard had been compromised. Clearly, there was a faction loyal to Lambert among them, and such a force would need to be purged when Berenger finally came to power. It took a long time for Berenger to explain the volatile situation that had occurred to his father. By the time he was finally able to wash the dirt and grime off of his filthy body, it was late into the night. His paranoia that he had developed from being trapped in the darkness of the mine shaft for days began to take hold as he sat alone in the bath during the twilight hours. As he heard the door creak open and the light taps of footsteps approach his location, he felt like another assassin was nearing by. When the footsteps finally reached his vicinity, Berenger launched a surprise attack on the would-be assassin, dragging them into the pool of water and pressing their head beneath its surface. For whatever reason, it never occurred to him that Linda was entering his bath to be with the man she loved. After all, she had been beside herself the past few days as she waited for news of Berengar's situation. Every day that Berenger was trapped, she was overcome with anxiety and despair, to the point where she could barely maintain the facade of Lambert's ally. It took a few moments for Berenger to realize he was in the process of drowning his own lover. When he finally came to his senses, he quickly released his hands and allowed the divine beauty to resurface from the filthy bathwater where she struggled to breathe. Berenger looked upon her with shock and terror, as he had acted upon instinct and did not recognize what he was doing until after he had harmed Linda. The girl's sky-blue eyes were filled with tears as she stared at Berenger in fear. She could not help but ask why she was so severely punished. "What the hell? Why would you do that?" Berenger, who was in the middle of a panic attack because of his actions, struggled to breathe, which was incredibly painful due to his fractured rib. As such, he grabbed a hold of his side and winced in pain as he struggled to give the girl an explanation. I'm sorry, I thought you were an assassin." Linda gazed upon the deep sense of dread that was spread across Berengar's immaculate visage and instantly forgave him. She could not imagine the sense of distress and agony that Berenger had suffered while being trapped in the darkness of the mines by his lonesome, for days on end, wondering when he would finally enter death's embrace. As such, she approached him cautiously and wrapped her warm body around his, placing her head on his shoulder. "I'm here for you if you want to talk about it." It was only after he felt the warmth and love of Lindy's heavenly body that he began to calm himself down and realized that he was not still in the cavern waiting for death. He was finally home, and though there were enemies in his midst, those who loved and cared for him far outnumbered them. Quickly, the sense of paranoia and dread was changed to one of intense wrath as he gained control of his emotions and began to plot his brother's downfall. At the moment, he still did not have enough evidence to bring charges against the treasonous little brat. He had been on the defensive for too long against Lambert, and now he would conspire against his own little brother and bring the little bastard to justice. Yes, justice, not vengeance. He could not very well kill his own brother and be labeled a kinslayer for the rest of his days. If Berenger so desired, he could easily have his little brother assassinated by Linda, though that would not be good for his conscience. Berenger would not stoop so low as to engage in fratricide, at least at the moment. If Lambert truly crossed the line, there was nothing Berenger would not attempt if it meant achieving his goals. Instead, he would target his brother's allies and cut off Lambert's support one by one. Aside from the Count of Tyrol, Lambert's allies were largely among his father's vassals and the armies that supported them. If he could identify them, he would have a much easier time dispatching them to the afterlife. As such, he began to share his scheme with Linda, who was Berengar's most valuable asset in the Shadow War with his brother. "My dear Linda, I have a task for you." Linda had sparkles in her eyes. Though she had yet to be rewarded for her previous actions, she knew it was only a matter of time, and with a new task meant an even greater reward. As such, she instantly replied obediently. "Yes, master?" Berenger narrowed his eyes. Within them contained a great sense of wrath and a desire for retribution. He was a man who would show no mercy to his enemies, and this recent attempt on his life had made him particularly vengeful, even if he told himself it was a desire for justice. "I want a list of names of every single person who has ever aided my brother in his attempts to gain the inheritance. Who they are, where they live, their weaknesses, and the extent to which they aided him. If someone so much as entertained the idea of taking my life, I want to know about it in exact detail. I trust this is something you can handle? Linda nodded with a deep smile on her face as she cuddled up against Berenger. Anything you require, master? Berenger gazed down at the peerless figure of the gorgeous young woman next to him and smiled deviously. By the way, I need to reward you for saving my life. Do you have any particular desires that I may fulfill? Linda blushed at the words with embarrassment, though deep down she had been waiting for this moment. As such, sat atop his lap and began to make out with him. The remainder of the bath session was filled with sounds that, if overheard by others, would cause a great scandal. Nevertheless, those who dwelled in the castle noticed not a single noise as the couple enjoyed the time they spent together with great passion. By the time the two left the bathhouse, they returned to Berengar's chambers, where they spent the rest of their waking hours continuing their fun. On the other hand, Lambert was wide awake and filled with terror as he hid within the confines of his large stone room. The attempt on his brother's life had failed, and the foreman used his name during the act. If Berenger was unaware of his previous endeavors, then he was certainly aware now. Not only that, but one of his greatest allies was now dead, all because the fool carelessly had his visor open. Surely if the visor to his bassinet were closed, the rocks fired from the hand cannons would have glanced off, right? Of course, Lambert had no way of knowing the real way in which Ulrich had perished, nor was he aware that the lead balls fired from the musket would have penetrated the bassinet either way if fired from an appropriate distance. Instead, Lambert felt he caught an unlucky break. His plans were leaked to Berenger, possibly from someone under his command. Still, it could have also come from one of the many workers Berenger brought with him who were suspicious of the foreman's actions. He had no way of knowing how the militia and rescue force arrived so quickly to Berengar's aid. All of these things contributed to the overwhelming sense of angst he felt deep in his stomach. Nevertheless, the worst part was that Lambert now had to fear his brother's reprisals, and with how things have been going lately, he could not help but be afraid of divine intervention on Berengar's behalf. Because he was unaware of Berengar's schemes to target his allies, the teenage boy dreaded an attempt on his own life by his elder brother as an act of retribution. Thus, while Berenger was enjoying his time with Lambert's fiancée, Lambert did not get a wink of sleep as he was too fearful of what might transpire while he slumbered. Chapter 32, Recovery. Adela struggled to fall asleep. A lot had happened in the last few days, and she recently only became aware that her fiancé had returned from the lordship of Wildskana after a botched assassination attempt. Yet other than spending many hours explaining the exact situation to his father, Berenger made no attempt to visit her. Instead, he went straight to the bath to cleanse himself of the filth that he had garnered throughout the time in the cavern. Afterward, before she could approach him and check to see how he was feeling, he went to his bed chambers where he was reportedly resting. The young girl had heard that Berenger was injured and needed rest, but she did not know to what extent. As such, she worried deeply about his health. The reality of the situation was Berengar's full attention during and after the bath had been captured by Linda, who was secretly betting Adela's future husband behind the scenes. Nobody was aware of the illicit relationship between Berenger and Linda, especially not Adela. She was not the type of girl to accept her future husband to be playing around with other women, even if she was too young to take their place. Eventually, Adela could no longer take the heartache of being incapable of seeing her dearly beloved, who, as far as she was aware, was hospitalized in his room at the moment. As such, she got out of bed and dressed in a white lace nightgown that was appropriate for the time period. It was only after she had tidied her appearance did the young lady depart from her bed chambers and silently make her way to Berengar's room. Her actions, if spotted, would surely cause a misunderstanding, and rumors were bound to flare. Luckily for everyone involved, nobody had witnessed her depart from her quarters. She quickly found herself in front of Berengar's door, where her heart began to beat rapidly. She had never visited his room after hours before. She wondered if he was asleep or not. After taking a few moments to calm herself, she lightly knocked on the door. Berenger was in the middle of playing with his favorite toy when he heard a knock on the door. He was in no position to answer it at the moment, as there was a divine beauty sitting atop his lap. He could not fathom who would possibly be at his doorstep at this hour aside from Linda. However, he made sure to motion with his hand to Linda to cease her activity and stay silent. After making sure the girl's lips were sealed, he just about called out to whoever was at the door when he heard a soft feminine voice with which he was all too familiar from behind the door. "Berenger, are you awake? Are you okay? I didn't get to see you when you returned. Can I come in?" Berenger quickly unsheathed himself from Linda and whispered in her ear with a voice so low Adela could not hear it from the other side of the door. "Get under the bed and take your nightgown with you." Linda did not disobey his commands, albeit she was a bit frustrated she didn't get to finish. She quickly hopped off the bed and grabbed a hold of her nightgown, which was scattered across the stone tile floor. She then crawled under the bed, where she barely managed to fit in the crawl space with her plump behind and buxom chest. Afterward, Berenger quickly put on a pair of trousers and answered the door. Adela was just about to leave when the door swung open. In her hand was an oil lamp that illuminated Berengar's bruised body, which caused Adela to become deeply concerned about his health. The young lady gasped when she saw the condition he was in and instinctively touched his abdomen to check to see if Berenger was okay. Berenger, who was desperately trying to hide his lower region behind the door, could not help but feel awkward as the little girl touched his bruised abs. Eventually, he could no longer contain it and broke the silence between the couple. "Ahem. You know you shouldn't be here at this hour. Upon hearing Berengar's voice, Adela quickly realized what she was doing and retracted her hand away where she tried to hide her sheepish expression. I could not sleep knowing that you were injured. I wanted to check on your condition. Berenger looked at Adela as if she were a little angel. Unlike the vixen who currently lay under his bed which ran him ragged despite his injuries, this young lady was too stressed to fall asleep knowing that her fiancé may be seriously injured. Luckily for her, he was fine, aside from a cracked rib and a few bruises. Personally, he has had worse and barely noticed the pain except for when he laughed or breathed heavily, but he would never admit that to a pretty girl who was concerned about him. Berenger smiled and he explained his situation to the young girl who was kind enough to check up on his condition even if it ruined her reputation. I'm hanging in there at the very least, it is nothing life-threatening. So you don't have to worry too much. Adela immediately felt relieved that her future husband was not in any danger and smiled endearingly at him. Well, that is good. Is there anything I can do to help? Berenger did not want to let the opportunity go to waste. It was a way to gain points with the little girl and tease Linda. As such, he invited the girl inside to his room to talk. Do you mind coming in? Since you are here, I have some things I want to talk about in regards to our engagement ceremony. Adela's cheeks became flushed as she heard the offer. It was completely inappropriate for a girl like her to be in a boy's room after dark. Well, it was inappropriate for her to be alone with a boy in his room, period, but she had already done that several times. On the other hand, Linda heard the words engagement ceremony and instantly began to scowl as she thought to herself. Ceremony? What ceremony? Is he throwing a party to celebrate his engagement? Why was I not invited? Why don't I get one? Why is Master making me listen to this? How cruel. Her scowl instantly turned into a pout as she felt left out. She knew she was only his concubine, but it still pained her heart every time she saw Berenger act flirty with his future wife. Luckily for her, Adela refused the offer. I'm sorry, Berenger, I don't think that would be appropriate. They'll see you tomorrow. With that said, the little girl in twin tails ran off back towards her quarters. It was quite an adorable sight seeing her run off in embarrassment. Despite that, Berenger said his thoughts aloud as he shifted his attention to Linda, who was crawling out from under the bed. Maybe I teased her a bit too much. What do you think? When he saw tears starting to form in the girl's eyes, he could not help but laugh to himself. Did I tease you too much too? After he said that, he held the girl in his arms and carried her back to his bed, where he spent his waking hours making it up to the young woman. Before he knew it, a whole month had passed, and Berenger could no longer feel any pain in his ribs. Though he would still try to take it easy for the next 2 weeks, he was essentially healed from his injuries. During this time, things went as planned. The mines were overhauled completely and seized by the von Kufstein family in reparations for the attempt on Berengar's life. The von Wildskanaw family suffered greatly from the loss of the mines, their professional army, and 1,500 peasants, which despite the rumors that they had all died at the skirmish at Mining Town, nobody had ever found any trace of the mass graves. Berenger was truly a master at hiding bodies. Berengar's exploits were advancing wonderfully by now. The fields within the vicinity of the town of Kufstein were fully irrigated, his chemical laboratory was up and running, and he began to produce various things within it. Though he still lacked a dedicated team of chemists to work full-time on chemistry, he managed to work on some small projects when he found the time. His flax farms and textile factory were either fully operational or close to completion. The labor force of Kufstein had grown quite rapidly after the implementation of irrigation, which allowed Berenger to open up a separate production line for agricultural equipment like the steel plow, the combine harvester, seeder, etc. On the other hand, after the skirmish at the mining town, the volunteer militia was on a recruiting spree. They barely had enough time to equip their soldiers properly. By now, Berengar's artillery battery was full and he had a total of 800 infantry. He was getting very close to his goals. His spy network had produced great results, as Linda was able to uncover a long list of names of those who were in bed with Lambert, and Berenger was currently in the process of figuring out who to conspire against first. Linda had even managed to spread the web that was his informants to the other regions of the barony of Kufstein. Rumors began to spread of the heroism Berenger showed in the face of death, how he was no longer a sickly lord and how he was a benevolent lord to his people. This was all due to the network Linda had set up. She wanted to get rid of those filthy rumors regarding her lover as quickly as possible. Though they still prevailed among the nobility, many of whom had met Berenger in the past and had poor first impressions. The common people were more inclined to believe the rumors Linda spread, how he survived an assassination attempt only to lead a volunteer force of peasants armed with hand cannons to defeat the professional forces of Lord Ulrich von Wildskanaw. Of course, the rumors she spread were greatly under-exaggerated at first. Over time, they had evolved to a point where they practically mirrored the truth of the battle. Currently, Berenger was observing himself in the bathroom mirror. It had been a little over 3 months since he had been reincarnated in this world. He started out as a borderline emaciated, sickly youth. Now he had grown firmly into his body, which was welted with muscle, and though lean, he looked extraordinarily fit. He figured with the way this body was designed, he would never be as muscular as his past life, but that was fine, considering his princely face would not look well combined with the hyper-masculine body of a soldier. It would be a damn shame to ruin his regal appearance with the obsession of becoming a warrior again. He was not a soldier in this life, but a nobleman and one day maybe even an emperor. His ambitions had grown wildly since the battle with Ulrich's forces. He had no desire to be Holy Roman Emperor. Instead, he had the desire to carve an empire of his own from the German-speaking regions. It was still 4 centuries too early for the German Empire to come into existence, but he would speed up the process in this timeline. As a man of German descent in his previous life and an Austrian noble in this life, he felt it was his destiny to unite the German people into one cohesive empire. He was a strong believer in the concept of the nation-state and felt that complex multi-ethnic, multilingual empires were a lot more difficult to manage and would eventually become unstable. He did not know why, but seeing his peasant forces crush the feudal army of his enemy awoke something in him. He felt it would be a damn shame to squander his knowledge in a small region like a barony. After all, in all of the strategy games he played in his old life, he was never content with being in charge of a minor nation. For now, those lofty ambitions would have to wait. His engagement ceremony was in a few days, and it would be an exceptional occasion. Not only were his father's vassals and their families going to arrive in Kufstein, but also the Count of Steiermark and his family, as well as the Count of Tyrol. Linda forced Berengar's hand, and thus he invited her father to arrive, not because she particularly cared about respecting the alliance his family had forged with her father, but because she wanted an official invitation rather than just being present. She no longer cared about her father's ambitions. He was not a man fit to be duke, let alone king, but in her eyes Berenger was. By now, some of the families had already arrived and were lodging in Sieghard's estate. He was deeply concerned about a lack of rooms for guests, and as such, during the past month, he had a special lodging area built for the excessive amounts of families who would be arriving. The areas were essentially chateaux designed by Berenger. They appeared similar to castles but did not have the defensive structures and were quite luxurious. They could very well afford the expense after the massive sale of steel. After Berenger had finished admiring his appearance in the mirror and gotten properly dressed in his opulent attire, he slicked back his hair with pomade and left the bathroom. Today was a new day, and he had many guests to greet alongside Adela. There were also many on the list of his enemies that appeared, and he would do his best to come to know their weaknesses in the following days. Not a single soul who plotted against him would escape his fury. Chapter 33, Tea Time. Berenger was holding Adela's hand as he walked side by side with her into the dining room, where many of the guests visiting for their engagement ceremony were currently staying and enjoying a lavish meal. The noblemen and women of various stature could not help themselves from complimenting the chefs and the fine cuisine they had served to the guests. Of course, it was all of Berengar's favorites and the culinary knowledge he brought with him from his previous life. Though certain foods were missing from the dishes due to the inability to source them, the main staples of what would become German cooking were all spread out in a feast for the lord and ladies to enjoy at their leisure. When Berenger entered the room, he was wearing a fine black velvet doublet with golden embroidery. Worn over the doublet was an exquisite sleeveless black fur coat. His trousers were matching black velvet and were well tailored, and he currently wore knee-high leather riding boots, all of which were recently made. Atop his neck and over his shoulders was a golden chain embellished in black gemstones. His extravagant attire was recently manufactured in his fledgling textile industry and was in the style of the Tudor era, which had yet to exist in this timeline. To the medieval lords and ladies who gathered in the room, his Renaissance-style attire was new and luxurious. The moment the nobility laid their eyes upon the young lord and his unique fashion sense, they could not help but feel astonished and envious at the same time. Was this really the sickly and petty young lord they all knew? Though they had all heard the rumors of Berengar's recent transformation, none of them had truly believed it until the moment they laid eyes upon him. Adela, of course, was standing next to him, holding his hand and wearing a Tudor-style dress in the same black and gold color scheme. Despite her age, she appeared quite ravishing standing next to her betrothed. Many of the eligible bachelors instantly became furious that a lowly baron's son like Berenger had snatched up such a fine young woman. They could not understand what the Count of Steiermark was thinking, allowing his youngest daughter to be wed to the son of a family of such low nobility. Of course, Otto was not the only count marrying one of his daughters to Sieghard's sons. With the arrival of the Count of Steiermark and the Count of Tyrol came many of their subjects paying respects to their lieges and their attendance at what would normally be a local affair. There were far more nobles at the occasion than what was initially projected, and there were many more to come in the following days. From Steiermark and Tyrol, nobles of all positions could be found in Kufstein at the moment, many of which were not even aware of Berengar's existence before his engagement to Adela. Still, they did their best to appease him, as they could tell by the presence of 2 counts at a celebration that he personally called for, that perhaps one day Berenger would become an important figure in the Duchy of Austria. Linda was standing in the crowd next to Lambert as she watched Berenger and Adela arrive in the newly designed fashion with a great deal of envy in her heart. Why had Berenger not presented her with such a fine dress? Obviously, she knew it would not be appropriate for him to do so, and if she waltzed around wearing such a fine dress, her father and fiancé would immediately become suspicious of where she had acquired it. Yet the young woman could not prevent such feelings as she gazed upon Berenger and his future bride standing in the middle of the dining hall basking in the glory. Just as Berenger had planned, the nobles saw the luxurious new outfits Adela and himself were sporting and could not help but approach the two and inquire about where they purchased such fine clothing. Of course, Berenger revealed that it was designed and manufactured in his family's territory within the new textile factories he personally owned. If the nobility wanted to purchase the new fashion designs for themselves, they would have to negotiate with him personally. Thus a new and lucrative trade was born on the spot. Through much effort and expense, Berenger had begun to grow flax and had imported a great deal of the material alongside silk to produce these designs. Though at the moment, the flax was still growing and had yet to be harvested. The factory was fully constructed. However, it was currently operating at minimum capacity as only a single unit of each of the new inventions was set in the large building. Those inventions include the spinning jenny, the spinning mule, the flying shuttle, and the water frame. Considering his industrial district was built near the river and he had ample water power to use in both the steel and textile industries. As of now, he could only produce a small quantity of clothing, but it was more than enough to appease the nobles in front of him and their desires to buy the new style of fashion in which Berenger had personally introduced. Though now was not the time to talk business, instead, it was the time to build alliances and conspire against his enemies. Berenger and Adela spent much of the day socializing with the other nobles in this feudal era. Building alliances were important. Berenger sat at the head of the table as he associated with the other young nobles, drinking fine chamomile tea as he snacked on apple strudel and Lebkuchen cookies. The other nobles of his age were delighted by the delicacies in front of them, which Berenger boasted of being the invention of the local chefs. He would not take credit for too many things, else nobody would believe him. A young lady who was quite attractive could not help but exclaim in joy as she tasted pfeffernuss for the first time. Adela, you are so lucky. I would be so happy if I could snack on such treats each day. Adela could not help but smile at the compliment. The truth was she was quite used to snacking on these things. She had even begun to exercise more to maintain her petite physique. She would never want to become fat and unattractive in Berengar's eyes. Berenger, on the other hand, goaded the girl on and handed her a slice of cheesecake. Try this, I promise you will love it. The young lady who had a passion for pfeffernuss tasted the German cheesecake and immediately fell in love with it. Linda was observing Berengar's behavior while snacking on her favorite foods at the other side of the table. She was not as into sweets as Adela was and preferred the actual meals like schnitzel. As long as she could get a good Jaeger schnitzel with a side of spätzle and a good lager to go with it, she was satisfied. That just so happened to be Berengar's favorite meal, too. Of course, a crucial component of the meal was missing, but Linda had no way of knowing it. The more Berenger ate his favorite food, the more he missed the potato pancakes and chocolate desserts that he grew up with as a staple in his previous lives' household. He desperately wished he could speed up time to send out an expedition to South America and get his hands on cocoa and potatoes. However, patience was a virtue, and whether he liked it or not, he would have to wait until he had enough power, influence, and wealth to sponsor such a voyage. Thus he opted to enjoy the fine cuisine in front of him, as he was thankful he could dine on such treasures regularly. On the other hand, Lambert was surrounded by his allies, who all began to chat among themselves about the lack of a certain lord who was a core part of the alliance. A young man in which Berenger recognized as Sir Ingbert Heltzer was currently conversing with Lambert about Ulrich's absence. Is it true? Was Ulrich killed by a stray projectile fired by a hand cannon in the hands of a peasant? Lambert could not help but furrow his brows and facepalm at such a remark. He had no way of knowing if his brother's claims were true, as nobody could find Ulrich's body. Officially, Berenger was so disgusted with Ulrich's behavior that he left his body for the wolves. Though the men beneath Berengar's command all confirmed the story was true, there was no way of knowing precisely how Ulrich had perished in battle without a body. However, as far as his father was concerned, Berenger spoke the truth, and as such, Ulrich was condemned as a fool who had marched upon an entrenched enemy position and had met his fate at the hands of Lady Luck. The lordship of Wildskana was in a rough state at the moment. A large portion of their workforce had disappeared overnight. They had no professional army to call upon in the event of a war. The von Kufsteins seized their largest source of income, and a small child was at the head of the household. The child lord was present for the ceremony, accompanied by his regent, who the von Kufsteins appointed. This said a lot about how the feudal overlords currently viewed the von Wildskana family. Truthfully, they got off easy compared to others who have attempted something similar in the past. The fact that Ulrich's family was still in possession of most of their lands and their lives was a testament to the benevolent nature of Sieghard. Still, the result of Ulrich's attempt on Berengar's life made many of the other lords and knights in Lambert's corner hesitant to provide any more support than they already have. If it weren't for the Count of Tyrol backing Lambert, most of his support would have vanished after Ulrich's death. Despite supporting Lambert, the Count of Tyrol was absolutely livid at the boy's repeated failures to get the job done. Looking upon Berenger, how healthy he appeared, how graceful he was when talking with the other lords and ladies, and how prosperous his industries were becoming, the old count could not help but feel like he had backed the wrong horse. Who was the idiot who told him that Berenger was a sickly, idle fool? If he had known the truth about Berenger sooner, he would have engaged his beloved daughter to him instead. Damn that Lambert for deceiving him. However, the more Count Lothar watched Berenger, the more he came to realize that he desperately needed to install Lambert on the throne. Even if it were possible for him to switch sides now, he would not do so. Every word Berenger spoke to the other nobles was carefully chosen to present himself in a better light. The young man was cunning, too cunning. It was obvious to Lothar that even if he could marry his beloved daughter to Berenger, the young lord would not be so easily fooled into giving up Kufstein's iron reserves in which Count Lothar desperately needed to achieve his greater ambitions. What Lothar needed was a pawn, and Lambert fit that role perfectly. The boy was exceptionally eager to give up his family's most valuable resources so that he could be with the Count's daughter. It was truly and utterly pathetic, yet Lothar still agreed to the betrothal of his dearest daughter to the pitiful baron's son anyway, for he would never become Duke of Austria without Kufstein's iron reserves. As Count Lothar was inspecting Berenger with his discerning eye, so too was Berenger examining Count Lothar. Currently, the Count of Tyrol was the greatest threat to Berengar's existence. Though the Count's daughter had fallen under his control and Berenger could expect to be one step ahead of the Count, and his brother, the young lord, did not feel safe knowing that such a powerful man was after his life. Nevertheless, he did not display a hint of his internal hostility towards the Count. As Lambert was discussing with his allies the loss of their partner in crime, one of the young ladies fawning over Berenger brought up the tale of his battle with Ulrich. By now the rumors had spread far and wide and had become greatly exaggerated. The rumor had now become so inflated that even his actual accomplishment no longer seemed so impressive. Berenger, I heard that you personally commanded an army of 100 men while previously wounded from the attempt on your life against an army led by that dastardly Ulrich who had over 2,000 of his own troops. Surely the madman must have emptied his fields to take your life. Berenger struggled to maintain his composure as he heard the absurd lengths the rumors had reached. He was good, but not that good. He had to correct this mistake while still making it seem like his feat was grand. Thus he decided to tell the whole truth. Of course, to the many observers who were aware of the official numbers, what Berenger was about to say would seem like he was conceding ground to appear humble while still greatly exaggerating the battle. I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. The reality of the situation was that I was facing 1,600 men with 600 of my own. Still, with our hand cannons, we gunned down hundreds of their men before they finally broke ranks and fled like the cowards they were. The girl did not seem disappointed in the slightest. Instead, she had sparkles in her eyes as she heard the exact details of the battle from the man himself. Granted, he did not deny the part of him being grievously injured despite only having minor injuries and dehydration. On the other hand, Lambert nearly spat out his drink when he heard his brother's wild claim. The way Berenger espoused such a hyperbolic tale was without a hint of dishonesty on his face. Either Berenger was the greatest bullshitter Lambert had ever seen, or he was actually telling the truth. The youth struggled to wrap his head around what was real and what was dishonesty. Ultimately, the meeting between the various nobles and Berenger was split into two factions sitting across the table as if battle lines were drawn. Those who supported Berenger tended to be of the younger generation, few of which had already succeeded their fathers. Most were heirs like Berenger or even second sons. The other faction supported Lambert, and most of them were of the older generation, those who were currently in a seat of power and had been for some time. If one were not aware of the deadly war of intrigue fought in the shadows of these two brothers, then they would not understand the full context of the seating arrangement that had occurred. Either way, the friendships Berenger made at this table with the younger generation of nobles from across Austria would one day become the backbone of his power base. Chapter 34, There is something else. Throughout the day, Berenger entertained his guests with his fiancée well nearby to make him look good. She was cordial and graceful in every regard, a proper partner to Berengar's natural charm. The two built quite the lasting impression on the nobles who visited the von Kufstein family's estate. He had begun to make progress in forming alliances with the capable youth of the younger generation. He had no use for an ally who could not pull his own weight. As such, Berenger would not waste his time with the indolent and frivolous young lords and ladies who could not even count to 10. Sadly, it appeared like they were the majority of the noble offspring throughout the realm. He too had once been like them, spoiled rotten and never using his brain. Most of the people Berenger entertained were either the offspring of barons or viscounts from throughout the counties of Steiermark and Tyrol. They were roughly in the same position as he himself and could provide sufficient support to his plans if he were to build an alliance with them. Sadly, there were not too many exceptional members of the lower nobility in this generation, and they mostly clung to the corner, forming a small social clique among themselves. Most barons who were not their direct liege would not give them the time of day due to their low status, let alone viscounts or counts and their families. Currently, Berenger did not have time to oversee his projects personally. As such, he left them in the capable commands of administrators he placed in charge of them. Ludwig, as per usual, was in charge of his burgeoning industrial sector, Gunther was tasked with implementing his many agricultural innovations, and Eckhard took personal command of the matters that pertained to the militia. As for the militia, their activities were suspended during the duration of the visitor's stay. Berenger could not very well have information leaked about the effectiveness of his weapons. Such a thing could prove disastrous to his plans. As such, the militia was given a slight reprieve from the arduous task of basic training. Though they had been victorious in a single battle, it was against mostly poorly equipped levies who foolishly rushed a well-entrenched position. The troops in Berengar's battalions still had to complete basic and specialized training if they were to become an army fully capable of annihilating their enemies in the fields. Though they were far more accepting of their training and its methods after personally witnessing the results they had yielded during that fateful day when they slaughtered Ulrich's forces and rescued their commander. It was a story many of them would be telling their grandkids someday in the distant future. The next few days, he would be busy socializing with the nobility visiting for the massive party he was celebrating for Adela. He had a large surprise in mind for the young girl. He decided it was about time to introduce some Renaissance-era culture, particularly ballroom culture, which would not come about naturally for at least another century. Of course, Berenger only knew one dance from his previous life, the waltz, so it might be fairer to say he would be implementing an aspect of early modern culture. Berenger did not have time or permission to extend the castle to contain a ballroom. As such, he built a public platform in the town square for the occasion. Eventually, he would like to construct a more modern palace that would obviously contain such a necessity and do away with the castles altogether. After all, once his weapons spread across Europe's great powers, the mighty stone walls of the medieval era would become obsolete. Though he had no plans to sell his weapons to others, it was only a matter of time before they were recovered and reverse-engineered, at least to some extent. It might take years or even decades at the current pace of things, but muskets and cannons would rule the battlefields of Europe far earlier in this timeline than in his old life, and when they did, large castles would become a thing of the past. Lately, Berenger had been drafting plans in his spare time to turn Kufstein into a functioning city. It was a distant dream at this point, but one he intended to make a reality within his lifetime. If he were to achieve his aspirations, he would need a grand city to be his seat of power, and he refused to leave behind his family's lands just because other areas were more developed. At the moment, Berenger found himself working on the layout for the proposed city of Kufstein. It was late at night, and his guests had retired for the evening. He had even sent Adela to her room, who was exhausted after socializing with the noble families who had arrived early. Currently, an oil lamp illuminated the large stone room in which he resided. It was just about midnight, and any moment now he could expect a knock on his door and a particularly jealous Linda to appear and demand her share of attention for the day. After all, she had to sit in Lambert's corner and could not converse with her lover throughout the time, all while watching him act lovingly towards Adela. Sure enough, the knock came on the door, and when Berenger opened it, he found Linda with an adorable pouting expression as she forced her way into his room and jumped into his embrace. However, before she could kiss Berengar's lips, he raised a hand and blocked her attempt before sitting down upon the bed and motioning for her to sit next to him. Their nightly fun could wait. He had important matters to discuss with his spymaster. Linda, never one to refuse one of Berengar's orders, sat down next to him and latched onto his arm and buried it into her bosom while wearing a wide smile on her face. Berenger, who was used to the vixen's antics by now, did not react in the slightest and merely continued with his train of thought. "So your father appears to be displeased with my brother." Linda could not help but chuckle at the statement. It was true that her father was currently furious with Lambert. Not only had he failed once again to assassinate Berenger, but he also managed to cost Lothar a serious amount of raw materials. After all, Ulrich had been digging up more iron than he had reported to his liege and was selling it on the side to Lothar at a lowered price. It was part of the alliance they had reached. Now that Ulrich was dead and his mines confiscated by Sieghard, he was no longer getting a regular shipment of iron from Kufstein. Thus his plans to equip his armies with the best weapons and armor around had begun to come to a halt. Though the Count could acquire iron from other regions, he had already invested heavily in his alliance with Lambert and wanted a return soon. Linda was aware of all of this and could not help but laugh at the fact that her lover's enemies would never be able to accomplish their objectives. "Father is furious with your little brother. However, that also means he is going to be pressuring Lambert into acting against you again. This time try not to get caught in their trap. I don't know what I would do without you." Berenger noticed the distressed look on the girl's face and began to pat her head to comfort her. "I admit that I was careless last time. I promise you I will not make such a mistake again." Linda could not help but smile at the promise he made. There was a fierce look of determination in Berengar's eyes, which she took as a sign that he would stay true to his words. Afterward, Linda spoke her greatest concern that had been bothering her all day, but she had no way to inform Berenger until now. "There is something else." Berenger raised his brow by the way the beautiful young woman was acting. It was something serious. As such, he poured himself a glass of wine while offering one to the heavenly beauty next to him. However, to his surprise, she refused. Instead of accepting the wine, she glanced up at him with an unyielding gaze while resting her hand on her abdomen. "I am pregnant." It took a moment for those words to register in Berengar's brain. As he nonchalantly took a sip of wine, however, while in the middle of drinking the red wine, he realized what she had said and nearly choked upon it. He stared at her in disbelief as he struggled to understand her words. "You are what?" Linda turned back to a pouting expression as she saw that Berenger was not as excited as she was. In fact, he was deeply concerned about the whole situation. "You heard me. I am pregnant. You are going to be a father." Berenger did his best to maintain his composure as he slowly drank his wine while maintaining a dignified appearance. This was not something he expected, of course. With the way those two had been going at it every night for the past month and a half, it was something he seriously should have anticipated. His brain rapidly thought of a solution. After all, she was not even married to her fiancé yet. That alone would be a scandal, but the truth of the matter was her fiancé was not the father. If anyone found out about that, her reputation would be ruined for life. Berenger had to prevent that from happening for multiple reasons. Chiefly among them is that it would seriously damper his diplomatic relations if people found out he had been fooling around with his little brother's betrothed. After several moments of intense thought, he finally came to the best conclusion he could think of. "Say it is Lambert's," he said sternly as he ordered his lover like a domineering master. She was shocked deep down. She hoped Berenger would officially recognize the child and make it a legitimate bastard. That way it would have a claim to his titles and she would not have to marry Lambert. Instead, he said something which sounded asinine and she immediately voiced her concerns. "Lambert? Even if I said it was his, he would never believe me. I have never slept with him." Berenger glared at the girl menacingly. The thought of his brother touching his lover enraged him to the core. His voice was slightly raised as he chastised her. "And you never will." Realizing that he had raised his voice, Berenger calmed himself down and exhaled deeply before putting on a wide smile and touched Lindy's frightened face with his firm but loving palm. "You don't need him to sleep with you to make him think it is his. Get him really drunk, strip his clothes off and lie down next to him. When he wakes up in the morning, tell him that the two of you slept together. Make it look convincing, spill some blood on the sheets so he doesn't suspect anything." Afterward, he kissed his lover for several moments before apologizing. "I'm sorry, I know your desires for the future of our child, but I'm in a precarious situation right now. I don't have the luxury to take responsibility for this at the moment. Maybe one day I can proclaim to the world that this child is mine and the love we have for each other, but for now it is not in the cards. Please understand." Linda wiped away a tear that had been forming in her beautiful sky-blue eyes, before nodding in acceptance to Berengar's request. "I understand and I will do what you have asked." Afterward, the couple spent the night together in each other's embrace, celebrating the conception of new life, completely unaware of the troubles that would follow because of the birth of this child. After all, who could know the distant future? Chapter 35, A Night to Remember. Several days had passed since Berenger initially found out that he would soon be a father, and so far, the couple had not told a soul. Currently, Berenger was having breakfast and entertaining his guests alongside Adela. It was the day of his engagement ceremony and all of the invited nobles had safely arrived in Kufstein. During these past few days, Berenger had schemed with Linda to set up her fiancé as the official father to her child. The plan would go into effect tonight. Lambert's 16th birthday was nearly a month away and she would push for a wedding as quickly as possible to conceal the fact that the pregnancy was out of wedlock, something in which her father would go through great lengths to hide. If successful, the only people who would be aware of the child's true lineage were the parents themselves. Berenger had become quite the expert in maintaining his social grace among the elites of Austria who were gathered at his family's estate. By now, all of the undesirable rumors about him had begun to fade in the minds of those at the party. They had become well accustomed to the new and improved Berenger. During this time, Berenger did not stand idly by and merely entertain his guests. He had set in place several transactions for steel and textiles, which would bring in quite a fair degree of wealth for his family. These trade agreements would eventually blossom into friendships and perhaps even alliances one day. With each passing day, his father looked more favorably upon him. Berenger was certain that the day until he has officially declared regent of his family's lands was near. Currently, he was engaged in discussion with his future father-in-law about the state of affairs of his steelmaking industry. "Rest assured, Count Otto, we are working on improving the production rate of steel. We have already begun to implement a second production line in our industrial district. Before long, we will be able to produce twice the amount of steel that we are currently able to manage." Essentially, what Berenger meant was that more beehive ovens, blast furnaces, and Bessemer converters were currently undergoing production. With the decrease in needed farm hands, many unemployed farmers were actively transitioning to factory work or skilled trades. With each passing day, the town of Kufstein was transforming from a small agricultural town to an actual city, filled with a wide degree of diversity in professions. The Count smiled as he heard the news. He would continue to purchase steel from Berenger. After all, the quality and quantity of the steel Berenger produced far outmatched anyone else he knew of. Though Berenger had plans to use the steel in many aspects, he still sold off the surplus to those interested, and there were plenty who wanted a piece of the pie. The Count now decided to switch to a more personal topic to make sure Berenger was a good match for his youngest daughter. "Are you attracted to my daughter?" Berenger did not expect such a question. Nevertheless, he could not honestly say that she was too young for him to get excited over. Otherwise, Adela might take it the wrong way, and she was carefully observing his reaction. For some time now, she had been suspecting that Berenger thought of her as a little kid, or even worse, a little sister. He never gazed at her the way she saw him stare at Linda during the night of their first encounter, and that bothered her. She is quite the beautiful young lady with many years ahead of her to mature into her body. Berengar's response to Count Otto's question was satisfactory for the old nobleman, but to Adela she could tell what he really meant and pouted at the answer as she muttered under her breath. Stupid Berenger." Though nobody had heard her dissatisfied statement, Berenger could tell by the expression on the young girl's face that she was sulking. It became apparent to him that she had understood his hidden meaning in the statement. Count Otto, on the other hand, nodded his head slowly and accepted his words. "Good, it is important for a couple to be attracted to one another. I know I certainly would have never married my wife if she was a dog-faced woman. Berenger nearly laughed at the statement and the look upon his wife's face, who was sitting next to the Count as she heard her husband's words. Count Otto was a slim man well into his 40s. He had short golden blonde hair and a clean-shaven face. However, unlike his daughter, he had emerald green eyes. It was the Countess whom Adela had inherited her deep sapphire eyes from, a trait in which was commonly shared between Berenger and the two of them. After all, Adela's mother was Berengar's aunt and had thus come from the same gene pool as Berenger and his family. Berengar's aunt was named Wanda and had married the Count many years ago. Much like her daughter, she was also quite young when she was betrothed to her husband, and he was considerably older than her. Thus she was in the middle of her 30s and, like all members of Berengar's family, was quite attractive. The family would enjoy their meal and entertain the guests until the mid of the day. Afterward, Berenger successfully slipped away from the endless number of guests who were at Kufstein with the sole purpose of visiting him. He tried to decompress from the stress of talking to so many unknown people for so many hours. It was not until the start of the feast that Berenger finally re-emerged from his solitude. The feast was held outside in the center of the town. It was a fine spring evening, and a gentle breeze in the air enhanced the wholesome atmosphere. There was a gated area that contained a variety of tables and dishes atop them. Many noblemen and women were enjoying their food, wine, and beer as they engaged in conversation. It was not until Berenger stood up from his chair and led Adela over to the large dance floor erected under his orders. He was dressed in a particularly dazzling outfit for the evening, and standing beside him was Adela, who was equally lavishly dressed. Berenger held onto the girl's hand and asked her a question she was not expecting, in front of the audience, which caused her to become slightly embarrassed. "May I have this dance?" She did not know how to respond and nodded her head in curiosity. As such, Berenger took her up on the dance floor in front of all of the nobles who were watching with inquisitive gazes. Their sight cast upon Berenger and Adela as the couple waltzed together to the music which played in the background. Though Adela was unaware of the intricacies of the waltz, she quickly caught on as Berenger led her through the paces. As the sun began to set, the two danced together throughout the early night under the illumination of 1,000 candles and the full moon above. Though the men in the audience initially scoffed at the sight of the couple dancing, the women were instantly inspired by the extraordinary sight and quickly became envious of Adela. Soon enough, they asked their partners to take them up to dance as well. Though they did not know the waltz, they still participated in traditional folk dances of the regions they were from. From the sidelines, peasants gazed upon the various feudal powers of the regions as they engaged in a new tradition with various expressions. Some were envious, others were confused, and a few were just downright disinterested. Though one thing was certain to the townsfolk of Kufstein, Berenger was at it again with his crazy ideas. Adela quickly became entranced by Berengar's wide smile as she danced the night away with him. It was only after a couple of hours of dancing and socializing when the two finally sat down. Many of the couples present continued to dance as the young lord and his fiancée sat back down at the head table. Lambert had offered to dance with Linda, but she outright refused. If she were going to dance with any man, it would be Berenger. Of course, she could not outright say that, so she stated that she thought the whole act was childish. Berenger, on the other hand, had just begun his ploy to set up his little brother. As such, he brought over a couple of mugs of beer and ordered the servants to keep them coming. "Come, Lambert, let us drink in celebration of the upcoming union of your dearest elder brother." Lambert's eyes instantly narrowed as he looked at Berenger with a great deal of suspicion. By now, Berenger was fully aware of the plots against him. Yet he was so cheerfully offering to drink with him in public. What was his angle? Nevertheless, Lambert could not refuse and cautiously took a sip from the beer. When he confirmed it was not poisoned, he began to drink more. After all, these last couple of days had been extremely tiresome for him, as Count Lothar was constantly berating him for his failures. Before long, Lambert finished his drink, as did Berenger, and thus the young lord motioned for 2 more drinks to be brought to the table as he goaded on his little brother. "Care for a friendly wager, little brother?" Lambert's chilling gaze landed on Berenger as he wiped the beer residue from his mouth before asking what Berenger was implying. "What kind of wager?" Berenger gulped down the beer in his hand and placed his mug directly next to his first one. "It's simple. We drink. The first man to drop has to run around the courtyard naked at the crack of dawn." Lambert scoffed at Berengar's childish behavior, but he knew his brother was not much of a drinker, which would make this a good chance to embarrass him. Thus Lambert foolishly accepted the terms of the gamble and began to compete with his brother in the game of drink. The old Berenger may not have been much of a drinker, but as a soldier in his past life, who was often stuck in the barracks with nothing to do, Berenger had become quite the experienced drinker. He had no doubt he would outlast Lambert, though whether he won or lost really did not matter to him. Berengar's primary goal was to get Lambert so wasted he would have no recollection of the night before. He who dares wins? As such, the brothers began to drink beer like there was no tomorrow, which did not go unnoticed by the other partygoers who began to cheer them on. As the two engorged themselves on alcohol, Berenger had a calm expression on his face. He was a veteran drinker who could have over a dozen beers and still be able to function properly the next day. Lambert, on the other hand, was far more of a lightweight than he expected. By the time Lambert had reached his 6th beer, he was practically slurring his words. Berenger could not prevent his lips from curling up into a sneer when he saw the sight, which only acted as instigation for Lambert to drink more. By the time they reached 15 beers, Lambert was on the verge of passing out and Berengar's cognitive faculties were mostly intact. Seeing the state Lambert was in, Linda finally urged the two boys to stop their contest. "Let's call it a draw, shall we, boys? It's getting late." Lambert was thoroughly hammered at this point and could barely form a sentence. Daz, right? Draw? Berenger chuckled lightly before he accepted the terms. "Fine, we will call it a draw. Get some rest, little brother." With that, he stood up from his chair and left with Adela towards the castle. He trusted Linda to take care of the rest. Linda, of course, instantly helped up her drunk fiancé and dragged him off to his room, where he quickly passed out. By the time he woke up, he would have a horrible hangover and a complete and total lack of memory of what happened the night before. He would also be facing a serious crisis, as Linda had done exactly as Berenger asked and made it seem like the two of them slept together, when in reality nothing happened between the couple. As for the rest of the nobles who enjoyed the celebration to the fullest, this would be a night they would remember for the rest of their lives, one in which they could not thank Berenger enough for providing. After this night, two traditions were born in the Duchy of Austria, throwing lavish parties to celebrate one's engagement and ballroom dancing. Chapter 36, A Difficult Negotiation. Days had passed and all of the guests who were present for Berengar's ceremony had departed. All except for Count Lothar, who was in the middle of a fierce debate with Sieghard about Lambert's supposed affair with Linda. Strictly speaking, they were not supposed to engage in such behavior before their wedding night, and Linda purposely made it seem like she was pressured into the occasion by a drunken and belligerent Lambert. Though nothing actually happened between the two, the only people aware of that fact were Berenger and Linda, who used this opportunity to sow division between Lambert and his greatest backer. As far as both families were concerned, Lambert had done the deed with Linda during Berengar's engagement ceremony, and it would not be long before Linda revealed she was pregnant to the two families. However, there was still some time between now and then. Berenger sat in the great hall and listened to the bickering of the two old men as he dined on schnitzel which the cooks had prepared for him. He washed it down with a flagon of beer and enjoyed the scene of Lambert being scolded by the two feudal lords who were furious with his behavior. Linda had done more than Berenger had asked and made it seem like Lambert had practically forced himself on the poor girl. Of course, Lambert had no memories of the time he spent with Linda and deeply regretted it. If he really did as she claimed, then the worst part of it was that he could not remember what her naked body looked like or how it felt. She had covered herself thoroughly with the sheets when he awoke to the scene and could not get a good glimpse of her bare figure. Linda was standing next to her father with a downcast expression. She was an excellent actor and could play the victim's part quite well. Lothar was spouting his demands to Sieghard as he pointed his finger at him menacingly. "Unacceptable. I will not stand for this. I demand some form of compensation for my daughter's chastity, which your errant son violated. Just because they are betrothed does not mean he can force himself on my daughter as he pleases." Sieghard was trying to manage the situation and felt deeply embarrassed by Lambert's actions. Though he knew the boy's relationship with his fiancée was tense, he had no idea that his prized son would act in such a way after having a few beers. "I promise, I will do my best to make this right, but what is it exactly you are asking from me?" Lothar was genuinely not too appalled by Lambert's behavior. In fact, it was doing him a great favor. This gave him cause to demand a portion of Kufstein's iron reserves, which he immediately requested. "I demand 25% of Kufstein's iron reserves in return for your son's actions." Sieghard was outraged by such a demand that was giving away a massive pile of wealth, especially now that Berenger had managed to find a way to turn all of that iron into steel in an efficient manner. As such, he pounded his fist on the armrest of his seat of power and refused Lothar's demands. "Absolutely not. You are trying to rob me." Count Lothar frowned at the insinuation and retorted properly. "Rob you? A lowly baron like you may not be aware of this, but Lindy's chastity has an extreme degree of political significance attached to it as a count's daughter. If your barony were not so rich in minerals, I would have married her off to a duke." At this point, Berenger had put down his fork and got off his chair while tidying his mouth with his napkin. Afterward, he walked over to the center of the great hall where the two noblemen were bickering. As the man tasked by his father with leading the industrial sector, he had a great deal of say on how its resources were managed. There was not a single possibility that Berenger would allow Lothar to have his way. "Pardon me, my lord, but I don't believe that such a request is even remotely reasonable. At most, I would be willing to sell you a supply of steel at a discounted price. I will not under any circumstances hand over the resources of my industrial district because of the improper actions of my little brother." Lothar was thoroughly outraged by this interruption and the offer. Who did this kid think he was to so boldly interrupt a conversation between two lords? Under whose authority do you gain the power to negotiate with a man of my standing? "I'm busy talking to your father. Little boy, you'd best go back to eating your meal." Berenger chuckled at the vicious response he was given by Count Lothar, who was in all technicality his liege. "I'm afraid to say that my father has delegated all responsibility of the mines and steel industry of the region into my hands. If you want to demand compensation in the form of minerals, I'm the one you need to be discussing this with." Lothar glared menacingly at Berenger. If this were true, he would have a much more difficult time getting what he desired from the von Kufstein family. Sieghard was mostly compliant and was not nearly as cunning as Berenger. Over the past few days, Lothar had observed Berenger and his dealings with the other nobles and discovered that he was an incredibly shrewd young man. Berenger would not crumble under pressure. Lothar held as count and would fight tooth and nail to make sure every aspect of the deal was favorable to his position. Lothar walked over to Berenger and stared the young man down, a challenge from which Berenger did not back down. Rather, he returned Lothar's vicious gaze with a smug smile, as if no matter what Count Lothar did or said, the negotiations would ultimately be in his favor. This haughty expression further enraged Lothar to the point where he wanted to backhand the arrogant youth. "I demand 25%. I will not leave here until I get it." Berenger had struggled to contain his laughter. Aggressive negotiations like this would never work on a man like himself. For it to do so, Berenger would have to fear the power in the hands of Count Lothar, and considering that fact that the young lord could bring forth the power of nearly 1,000 guns and unleash it upon the Count's feudal army, he did not fear, nor respect the meager power in which the proud Count held. As such, he calmly denied Lothar's demands. "Then make yourself comfortable, because it looks like you're going to be here for the rest of your life. Do you understand the value of a quarter of our iron reserves when converted into steel?" Lothar wanted to throttle the boy for his arrogance. How dare he speak to his liege in such a condescending manner? He would have to teach this boy a valuable lesson. "Bah, and I suppose you have the ability to convert such a large amount of iron or into steel? Do not jest with me, boy. It would take a lifetime to make that much steel." Berenger did not say anything. He just stood there with a satisfied smile on his face. If the Count knew how much steel he was currently in possession of and how much he could produce in one batch, then the man would surely never have suggested such an absurdly high number. Eventually, Berenger broke the awkward silence between the two as he countered the Count's proposal. "Here is what I can do. As an official apology from the von Kufstein family for my foolish little brother's unsightly behavior, I will cut the cost of steel sold to your family for the next 10 years by 15%. That is the best I can offer you. Any more than that and I will be operating at a loss." The brow on Lothar's forehead began to twitch uncontrollably as he struggled to contain his anger. "Operating at a loss? Your brother has stolen my daughter's chastity and you're concerned about operating at a loss?" Berenger did not say anything. He just smiled and nodded his head. Truthfully, he had not calculated the demands that Lothar would make into his scheme. He figured that his father would pay Lothar a small amount of gold and silver in compensation, which would be the end of it. However, Lothar had made a ridiculous demand that allowed Berenger to take control of the conversation. He now fully intended to make a profit off of framing his little brother. Lothar approached Berenger very closely and whispered to him in a voice that only the two of them could hear. "Do you think your pathetic little barony could withstand the might of the county of Tyrol if I were to order my bannermen to march upon your house?" Though Lothar had boldly threatened Berenger in an attempt to get the young lad to back down, he did not get the result he expected. Instead, Berenger smiled devilishly as he whispered back to the old Count. "My lord, do you think it is wise to send your men to die in Kufstein when your forces will be needed elsewhere soon enough?" The Count stood stupefied upon hearing those words. Either this young man was referring to his plots to overthrow the Duke, or he was referring to the upcoming civil war that everyone with half a brain knew was on the horizon. Either way, he was absolutely right. He could not afford to send the armies beneath his control into Kufstein to punish them over such a small matter. His bluff had been called, and now the old Count had to admit defeat. With great reluctance, he whispered back towards Berenger. "I accept your terms on the condition that the price of steel purchased from your lands is reduced by 20%. Berengar's smile was so wide that it had practically taken up the entire lower half of his face at this point. Just now, he had been victorious with the negotiation. All that remained was to see how much of a profit margin he could scrape together from this deal. 17% and I will cover transportation. Take it or leave it. That is my final offer." Everyone else was looking at the two who were so close that their faces were practically touching. On the face of Count Lothar was a large scowl. He felt awful not getting what he wanted, but at least he was getting a better deal with Berenger than he was from Ulrich. And better yet, it would be steel ingots, not iron, or that would be shipped to him. Though his daughter's chastity had been violated ahead of her wedding, at the very least, he could gain something from the occasion. After all, he still needed Lambert to succeed Berenger if he was eventually going to get the resources he needed. If anything, this harsh negotiation served as a reminder that Berenger needed to die if the Count's ambitions were to become a reality. Little did the Count of Tyrol know that this whole scenario was a ploy from Berenger to pin Lindy's pregnancy on Lambert. If Lothar were aware that not only was his daughter's chastity taken by Berenger long ago, but that she was also pregnant with the scoundrel's bastard child, then he would have had the urge to draw his sword at that moment and drive it through Berengar's black heart. But he did not know, and as such, he pretended to be nice to Berenger as he accepted the young lord's offer. "Deal." Afterward, Lothar turned away from Berenger and put on an act. "You drive a hard bargain, Berenger von Kufstein. Out of the respect that I have for your family, I will agree to your terms. Come, Linda, it is about time you return home." Berenger nearly laughed at the old man's poor performance. However, he instantly became aggrieved when he heard the last part of his sentence. There was no way he was going to allow this old bastard to seize his lover from him. However, before he could protest, Linda stood up to her father. "I'm not going." Lothar stopped in his tracks as he turned around and glared at his errant daughter. "What did you just say?" Linda was no longer afraid of her father's fury now that she had Berenger protecting her. She knew there was nothing her father could do. However, she was also quick-witted and came up with a proper excuse to stay behind and spend her days with the father of her child. You need to have proper representation in whatever deal you just came to an agreement to with Berenger. I will stay behind and protect your interests. Count Lothar was initially furious that his daughter wanted to stay behind after everything that had transpired and also downright confused. However, it turned out that she was looking out for the family's interests like she always had. Her explanation made perfect sense, and the more he thought about it, the more he did not trust Berenger. Somehow that blackguard would screw him over. He could feel it in his bones. With Linda keeping a close eye on the boy, he had nothing to worry about. After all, she was clever enough to keep up with Berenger. Under those circumstances, I will allow you to stay. I will see you at your wedding. Linda smiled and bowed to her father like a proper young lady. Of course, father. I will see you then. Afterward, the count departed from Kufstein, and thus the last guest on Berengar's list of invitations had left his family's regions. From now on, Berenger no longer had to entertain the nobility and could get back to his normal schedule. He had many things to take care of in the coming days, and he was just happy to have a bit of reprieve. Chapter 37, we will see about that. After Lothar had departed from Kufstein, Berenger explained to his family the deal he had reached with the old count. They were very pleased with the results, especially Sieghard, who was convinced that Berenger was fit to be his regent after such a performance. A storm was brewing in the capital of the Kingdom of Germany, and Sieghard feared it would not be long before the war had ravaged the lands. Soon enough, he would be called off to battle once more, and when that happened, he would need a capable leader to rule in his stead. Initially, he was planning on placing one of his counselors as regent. However, these past few months, Berenger had transformed into a formidable young lord, one in which he knew would one day make a superior baron to himself. It was such a pity that he could only allow his son to inherit this humble barony. Berengar's potential as a ruler was so much greater than anyone he had ever met. As such, Baron Sieghard von Kufstein had finalized the plans to declare his son the regent of Kufstein. If for whatever reason he was forced to leave the dominion of his ancestors, it would be his son and heir who would have control while he was away. Tomorrow, he would fully declare to the family and his counselors that Berenger was to be regent. For now, the Baron had to chastise his second son for making such a terrible mistake that, if not for Berengar's intervention, would have cost the family dearly. Lately, Lambert had been failing Sieghard's high expectations. If you were to ask him half a year ago which was his favorite son, it would be Lambert. Yet now Berenger was the shining star of the family, and Lambert was an utter disappointment. The roles of his two sons had reversed completely. While Sieghard had a long and difficult conversation with Lambert, Berenger was currently overseeing the drills of his militia alongside his second-in-command, Eckhard. Currently, his troops were equipped in entirely new garb. Berenger had used his textile factories and the imported materials to construct the uniforms of his militia. He had gained quite the eye for fashion ever since he was transmigrated into this world and was surrounded by luxuries. As such, the attire of his peasant militia was that of the Landsknecht, which were elite mercenaries of the 16th century battlefields from Berengar's previous life. Their clothing was honestly quite flamboyant, but it looked fantastic from Berengar's perspective. The Landsknecht uniforms were all dyed in the colors of his house, which were black and white and gold. The NCOs and officers were currently garbed in blackened steel munitions grade half-plate armor with matching bergonets and gorgets. Each piece had an intricate brass pattern engraved across the armor. Berenger was also properly equipped in the attire, though his outfit was even more garish than the other soldiers. He wore a Waffenrock, which was essentially a skirt that went over his pantaloons, and instead of a bergonet, he was equipped with a blackened steel skullcap with a feathered Landsknecht hat that was dyed in the colors of his uniform and house. Unlike his officers, the trim of his armor was done with gold, showing off the wealth and prestige he had recently acquired as well as his authority as the commander. He also wore a chain-mail mantle over his gorget, which was made of blackened steel rings, except for the bottom two rows, which were made of brass. All of the men were equipped with the anachronistic-looking 14-17 land pattern muskets, and they had their socket bayonets attached. Roughly 800 men had been split into 6 companies who were currently training in line tactics. For some time now, Berenger had been attempting to get his father to approve the manufacture of armor for his troops. Initially, his father was adamant that all armor production be given priority to his standing army. However, the workforce of the arms industry in Kufstein was now much larger than it was before, and the exact equipment Sieghard requested for his army was fully fielded. Thus Berenger had finally gotten the approval he needed to equip his militia with the armor they desperately required, but that was a very recent event. Aside from the NCOs and officers, very few men were currently equipped with proper armor. Still, it would not be long before his army was the most well-equipped force in the world. Truth be told, Sieghard was not exactly keen on adapting Berengar's military innovations, primarily because Berenger deliberately downplayed how revolutionary they were, but also because he was quite the traditionalist and believed the use of brigandine, mail, and gambeson for his standing army was a far superior quality than the munitions-grade half-plate and outlandish clothing that Berengar's forces were currently equipped with. He would be absolutely incorrect. as the armor Berengar's troops were fielded with was more than enough to sufficiently protect them against any lethal threat on the current battlefields while still being lightweight and maneuverable enough to conduct warfare properly. In fact, due to the quality of the steel Berenger was currently producing, he could manufacture slightly thinner and lighter weight armor than was historically used in the Renaissance while still being just as effective in protection. As Berenger mustered his forces and walked them through everything from marching drills, firing drills, and anti-cavalry drills, Linda watched from afar with a passionate gaze in her eyes. She was either smart enough or infatuated enough to believe that Berengar's tactics were revolutionary. After all, she had directly heard from Berengar's mouth during pillow talk how effective his weapons and tactics were at the Battle of Mining Town. She was too enamored by the spectacular sight of Berenger commanding his troops to notice that Adela had been walking by and noticed her impassioned ogling of Berenger. Adela instantly felt something was amiss about Lindy's glances and began to wonder if Linda had feelings for Berenger. After all, the girl treated her own fiancé like crap, especially after the recent incident, and had always been giving weird looks to Berenger and herself throughout the past couple of months. Initially, she thought that Linda was on Lambert's side in whatever conflict the brothers were engaged in, but now she did not know what to think. These were not the glances of a woman studying her enemy but that of a schoolgirl intensely focused on her crush. As such, Adela decided to approach and question the girl who was slightly older but much more developed than herself while she was currently entranced. Magnificent, isn't he? So much better than his scoundrel of a little brother. Linda was caught up in the scene in the field below and did not even register the fact that Adela had approached her. She merely heard the words and responded on instinct. He sure is. Only after Linda had said those words did she recognize that Adela asked the question and that the little girl was testing her. A look of horror spread across the bowtie's face as she realized that she practically just admitted that she preferred Berenger over her own fiancé to Berengar's fiancé. On the other hand, Adela was not pleased she got the answer she was most afraid of. A frown spread across the cute little girl's face as she quickly became strict with the teenage temptress standing next to her. I do not care if you admire him from afar. I suppose most girls do, but do not approach him. Berenger is my future husband and I have no intention of letting a harlot like yourself steal him away from me. However, the little girl's attempt to get Linda to withdraw backfired completely. The corners of Lindy's lips curved into a devilish smile. She slowly approached Adela with a smug expression on her face and whispered in the girl's ear. We will see about that. Afterward, Linda strutted away confidently as she left little Adela pouting in anger like a small child. Though Linda respected Berengar's wishes to not inform others of their relationship, she knew that someday Berenger would recognize their child as his own, and when that day came, if the heavens blessed her with a son, it would be her child and not Adela's who inherited the empire that Berenger would one day carve out of this land. As such, she was feeling pretty confident in the brief but heated exchange between herself and her lover's fiancé. Of course, the moment Berenger found out about this lover's quarrel, she would be punished severely, which also gave her a sense of excitement and anticipation. It had been a while since Berenger had been rough with her. Maybe she could finally invoke his ire with this incident. Adela, on the other hand, was in an extremely foul mood. Lindy's response could only mean one thing, that seductress was going to try to steal her man. Adela would not let Berenger fall into the vixen's trap. After all, though he was a benevolent man, he was still a man and could easily fall for a woman's wiles. Especially one as gorgeous as Linda. She vowed in her heart never to allow that to happen. Of course, if she were aware that Berenger had long since been involved in an intimate relationship with Linda, she would probably tear her own heart out. As the thunderous sounds of shots were fired into the straw targets by Berenger and his forces, war was declared in his own backyard without him even being aware. This was not a war that would exist between men and their armies, but two young beautiful women and their claims on a particularly excellent young man. It was only after the militia was done with its daily training that Berenger returned to the village. He was standing alongside his troops in the town square. He had his family's cooks work all day to prepare a feast for his soldiers and himself. While the army was mustering in the fields, the chefs were preparing a banquet for the hard-working troops. When Berenger told his chefs that he wanted to prepare a surprise party for his troops who had fought side by side with him at Mining Town, they were more than eager to help pay respects to the many men who had saved their lord's life. As such, the best dishes they could make were piled into the town square, where the soldiers engorged themselves with food and drank from the endless amount of beer that was poured for them by many young women. After a while of drinking and feasting, Berenger tapped on his mug with a spoon, gaining the attention of his soldiers who all looked upon him with respect. While still in his armor and just with the helm and cap removed, Berenger stood up from his table and began to give a toast to his men. I told you all I would celebrate our magnificent victory over the traitors at Mining Town. Unfortunately, my damned noble obligations came up and I was unable to celebrate with you men properly. Though it has been over a month since we stood side by side on the front lines, I wanted to dedicate this night to you all, the brave men of Kufstein who answered their commander's call in a time of need and brought down an army of traitors. Cheers! The town square echoed in cheers as the men celebrated their victory on this fine night. All of which were still in uniform. When the standing army and town guard gazed upon the hundreds of men in the town square in uniform, they began to feel a bit envious, and those who were a part of Lambert's faction began to feel fearful. Though they initially thought this peasant militia was nothing but common rabble formed on a young lord's whim, they had actually managed to win a battle with 0 casualties, which was beyond impressive. As such, Berenger spent the night drinking with his brothers in arms. It was not until 2 a.m. when Berenger returned to his bedchamber where he found Linda waiting patiently naked on his bed. Berenger approached his lover and began to caress her body. The last words he remembered hearing that night came from Linda as she whispered in his ear seductively and with a devilish grin on her face. "Master, I've been a naughty girl and need to be punished." Though he had no way of knowing what she was referring to, he was too drunk to care. Thus he accepted his role and bound the girl with ropes as he began to punish her for whatever misdeed she was informing him about. It would not be until the next day that he fully became aware of what Linda had said to Adela and the feud it had started. By then, it was already too late to prevent the girls from fighting with one another for his affection, and he would have to endure the consequences of having 2 women by his side. Luckily, neither of the girls were wicked enough to try to take one another's lives. Chapter 38, A Formal Declaration. Berenger awoke next to the arms of his beautiful lover and with a splitting headache. He had drunk far too much with the boys the night before, but it was a victory celebration and thus he felt his actions were justified. As such, he rose from the bed and decided to take things easy today. A day off from extensive exercise would not hurt him in the slightest, though he would never allow such an activity to become a regular occurrence. Linda awoke shortly after him and placed her arms around his body as she nibbled on his neck, giving the young man a love bite. It was her way of marking her territory and warding off potential predators of her man. In other words, it was a gift for Adela. Berenger laughed at how possessive the girl was this morning and shrugged it off as nonsense. He eventually pushed her down on the bed, thoroughly excited by her actions. He returned the favor and gave Linda a hickey on her graceful and slender neck. As long as she covered it up properly, it would not be a concern. The two engaged in some physical intimacy before parting ways for the morning. Now that Linda had a proper excuse to visit Berenger in the day, she would no longer need to avoid him openly. As long as she approached him under the guise of managing her father's transaction, she could spend time by his side at any point in the day instead of just secretly during the night. Finally, she would have more time with the father of her child. Something she desperately wanted to rub in Adela's face. Though she knew there was a limit as to the degree to which she could flaunt her relationship with Berenger to the little girl, else others might become too suspicious. She had already declared war on Adela and would not back down. Linda knew the little girl was too proud to release the details about their little dispute to the world. As such, she felt confident that she could contain any information regarding this love triangle between the 3 of them. Berenger, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of the conflict brewing between his future wife and his lover. Thus he was dumbfounded by the malevolent gazes the 2 girls gave each other at the breakfast table. He began to think that something may have happened between the young ladies that may have soured their relationship, and he was not the only one to come to this conclusion. Lambert witnessed their intense rivalry as they gracefully consumed their breakfast, sitting across from one another with fierce gazes. Of course, Lambert did not really care for the reason, as he was sure it was just the trivial matters of women and did not concern himself in the slightest. As the 2 girls feud over Berenger without anyone else's knowledge, Sieghard decided to break the awkward silence. "I am formally requesting the presence of my family and counselors in the Great Hall after we finish dining. There is an important announcement I would like to make that regards the safety and prosperity of our family and our realm." After saying that, everyone's attention was shifted to the Baron as he spoke in an authoritative voice. Noticing the presence of his future daughters-in-law, he decided to address them personally. "My ladies, your presence is not required, but if you would like to attend it, you are more than welcome to." Berenger sighed in relief when he noticed the 2 women nod at one another with stern expressions. He did not know why the girls were fighting, but he was certain he would find out soon enough. At least for now, the tension was released. Lambert, on the other, appeared visually nervous if his father was making a formal declaration. It must be something important. He began to fear that the favor his father had shown him was beginning to wane and instead be shifted upon his older brother and rival. Whatever this announcement was about, it surely pertained to Berengar's recent rise in power, which was not good news for him. Berenger sat in silence and continued his meal. Now that his women were not fighting one another, he felt much more at ease and could finally enjoy his breakfast. However, internally he was quite excited. There was only one thing that he could think of that Sieghard would announce after they finished eating, and if it pertained to his thoughts, then it would be great news for the young lord's aspirations. Shortly after the meal was completed, the family gathered in the Great Hall. Linda and Adela were still obviously feuding with each other about something. However, their attention was currently drawn to Sieghard, who sat on his seat of power where his counselors flanked him. They were men of great importance who advised the Baron on matters about the realm, even they were not privy to the contents of Sieghard's announcement. After everyone had arrived, Sieghard cleared his voice and spoke in a stern tone. "I, Sieghard von Kufstein, first of my name, Baron of Kufstein, hereby declare my firstborn son and heir regent. If I must travel from these lands, he is given full authority derived from me to act as Baron in my stead." A wide smile appeared on Berengar's face as he heard the news. He had been waiting for this declaration for a long time, and he had finally proven himself in the eyes of his father as a capable leader. Lambert, of course, was horrified. This was terrible news for him and his allies. When war finally broke out and Berenger took up his position as regent, he would have the full judicial authority to launch an investigation into Lambert's attempts on his life and gather the evidence he needed to execute him. This meant only one thing: Lambert had at most a year to end his brother's life before the old king croaked, and he was placed into an exceptionally vulnerable position. The problem was Berenger had solidified his position in the hearts of many of the surrounding nobles, those who were benefiting from his steel monopoly, and the burgeoning textile trade would obviously back Berenger if he requested their aid. It was now more difficult than ever to plot against Berenger. On the other hand, the girls both reacted to the news with satisfied smiles on their faces. This was good news not only for the man they loved but also for themselves, whose positions would become more favorable when Berenger became regent. Although when they realized that they both had the same satisfied expression on their faces, they immediately shifted back to a feuding state. The reactions of the councillors to this monumental announcement were varied. They were all aware of Berengar's recent transformation and his formidable capability of presiding over the realm. Thus, many of the councillors were excited by the news, as they could not think of a better man to take up the position. However, a quarter of the councillors were backers of Lambert's attempt to gain power, and thus they were quite miserable at the announcement. If they allowed Berenger to come to power, it would only mean their removal from office at best and their deaths at the worst. Henrietta and Gisela were both delighted by the news, and Sieghard had a satisfied smile on his face. Though they did not know it, battle lines were immediately drawn when this news was announced, and his two sons would increase the brutality of their war of intrigue. Berenger made sure to keep note of the expressions of the councillors who were either indifferent to the news or outright dismayed. It became immediately apparent that they were either on the fence about the issue or outright supporters of his brother. Thus Berenger figured he would get rid of his brother's most immediate backers before taking out any of the other local nobility who supported him. After all, these noblemen who advised his father held significantly more power than those who would answer his call to arms once every blue moon. Later that night, Berenger would get his spy network to acquire the materials he would need to manufacture a particular poison that was virtually undetectable in this medieval world. The target of his new ploy would be the marshal of his father's forces. The man was clearly the most disturbed by the news and even eyed Lambert for his reaction. Berenger did not doubt within his mind that the marshal was in bed with Lambert. As the commander of his father's forces, he presented the biggest threat to the security of his regency and needed to be removed before Berenger seized power. However, that was a task for later. After the declaration was made, Berenger was congratulated by many people, including his future wife and lover. Even Lambert was shocked when Linda approached Berenger immediately after the announcement and fought with Adela over who would pay their respects first. At this moment, Berenger instantly realized what was going on between his two women, and he knew that Linda had said something to Adela to antagonize her. Now her words from the previous night began to make sense, and internally he was furious. When the two were in the middle of bickering, Berenger raised his hand and the two immediately became silent. Adela, you are my fiancée, you may tell me what you wish to say first. Linda immediately became flustered as she was denied the right to speak with her lover first. Still, she understood his reasoning and let it slide. Congratulations, Berenger. I know you will do your family proud. The little girl then eyed Linda with displeasure and whispered in Berengar's ear. I need to talk to you about something later. Judging by the look on her cute little face, Berenger was certain that she was unaware of the extent of his relationship with Linda, which was a good thing, but he definitely needed to figure out what had been said between the two. He nodded and smiled at his future wife as he held on to her hands. Thank you. That means a lot coming from my fiancé. While saying that phrase, he eyed Linda with an expression that said, I know what you did and am not happy. Linda immediately flinched when she was the vicious gaze Berenger had given her. She began to think that maybe she should not have openly declared war on Adela so soon. She was definitely going to be punished far worse tonight, which made her dreadfully excited. Of course, she was skilled enough at acting to mask her desire with a look of indifference. After Berenger had accepted Adela's respects, he moved on to Linda, who bowed respectfully and said formally, Lord Berenger, I would like to congratulate you on your latest title. I trust you will be a benevolent and efficient regent in the future. Lambert was extremely agitated by the sight of his fiancée paying respects to her older brother, but judging by the lack of informality in her tone, it was merely her fulfilling her social obligations as such. He never suspected she was romantically involved with Berenger. Instead, he felt even more sure of his previous thoughts that she was bickering with Adela over something frivolous and thus did not pay any more attention to her actions. It went on for some time, but he had to entertain many people paying respects to him. When he was finally done with his noble obligations, he thanked his father for the trust he had placed with him and left the great hall. Adela was in tail following her fiancé. When they were finally secluded, he could not prevent himself from asking the little girl what exactly was the nature of her grievance with Linda. So, are you going to tell me what happened? Adela tried to fake ignorance, as she did not want to discuss her war with the temptress for his affection. I am sure I do not know what you are talking about. Berenger laughed at the young girl's cute face as she tried to pretend like she did not understand his question. Come on, it is obvious that you are fighting with my brother's fiancée. Even my father noticed it, and he isn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed when it comes social circumstances. Adela let out a deep sigh and told Berenger the truth of her encounter with Linda and how she felt about it. Needless to say, she was not happy. Berenger was an excellent actor and laughed it off as if it was a joke. He really needed to salvage the situation and he did his best to do so. That's it? She's obviously angry with Lambert for his drunken antics and is trying to make him angry by pursuing his older brother. If she really has any intentions to steal me away from you, I'm afraid it's too little too late. You have nothing to worry about. Adela looked at Berenger with a sheepish expression as she asked him with tears forming in her eyes. Really? Berenger, of course, instantly felt intense guilt for lying to his fiancée about the true nature of his relationship with Linda, but he could not well afford to reveal it at the moment. Granted, he felt justified in his actions and did not feel the slightest guilt for the act of having a lover on the side. However, he did not let any of those complex emotions show on his face as he masked his emotions with a very convincing facade. Of course. Do you think I would throw you a lavish engagement ceremony like I did if I did not have the intention to marry you? His words made sense and Adela slowly wiped the tears from her eyes. A smile spread across her face before she reached around Berengar's neck and pecked him on the cheek. Afterward, she ran away in embarrassment. Though she had kissed his cheek many times, it was still too much for the little girl to face him afterward. Berenger told the truth when he said that last part he had no intention to marry Linda. He had developed her into the perfect mistress, but that did not mean that she was wife material by any means. That was not something that could be cultivated in a woman past a certain age. By the time she was physically mature, she was either a wife material or she was not, or so Berenger believed. The young lord had personally witnessed too many men's lives ruined in his past life by the full-grown women they tried to change into housewives and the court system which favored the women after they no longer wanted to be married, no matter what atrocious things they may have done during their time of marriage. Luckily for him, divorce was a rare occurrence in medieval times. She would essentially need the Pope's approval. Even then, it would require special circumstances. While adultery was grounds for the dissolution of a marriage, it was a costly process and rarely worked in a woman's favor. He figured sooner or later he could convince Adela to share him with Linda. The girl was stubborn and prideful but not entirely close-minded. Of course, he would first need to marry the girl and show her how much he cared for her before even broaching the subject of his lover. At the very least, it would be many years before he ever admitted to it, and he would do his damnedest to make sure she did not find out until then. Thinking about it now, he should probably do his best to get in the good graces of the church. Despite being an atheist, he realized how much power the papacy held in this new world. It was far greater than the timeline of his past life. He decided to speak to his priest at the upcoming Sunday Mass and build a relationship with the clergy. It would be nice if he could find an open-minded priest, but the likelihood of that happening was very slim. Whatever the case, he would never confess his sins to a member of the clergy, especially in an era where the papacy held significant authority. Before going to bed, Berenger sent a message to his spy network to acquire the means to produce white arsenic, a tasteless, odorless, and lethal poison that could be used in a powdered form. When he could properly manufacture this deadly poison, he would use it on his first target. Though it would take some time to acquire the means to create it, thus he could only wait until his first assassination attempt. Before long, Linda showed up in his room with a guilty expression on her face. She willingly submitted herself for discipline, and Berenger spent the rest of his waking hours punishing the young beauty severely for instigating conflict with Adela, which she, of course, enjoyed to her heart's content. Though at the moment he had assured Adela he would not pursue Linda, she would only be suspicious from here on out. Nevertheless, Linda had actually been the one to form the love triangle that would one day become the backbone of a great dynasty. Chapter 39, Religious Ambitions. A few days passed and it was now Sunday, the day in which the people of Kufstein, both high and low, would gather for Mass, or liturgy as it was known in this era. Currently, Adela stood outside Berengar's door with little hope in her heart as she prepared to knock upon it and ask Berenger the same question she had inquired about ever since she first arrived in Kufstein. Unlike Berenger, who was secretly an atheist, Adela was a true believer in the gospel and held the church in high regard. However, every time she approached her fiancé to attend the Sunday service together, he always had an excuse as to why he could not go. Thus she was beginning to fear that he was, in fact, a heathen or an apostate, which was a condition she could not accept. Today she had fierce determination to drag the man she loved to church and save his potentially damned soul. As such, she sighed heavily before knocking heavily on the door to Berengar's room in which he was currently exercising. Berenger, will you attend liturgy with me? It has been quite lonesome without your presence. To her surprise, the door swung open and Berenger had a smile on his face. He completely forgot that he was currently dressed in only his undergarments while his upper body glistened with sweat, the sight of which caused Adela's face to flush with embarrassment. It took him a moment to realize why she was acting in such a sheepish manner before he realized that her eyes were fixated on his developing abs. He quickly put up a single finger and shut the door while saying, "One moment." By the time he returned, the young lord was dressed in a white linen undershirt that clung to his sweaty body. This was slightly better, and as such, Adela regained her composure before asking the question on her mind for a second time. "Berenger, will you attend the Sunday service with me?" She had no intention of letting him play hooky now that he had opened the door. However, what truly shocked her was Berengar's immediate acceptance of his request. "Of course. Today I am quite free and I would love to attend the liturgy with you." This was quite shocking to her since she arrived. He had never once accepted her request to go to church together, but now all of a sudden he agreed as if it were an ordinary thing for him to do. Was he really just swamped with managing his secular activities this entire time? She only felt foolish for doubting the religious views of her betrothed whom she held in high regard. Berenger sniffed himself before requesting the young girl who seemed incredibly excited about the fact that he would finally be attending the service with her. Just let me clean myself up a bit and I will meet you at the castle's gates in a quarter of an hour, okay? Adela quickly agreed to his request before chastising him as if she expected him to run away the moment she left his sight. Don't be late. Berenger nodded and smiled. Shortly thereafter. Adela departed and Berengars dropped his facade. Before muttering under his breath, I suppose she's lucky I have plans for the church. Afterward, he grabbed a hold of his attire and headed to the bath as promised. He would arrive at the castle's gates fully clothed in fashionable attire within a 15-minute time frame. All the while, Adela had been waiting for him at the entrance with a bright smile on her face. Berenger quickly grabbed a hold of the little girl's hand and led her to the church within the village where the rest of his family was already gathered. By the time he arrived, he had noticed that Lambert was there alongside Linda and Henrietta was grouped up with their parents. Linda had a shocked expression as she saw Berenger attend church for the first time since she had arrived. She was not particularly religious, but she at least pretended like she was. Berenger was usually silent about the topic and avoided the church as if it had been the epicenter of a plague. Still, the heavenly beauty felt quite perturbed as she saw her lover attending church alongside his fiancée. After greeting his family and lover, Berenger walked into the chapel with Adela before standing at attention while the priest went over his sermon. There were not many pews in medieval times and as such, unless one was old or feeble, they usually stood in the center throughout the entire service. As Berenger gazed upon the luxurious trappings of the chapel, he found himself and he could not help but scoff at the sight. Evidently, the church here was quite wealthy, yet he never saw them out in the field aiding the villagers in any charitable way. He would not doubt it if the head priest himself was embezzling funds to fill his own pockets. After all, the church was mighty, wealthy, and most importantly, corrupt, especially in this timeline. When he scoffed at the sight of how embellished this single church was, it did not go unnoticed by the deacon, who was a young man currently on the last phase of the path to priesthood. Though the priest himself did not notice Berengar's reaction, the deacon could not help but do so. After the ceremony was over, Berenger had initially intended to speak with the priest. After all, he wanted to establish some ties with the church. In particular, he was looking for an open-minded priest who may become useful in the future. However, before he could, he was approached by the deacon, who was quite cordial in his manners. My Lord Berenger, that is your name, correct? I hear many great things from the mouths of the parish about your many deeds. Do you have a minute to talk? Berenger was quite curious why the deacon would approach him as such. He took the time out of his busy schedule to see what this supposed holy man had to say. Berenger followed the man to a secluded area where they began to chat. The deacon was a young man, quite possibly even younger than Berenger. The man had short, dirty blonde hair and emerald eyes. He was the third son of a Saxon count and opted to join the church rather than vie with his siblings to inherit his father's land. This decision turned out to be a wise choice, considering most of his 5 brothers met with terrible accidents after the young deacon had left his family behind. As such, he was a man who was not only aware of Berengar's precarious position but was actively supportive of him. In fact, he was currently a member of Berengar's vast spy network throughout his family's lands. Even Berenger did not know the identities of all the little birds who reported to his lover about the activities of his enemies. The young man was eager to greet the Baron's son and heir, whom he had already aided with great effort in countering Lambert's schemes. As such, he bowed before Berenger respectfully and said his piece. My lord, I doubt you are aware of who I am, but I am one of the many members of your web of intrigue, and I know why you are here. You seek to establish ties with the church, is that correct? Berenger was shocked that a deacon would belong to his network of agents, and as such, he proceeded with caution. Testing the young deacon with a question only someone directly reporting to his spymaster would know the answer to. I'm afraid Adela has never mentioned you to me. The deacon was a bright man and knew instantly he was being tested by Berenger. If he were fake, he would most likely nod his head and recognize Adela as his spymaster. Yet, that was not the case. Instead, the young man grinned and gave the correct answer. Funny, I remember speaking to a young woman with strawberry blonde hair and sky blue eyes, not to mention her magnificent bust. Berengar's expression was indifferent, but he was really excited. He already had a member of the church working for him in the shadows. As such, he clasped the man's shoulder and apologized for his test. I apologize for my rudeness. It appears you really are a supporter of mine. One can never be too careful these days. What is your name? The man smiled greatly after hearing Berenger apologize for testing him. He truly was a man of character, as he had heard. I am Ludolf, a deacon of this church. Berenger walked around the area with Ludolf and picked up a golden chalice. Once more, he decided to test the youthful deacon and see if he could be fit into his plans for the future. Tell me, Ludolf, what are your thoughts of the garish embellishment we see around us? Gold crosses, chalices, chandeliers, and even rosaries. Is this not a waste of the church's funds? Ludolf smiled once more upon hearing Berengar's views of the church's wasteful spending. I could not agree more, my lord. Unfortunately, the priest of this chapel and the Bishop of Innsbruck care more about appearances than helping the common folk. Something I have heard that you accomplished quite well in our stead. I'm afraid no matter where I go, that seems to be the current status quo of the church. Sucking money away from the people like leeches with promises of salvation in return for their hard-earned coinage. Using it to build lavish chapels like this one. Such wasteful spending if you were to ask me. Berengar's lips began to curve into a smile. Though this young man may not seem like much, he had the potential to become the Martin Luther of this world. With the right guidance and support, he may very well break the papacy's stranglehold over the kingdoms of Europe. Something which Berenger greatly desired. If his aspirations were to become a reality, then he could not have the church wield unrestricted power throughout Europe as it currently did. He would need to start a revolution from within, and it just so happened this young deacon named Ludolf already had some revolutionary ideas. If pushed in the right direction, he could prove to be a powerful ally against the authority of the church. Thus Berenger decided to act like the devil on the young man's shoulder and guide him in causing a major schism within Christianity. Ludolf, I share many of the same sympathies. It is the reason I have not been attending service lately. Would you like to go for a walk? I would very much like to discuss my concerns about the direction the church is heading in. Ludolf, a wide-eyed and faithful young man concerned with the church's misconduct, took the seemingly benevolent young man for his word and followed him on a walk. The two would have an exceptionally long discussion about the difference between secular and spiritual authority and the separation of church and state. By the time the two had finished talking, several hours had passed, and Ludolf felt as if he had been enlightened by Berenger, who acted as if he were a pious man concerned about ecclesiastical corruption and its effects on the people of Europe. Thus Berenger not only further gained support from Ludolf in his war of intrigue against his brother, but also in his future struggle against the church and their overreaching power. One thing was certain: this man held great importance for Berengar's plans to bring an end to the era of the church's influence over the secular authority of the German people. After sending Ludolf back to the chapel with much to think about, Berenger returned home, where he dined with his family. Adela was pleased that he went to church with her. Though Linda looked at him strangely, she had many questions about why he went to church and who he spent his afternoon with. Nevertheless, now was not the time for the topic. After sharing a meal with his family, Berenger took a bath and then returned to his quarters, where he further developed the plans for the future city of Kufstein. Shortly thereafter, he heard a knock on his door and opened it to find Linda, who sprung into his arms. Berenger accepted her embrace while kicking the door close. After passionately kissing one another for several moments, Linda broke away and finally asked the father of her child the question on her mind. You don't seem like the type of man to take the gospel seriously. Why did you go to church? Berenger could not help but chuckle as he sat on his bed and poured himself some wine. After taking a swig from the chalice, he answered the question honestly. I have plans for the church. I'm not going to lie, I seek to destroy its dominion over these lands and its people by any means necessary. Truly, I find the hypocrisy, corruption, and power of the church in this world to be appalling. Linda was quite shocked by his ambitions. The church had held significant authority over Europe for centuries, yet the man she loved claimed he wanted to bring that era to a sudden end and implied using force to achieve his goals. Though she was not religious, she understood the church's significant power. It would not be an easy task. You know, if word got out about your plans, the church would declare you a heretic. Berenger nearly choked on his wine as he laughed at Lindy's remark. Let them come, I do not rely on the protection of God. Instead, I trust in the thunder of guns and the men who wield them. Soldiers win wars, not faith, and before long, my army will rival the legendary power of the kingdom of heaven. Though he was exaggerating, it was no lie to say that his armies were becoming quite well equipped and trained, better than any other force in the current world. Even if they only acted as a militia at the moment, they would become the core of his power when he inherited this land. Their numbers swelled by the day, and now that he was producing proper armor alongside their arms, Berenger felt as if his army could easily contend with a force 5 times their numbers on the field of battle. After all, his weapons were beyond effective against the greatest units of the era, and with the right tactics, he could overcome any foe. With time, his weapons would be even more efficient, and by then, nobody could stop him. Truthfully, religion had its purpose of serving in Berengar's many plans, but a church that refused to bend to his will did not. Berenger would make use of scripture and the concept of divinity in his future efforts of propaganda. Though he personally did not believe in such things, he realized that religion played an important role in functioning society. As such, he had plans for a reformation of the church, the extent of which would rely on Ludolf and those who would support his future efforts. As for Catholicism and the Pope's authority over secular affairs, he would never recognize such a thing. This adamant refusal to bend to the will of the church would lead to many conflicts with the papacy in the near future. Linda did not know what to say after hearing such a speech. Either Berenger was a madman or he truly had the capability to change the world. Personally, she did not care if the church's power over these lands collapsed and supported the rising ambitions of the man beside her. After finishing his wine, the two stripped off their lavish attire and embraced each other in the dark of night. For the rest of their waking hours, they intimately enjoyed each other's company. Chapter 40, Caught in the Act. Berenger gazed upon the musketeer who stood upon the testing field. In his hands was a small spherical steel device with a fuse sticking out from its top. In his other hand was a slow match in which the soldier used to ignite the fuse. After the successful ignition, the man lobed the spherical device towards a safe distance and quickly sought refuge behind the provided cover. Within seconds a thunderous explosion occurred and shrapnel was sent in every direction, shredding apart the closely packed straw dummies in which it had landed near. After such a shocking scene, the sound of slow clapping could be heard from afar as Berenger showed his sign of approval of the new weapon. What was just tested by this brave man was the prototype of a hand grenade. It would not be long before he could field these to his troops in large numbers and establish grenadiers into his ranks. However, this revolutionary weapon of war was not the most exciting innovation being tested to this day. Eckhard was filled with anticipation as the artillery crew loaded a strange-looking device into the bore of the 1417 pattern 12-pounds cannon. The old knight prayed to the Father above in heaven that this device went off without a hitch. After a relatively smooth loading of the cannon, the powder was vented and the cannoneer used the linstock to light the fuse. After a few moments, the familiar roar of the 12-pounds cannon echoed into the air. However, what truly astonished those who were fortunate enough to watch this secret testing was that when the projectile landed, it exploded upon impact into many fragments, sending shards of steel into all directions. The result of which was far more destructive than the hand grenade which was tested previously. This time a thunder of applause rose from the bystanders as they watched a new era of artillery being born before their very eyes. Berenger had a wicked smile on his face. He had finally done it. He had created the first explosive shell. Though the solid ball still had its uses against infantry, nothing was more devastating than explosive shells. In his previous lives timeline, the explosive shell was not invented until the 16th century. However, the shell he was currently using was modeled after those utilized by the 12-pounds Napoleon cannon by Union forces in the American Civil War. It was a far more efficient shell than the earlier designs. Eckhard saluted Berenger and congratulated him on his newest innovation. With this, their militia was even more fearsome than they were a month ago at the Battle of Mining Town. Commander, let me be the first to congratulate you on the success of this truly revolutionary design. With these shells, our artillery will rule the battlefields. Berenger smiled and returned the salute to his second-in-command. However, one thing was noticeably missing from his forces, the third branch that comprised all early modern armies for centuries. Cavalry, though he would not be able to raise cavalry for his militia until after he took over his father's position, either as a regent or as the baron himself. Nevertheless, this was truly a monumental occasion. With shell and canister being fired out of his 12-pound cannons, he could engage forces far larger than his own on the field of battle. As his militia further completed their training and outfitted themselves with better equipment, Berenger believed it would not be long before he could begin his conquest of Germany. It might take a few years for him to succeed his father. In his eyes, the Baron of Kufstein was not likely to survive the upcoming war. By the time the war was over and the various feudal powers of the kingdom exhausted themselves in bloody conflict, he would rise from the ashes and stake his claim with his superior army. By right of conquest, one day he would be emperor of the German people. After testing the new weapons, Berenger wanted them mass-produced as quickly as possible. As such, he put in priority order. He would have his artillery trained to use the new shells effectively and would establish the strongest and most elite of his infantry forces into grenadiers. Of course, all weapons operations were strictly confidential. As such, they would have to use the new testing field Berenger had set up out of the sight from unwanted eyes. After testing the weapons successfully and giving his new orders, Berenger returned to the castle, which took a while, seeing as he had to travel from his secret testing facility. When he returned, he saw Adela and Henrietta playing in the castle corridors. They were not too far apart in age and were getting along splendidly. On the other hand, Linda had a tense relationship with Henrietta. The little girl had good intuition and had a feeling something was going on between Lambert's fiancé and Berenger. A sense of intuition that the men of the family desperately seemed to lack. As such, the little Loli constantly ran away from Linda whenever she tried to get along with the family. Of course, Lindy's most strained relationship was with his Berengar's mother, Gisela. Gisela was a shrewd and proud baroness who had long suspected an affair between Berenger and Linda practically since the first night when Linda arrived at the castle. However, she saw how Linda treated Lambert and saw this dirty secret as a way to break her second son's betrothal. If Berenger wanted a lover to hold him over until he married Adela, then she would allow his selfishness, so long as she could later use it as a means to get rid of the young vixen once and for all. Though she was not aware of the fullest extent of Lindy's abuse towards Lambert, she could tell it was at the very least a verbally abusive and unhealthy relationship. Especially since the night of Berenger and Adela's engagement ceremony and the alleged actions Lambert had engaged in. The growing closeness between Berenger and Linda under the guise of Count Lothar's transaction did not ease the Baroness' animosity toward the young woman. Berenger was aware of how his mother eyed the two of them and had long since known about her suspicions. However, as long as his mother did not intervene, he would not say anything to her about his relationship with his lover. Of course, if Gisela were aware that Linda was currently pregnant with Berengar's child, she would do everything in her power to separate the two of them. When Adela saw that Berenger had returned home, she ran over and hugged him. Berenger responded to this by petting her head gently. It was nice having two women with completely different personalities to care for him. He vowed that he would never give up this lifestyle and never complicate it further by adding more women to the mix. He cared for both of his women equally as they both served their own unique roles in his life. After a while, Adela let go of Berenger and asked him the question on her mind. "Are you done with work for the day?" Berenger smiled and nodded at his little fiancée before noticing Henrietta come over to him with a sheepish expression. "Big brother, will you play with us?" Berenger chuckled lightly as the little loli grabbed a hold of his torso and hugged the other side of him. He thought to himself for a moment and then decided to entertain the two girls who were currently in the middle of playing an imaginary game. One where Adela was the crown princess who was captured by an evil witch. Berenger played the role of the valiant knight as he strode through the castle walls and rescued the princess from the wicked grasp of Henrietta, who acted the part of a wicked witch. Berenger felt quite embarrassed playing such childish games at his age and was thankful that video cameras did not exist at this time. He could not imagine what the internet would label him if the scene were posted on some video sharing site from his previous life. However, after rescuing the princess and slaying the evil witch, Berenger picked up Adela in a princess carry and walked around the castle with her. To his surprise, he got a reward that he was not expecting. When Adela gently pecked him on the lips, her face began to become red with embarrassment and she looked away while in his arms and awkwardly muttered, "My hero." At this point, even Berenger felt embarrassed as he was not mentally prepared for such a thing. He did not know what to say, so he chose some cheesy one-liner and smiled at Adela and said in a serious tone, "I will always protect you, my little princess." The scene was sickening to Linda as she watched in the corner. It was only when Adela's eyes met her own with a furious stare did the young beauty realize that her little rival had been aware of her presence and that Adela had deliberately done this to mark her territory. Linda thought it was cute that the little girl considered that slight peck on the lips to be considered a kiss. Obviously, Linda would have to leave her own mark on Berenger later that night to make up for it. After seeing Linda had watched the entirety of his performance, Berengar's heart immediately imploded. He sincerely hoped nobody was watching what would be considered a potentially illegal activity in his previous life. Yet he was caught in the act by his own lover. He was never going to live this moment down, and he could tell by the smirk on Lindy's face that she was going to hold this moment over his head forever. Berenger attempted to defuse the situation and asked Linda an important question, which immediately received the two little girls' glares. "Would you like to join us, Linda?" The heavenly beauty immediately scoffed at the idea and glared at Adela. "No thanks, Berenger. I've long since matured beyond the need to play such childish games. A word of advice, if you keep playing games like this with little girls, people might believe you to be a pervert." And with that said, Linda turned around and walked away with a smug expression on her face. Before Adela or Berenger could even form a response, she had already turned the corner and was out of sight. The couple then stared at each other awkwardly as Adela was still in Berengar's arms. Henrietta, of course, was lying on the floor pretending to have been slain, but she still managed to overhear the conversation and her disdain for Linda grew even greater as a result. After Lindy's departure, there was an awkward silence for a while before Berenger finally let Adela down from his arms. Feeling embarrassed about the whole situation, the young man scratched the back of his head before calling it quits for the evening. "I suppose we should end it here. We can play again some other time." Adela nodded. She was also quite embarrassed after Lindy's harsh words. On the other hand, Henrietta was pouting. She wanted to play some more with her big brother and soon-to-be sister-in-law. It was rare where she was able to play games with Berenger these days. Nevertheless, she acquiesced to their conditions. Either way, she would hold her elder brother to his word that they would definitely play together later. Afterward, Berenger dined with his family. It was a civil conversation and there was less animosity between him and Lambert than usual. Berenger was well aware that Lambert was in the middle of cooking up a conspiracy against him. After all, it had been a while since Berenger was given the title of regent and Lambert had yet to act. What Lambert did not know is that Berenger was also in the process of conspiring against his brother. His plan would not only disrupt Lambert's plot but actively take out one of the boy's greatest allies. After dinner, Berenger snuck out into the town where he entered his newly built chemical laboratory today. Tonight he would complete the production of white arsenic, which would allow him would begin his plot to assassinate his father's marshal, who was an ardent supporter of Lambert. Of course, he had to confirm such a thing before acting rashly. While some of his spies were acquiring the materials to create arsenic, others were gathering intel about any potential alliance with Lambert. In the process, Berenger uncovered Lambert's plot to act against Berenger and frame him and his militia for multiple crimes and used the marshal as a witness. Unfortunately for the teenage boy, the marshal would soon become very ill and pass away from this world. Berenger began to laugh sadistically as he saw the powdered arsenic that was created overnight. He would give his many spies strict instructions to lace the marshal's wine with the poison in small doses for the next week. Once the man became dreadfully ill, Berenger would increase the dose, effectively ending the man's life. As far as anyone was concerned, the marshal would have fallen ill and passed away from said illness shortly after. Even if someone expected an assassination, nobody would be able to prove it. Just like that, Berenger had taken this war of intrigue to the next level. Lambert would soon enough be left alone, cut off from any support, and when Berenger finally had his scoundrel of a little brother by his lonesome and the authority to pursue justice, then, and only then would he put an end to this war of intrigue once and for all. After distributing the poison to his assassins, Berenger quietly returned to the castle. He made sure that his absence went unnoticed. When he finally returned, he saw the familiar sight of Linda waiting for him. She immediately ran into his arms and kissed him passionately as if she was trying to remove the mark upon him that Adela had left previously. Just like that, Berenger and Linda spent the remainder of the night enjoying each other's passionate embrace. Chapter 41, Lindy's Revelation. A month had passed and Berenger awoke once more at the crack of dawn. Lying next to him was Linda, who was sprawled about under the sheets, her silky strawberry blonde hair glistened under the light of the sun. She was still asleep and lately had slept through his morning exercise. She was now roughly 2 months pregnant at this point, and as such, Berenger allowed her some much-needed rest as he knew that nobody else in the castle would be up at this hour. However, he quickly got out of bed and started his daily workout. Today was a chest-oriented day, so he used his bench press. Though he recognized that he would never be as physically strong as he was in his past life in this life, Berenger still tended to exercise 4 to 5 days a week. After spending half an hour lifting various weights, Berenger quietly exited his room and went for his daily run. He liked to run at least 10 miles a day during the days of the week he exercised. As such, he ran around the village in loose-fitting clothes early in the morning when the farmers began to get to work. Due to the recent industrialization of the region, many of the commoners had proper working hours and were still resting at this time. Thus the number of people up at this ungodly hour was constantly dwindling. Berenger would wave and say hello to the common folk, but his primary focus was on his run. The only other people who were up at this hour were the militia members in basic training. When their commander ran by, getting in his morning run, they all saluted him. At attention, he returned the salute as he continued to run. The fact that the men could see their lord and commander up at the same hour, engaging in an exercise routine like themselves, boosted their morale as well as their trust in Berenger. He was a man who led by example and refused to get any more sleep than his men did. Berenger also never truly had a day off from his work. He was so busy maintaining his region's industrial, agricultural, and military sectors that he felt like he did more work than his father did. In fact, his father, the Baron, had deliberately pushed an excess of his workload onto Berenger, expecting him to break from the stress. Still, Berenger took it in stride and exceeded his expectations in every way. This was one of the reasons Sieghard gave him the prestigious title of regent. Berenger thrived when he was busy. He was not a man who could handle idle time well. When Berenger had downtime, he was bored, and he always found something to do when he was bored. Preferably something productive. As such, he worked harder than anyone he knew. This was a trait from his previous life, where he had to work hard for everything he owned. His family was not particularly wealthy growing up. Both of his parents worked full-time jobs with excessive overtime. From a young age, he found himself helping around the house to alleviate the stress on his parents' shoulders. That was one of the reasons he knew all of his family's cooking recipes by heart. As the son of German immigrants, his youth was filled with German cuisine, and when he reached a certain age, he handled the cooking and cleaning of the house when his parents were at work. By the time he was an adult, he had entered West Point and after graduation was an officer in the military. As such, he spent much of his downtime looking busy. In his mindset, if you are looking busy, you might as well be productive. After finishing his run in roughly an hour and a half, Berenger returned to the castle where he washed the sweat away from his body in the private bathhouse the family had constructed within their castle. After getting out of his bath, over 2.5 hours had gone by since the time he woke up and he planned to get some work done in his chambers. He returned to his room to find that Linda was still asleep by now. The servants were wide awake and active throughout the castle. Even his family members were out and about. The fact that the young woman was still in his room meant there was a great risk involved with returning to her quarters at this point. Berenger walked over to the bed and got inside with Linda. He decided to tease the girl and caress her bare body until she woke up. She immediately felt him grabbing onto her heavenly bust and a smile spread across her face as she pretended to sleep. However, when Berenger whispered in her ear, "It's already past 7:30. If you continue to sleep in, my family will find you here." Linda immediately got up and out of bed while shaking his hands away from her breasts. "Master, why didn't you tell me it was so late already?" Berenger chuckled as he watched her get dressed in her nightgown from the night before with a big grin on his face. "You need your sleep, so I decided to let you rest." After getting dressed in her nightgown, the girl kissed him on the lips before absconding from his room in secrecy, cautiously returning to her own quarters while making sure nobody was aware she had spent the night with Berenger. If Berenger had not awoken her, she would have surely slept in long enough to cause a scandal. Thankfully, her lover was looking out for her. After Linda had left his room, Berenger spent the remainder of his morning going through his progress. By now, the formation of 2nd Artillery Battery was taking precedence over the infantry battalion's ranks. Most of the new recruits were placed into the 2nd Artillery Battery while the arms factory had begun to spam 12-pound cannons. He now had more cannons than cannoneers, which he supposed was a good problem to have. Due to the increase in workforce, he was able to form the 2nd steel production line in half the time of the 1st, and it was now fully operational. With the increase in productivity of the mines after the von Kufsteins seized them from Ulrich's family, the steelmaking factory could double its output. Any steel that exceeded their production capability was sold at a fair price to the contacts he had made during his engagement ceremony. The armor he designed had been produced in massive numbers for his troops, and a total of 1/4 of his soldiers were now equipped with munitions-grade half-plate armor. After investing in importing materials and establishing the use of inventions like the spinning mule, he was now able to make clothing for peasants and nobility fetching a fair price while relying mostly on local production. It was only the super luxurious fashion that cost him a pretty penny to make. Luckily, he was still able to sell them for quite the profit, thus expanding the already filled coffers of the barony of Kufstein. Today was an important day for Berenger. Two of his schemes would fully come to fruition this day. Over the past month, the marshal had been slowly poisoned by the young lord's spies to the point that he was very near death. A slight overdose today would rid the world of one of Lambert's most powerful allies. Though physicians had checked on the man, ultimately they could not find out the cause of what ailed him. The second scheme was far more important in the long run and would come to fruition this day. Linda would be informing the family that she was pregnant with Lambert's child when in all reality it was Berengar's. Since the night of Berenger and Adela's engagement ceremony, she had avoided Lambert as much as possible. The boy had approached her several times requesting that they sleep together, but she kept refusing him. As such, Berenger arrived on time at the breakfast table where he waited patiently for Linda to break the news. After the family enjoyed their meal for quite some time in peace, the young woman finally dropped the bombshell on the family. The girl's face instantly grew flustered as she spoke her words. "I have an important announcement to make." After a slight pause which aroused everyone's interest, Linda looked at Berenger, then at Lambert, and then back down to the table where her meal was laid out. Finally, she blurted out what she was instructed to say, minus a very critical detail. "Impregnant." From Berengar's perspective, the girl noticeably failed to mention it was Lambert's child. However, that did not stop the family from being shocked by the revelation and assuming it was Lambert's. Though she didn't explicitly say the child was Lambert's, the only person who suspected it might be Berengar's was Gisela, who eyed her eldest son curiously. Though Berenger may try to act surprised, Gisela knew when her son was lying, and at that moment, she was correctly able to guess that the child was, in truth, Berengar's, not Lambert's. Lambert was at first in shock when he heard the news. He had to clarify the issue. "You're pregnant?" Linda nodded in response. Sieghard, on the other hand, interrupted and asked his own question. "It is my son's?" Linda frowned at the comment and answered honestly. "Who else would be the father?" With that being said, a smile appeared on both Lambert's and Sieghard's faces. They were excited by the news and could not wait to throw a wedding. On the one hand, Lambert was happy because this solidified Linda as his woman. Even if she was not sleeping with him, nobody else was either. As such, he could be considered the only man to sleep with the gorgeous young woman who was considered one of the 3 heavenly beauties of Austria. On the other hand, Sieghard was just happy to have a grandchild which he would hopefully be able to see before he perished. He too did not have high expectations for surviving the upcoming war. The two were completely unaware that the girl never once directly admitted to Lambert being the father. After all, Sieghard had another son. Lambert attempted to hug Linda in response to the news, but the girl slapped him across the face in front of his family and shouted at him. "Who said I had forgiven you?" Quickly the young boy sulked back to his seat in silence. Berenger was trying to contain his wicked grin. He had truly grown into the role of a sadist over the last few months, at least when it regarded his enemies. Nothing gave him more joy than watching his nemesis dangle on the hook he had cast for him. Lambert played along to Berengar's tune perfectly, and the young lord could not get enough of it. He supposed he had Linda to thank for this juicy scene. By not directly admitted to Lambert being the father, Linda was essentially leaving a door open for Berenger to claim the child as his own later in life. Something in which the young woman was adamant about making a reality. Thus it was Lindy's scheme and not Berengar's which was cemented in history this day. Adela, on the other hand, had never suspected Berenger to be the father. Despite the fact that Linda had openly declared war on the young girl and had by vying for Berengar's affections as of late. She had enough faith in her betrothed that he would not do such a thing behind her back. Also, she was aware of Lambert's supposed misdeed, and the timing for Lindy's pregnancy matched perfectly. In a million years, the little girl would never suspect that Berenger had deliberately framed Lambert to assume the role of the father of his bastard child. As such, a smile spread widely across her face as she felt as if by this news she had already won the war against Linda. After all, there was no way Berenger would be interested in a woman who was pregnant with his brother's child. The conversation around the breakfast table quickly shifted to altering the wedding plans so that it may occur at the soonest date. Lambert's 16th birthday was later this week and he would finally become of the proper age to marry. Though Linda acted as if she was acceptable to those terms, she could not wait for the day until her lover eliminated her fiancé. She prayed to God above that Berenger may strike down Lambert before her child was born. That way, the child would never have to worry about who its real father was. The only person at the table who was not satisfied with this result was Gisela. With this news, the Baroness realized that she would never be rid of her future daughter-in-law, a young woman she greatly despised. Worse yet, Berengar's fling with the harlot had resulted in her having great confusion about the actual parentage of her future grandchild. Much like Adela, Gisela would never have guessed that this was all a ruse by her eldest son to pin the parentage onto Lambert. After all, she was unaware of the war which her 2 sons waged in the shadows. With this breaking news, the family at the very least pretended to have a pleasant breakfast. Later that day, Berenger would finalize another of his schemes to screw over his little brother who had already thrice made an attempt on his life. Berenger was a man who did not easily forgive his enemies, and soon Lambert would come to feel his older brother's wrath. Chapter 42, Death of a Marshal. Lord Friedhelm von Thiersee had served as the Marshal of Kufstein for close to 30 years now. He was a man who was growing older in his years and now had long white hair, a matching beard, and many wrinkles. Despite his old age, the elderly man could still wield a sword in combat and command his liege's armies in battle. That is until a week ago, when his health took a sudden turn for the worse. His physicians did not know the cause of his illness and attributed it to the frailty of old age. However, today, the same day that Linda announced she was pregnant, the elderly man was lying on his deathbed in his family's domain, in which they had ruled under the fealty of the von Kufsteins for centuries. His children were surrounding him and awaiting his last gasp. Truthfully, the man had lived long enough to know when someone was poisoned, and he already had a suspect in mind. However, by the time he realized this fact, it was too late, as he was now too frail to communicate his suspicions effectively. Currently, his servants attended to his need. However, he was now certain that they were secretly agents of Berenger and had been the ones to administer the poison to him in the first place. At the moment, a servant who had been in his service for the past 15 years approached him and force-fed the old lord a glass of water which was laced with poison. Since the marshal was no longer able to drink without assistance, he had no choice but to accept the final dose of the lethal poison. It took a while for the dose of poison to take effect. As such, the elderly lord struggled desperately to make his last words an accusation against the eldest son and heir of the baron. Ultimately, the sounds that came out of the elderly lord's mouth could not manage to contain a coherent thought. The only understandable word in his deathly babble was the word Lambert, which immediately caused a hint of concern on his family's faces. Why would the old man's last word be the name of the second son of the baron? However, before they could ask the old man what he meant by using the name, the marshal drew his last breath and exited this world. Ultimately, this left a hint of suspicion on several of the more clever family members' faces. They would even investigate if Lambert had something to do with the old patriarch's sudden illness. Ironically, by trying to get his family to warn Lambert that his brother was the most likely suspect with the marshal's untimely death, Lord Friedhelm instead thrust the suspicion onto Lambert, which would ultimately result in his family siding with Berenger in the war for the title of baron. Of course, at the time, Berenger had no way of knowing that his assassination of the marshal would provide key evidence in his later attempts to eliminate Lambert as a threat. Thus on that night, the lordship of Thiersee mourned the loss of the mighty and efficient lord who had presided over them for decades. By the time Berenger and his family heard the news of Lord Friedhelm's passing, it was already late into the next day. This was shocking news for Sieghard, who suspected his marshal to be having a brief bout of illness. He had never expected the elderly lord to die from what ailed him. As such, Sieghard immediately called for a grand funeral to honor the memory of his loyal marshal who had served his family for so many years. On the other hand, Lambert was horrified by the news. He had only recently become aware of his ally's illness and chalked it up to the troubles of the elderly. However, with his passing and Berengar's smug expression, he knew instantly that his brother had conspired against a key ally in his fight for the inheritance. Without the marshal on his side, he would have difficulty rallying the town guard against Berenger when his father eventually departed for war. Even if Lambert did not truly understand how efficient Berengar's militia was, if Lambert acted quickly enough upon their father's departure, he could seize power and imprison his brother before Berengar's militia could enter the castle's gates and secure the young lord's regency, which he had been a critical point in Lambert's plans for the future. Without the forces already stationed in the castle backing him, Lambert now had little chance of achieving such aims. Nor could he form his own militia, as Berenger clearly had won the hearts of the common folk, and rumors had spread around of Lambert's character being more wicked than he displayed in public. In fact, despite the period of mourning, Sieghard needed to declare a new marshal. The only problem was there were not many men as experienced as Friedhelm in the ways of war. The position of marshal was critical for a lord, as they essentially commanded all forces of the realm in the stead of the feudal lord. However, Sieghard personally enjoyed commanding his forces under his reign. The marshal had always been more of an advisor on strategy and tactics, as well as the chief of his law enforcement. As Sieghard was not expecting to survive the upcoming war, he had to consider someone capable of advising his son and heir on the matters of law enforcement and warfare in the future. What Sieghard did not know is that Berenger had already found such a capable man to fulfill the role and would eventually replace whoever Sieghard had chosen for the position of marshal. Currently, Sieghard was in a meeting with Berenger discussing the role of marshal and who should be appointed. Berenger was surprised that Sieghard was now taking his opinion into account. It could only mean one thing: Sieghard was preparing for his eventual death on the battlefield and his son and heir's transition to power. However, he had to confirm such suspicions and thus asked his father outright. "Father, I know that there is a storm approaching and that soon this land will be embroiled in civil war. Are you not planning to take your marshal with you into battle?" Sieghard gazed solemnly upon his son and heir. He had a suspicion that Berengar's act of forming a militia was to act as a proper defense for the barony while he was away at war, which was one of the reasons he would always compromise when it came to the expenses of arming the militia. I won't lie to you, son, what you say is true. Shortly I will be called to war by the Count of Tyrol. I do not anticipate coming back from this conflict alive. It may take years, but sooner or later I will perish on the battlefield fulfilling my duties to our liege. What I want is to put someone capable in charge of barony's defenses and law enforcement. Someone who can guide you best on how to defend our land in my stead. Berenger tried not to smile as his suspicions were confirmed. His father knew he was no longer fit to be baron with how efficient Berenger had proven himself as a ruler. Now that his children were old enough to survive without him, he was looking for a way out. This meant that in a handful of years, Berenger would be baron and could fully enact his plans to conquer the German-speaking regions. Rather than waiting for his father to die peacefully in his sleep in a few decades. Berenger was ruthless to his enemies, perhaps even cruel, but he was not a psychopath. His father had shown him nothing but benevolence and patience as he grew up, and Berenger had no desire to harm his father to accomplish his goals. At most, he would have mustered his forces and force his father to abdicate if his reign went on for too long. With his father's goal to assign a marshal who can aid Berenger, he had no choice to voice the candidate he already had in mind. Father, I know of a man who is perhaps greater material for a marshal than the late Friedhelm. Sieghard looked up from his list of candidates and stared into Berengar's eyes. He was personally not aware of such a man in his realm. You do? Berenger nodded as he proceeded to make his suggestion. Eckhard, he is an anointed knight and a veteran of many battles. He has quite the mind for strategy and tactics, and am certain he can quickly adapt to the role of law enforcement. He's the second command of my militia and was instrumental in the defeat of Ulrich's forces at Mining Town. A wide smile spread across Sieghard's face. It turned out his son had already found a capable marshal who was loyal to him. This was good news for the realm's future. As he thought about it, he began to smile more. This essentially meant that Berengar's militia could be incorporated into the town guard and act as a military force, with police duties among the civilians. In Berengar's previous world, such a force would be referred to as gendarmerie. It would be quite the efficient force in defending his family's territory when he was off at war. As such, he immediately accepted Berengar's suggestion. Very well, I will name Eckhard Marshal of the Realm after Friedhelm's funeral. We will incorporate your militia into the town guard, and it will act as the defensive force of the barony and as its law enforcement. Berenger was extremely delighted by this news. By eliminating Friedhelm, he had guaranteed that a unit of his forces would be stationed in the castle and loyal to him. If Lambert attempted to cause trouble upon the start of his regency, it would not end well for his little brother. With a single assassination, Berenger had greatly weakened Lambert and his allies' ability to harm him. Slowly but surely, the tides were turning in his favor. Soon he would be able to finish this war of intrigue and secure his reign. With Eckhard's appointment as marshal, he could root out any supporters of Lambert within the ranks of the town guard and have them expelled from its forces under false charges, thus ensuring the only armed force within the barony of Kufstein after Sieghard's departure was loyal only to Berenger. This also would mean that Berenger would now have the authority to raise cavalry forces and add them to his ranks, albeit in small numbers. He believed he would start with a unit of demi-lancers, a type of cavalry that would one day replace the heavily armored knights of this era. The establishment of such a force would have to wait until after Eckhard's appointment to marshal, which would take at most a month and a minimum of a fortnight. Nevertheless, things were looking bright for Berengar's future as his path to power was slowly beginning to come together. After conversing with his father about the details of the appointment for some time, Berenger returned to his room, where he began drafting the plans for the establishment of a demi-lancer company, which would be outfitted with 3/4 munitions grade plate armor and lances. After a while, he heard a knock on his door, and when he opened it, he saw Adela standing before him in a beautiful dress in the colors of black, white, and gold, which were the colors of his house. She looked ravishing in such attire. In her hands was a tray full of cookies and milk. The young girl had quite the sweet tooth. "May I enter?" Berenger would not deny his future wife entry into his room. As such, he made way for her approach, and the two sat down next to each other while snacking on the treats. Though Berenger enjoyed them, he did not enjoy the sweet desserts quite as much as Adela did. Still, he could not prevent his mind from thinking about chocolate. Unfortunately, it would be a long time before he could send an expeditionary force to the Americas to claim potatoes and cocoa. Nevertheless, it was one of his greatest goals in this life. The establishment of a colonial empire in his mind was a necessity. However, the reasoning was more for the wide variety of crops and spices it could bring back and less for the territorial expansion. Nevertheless, when he was able to do so, he fully intended to take advantage of the European powers' lack of knowledge of the rest of the world and lay claim to territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. With the power his armies would wield by then, nobody could stop him. To achieve this, he would first need to unite Germany and gain some coastal territories. He wanted major naval bases in the Baltic, North, and Adriatic seas. Then he would need to build a mighty navy to maintain colonial power. Either way, it was many years, if not decades, away from where he currently stood. Nevertheless, he would do everything he could to establish his empire as the world's preeminent power. Needless to say, there was a lot of work ahead of the ambitious young lord. For now, he relaxed by his young fiancée and dined on cookies while dreaming of conquering the world. Chapter 43 Expanding Influence. While Berenger was conversing with Adela and going over his drafts for establishing a demilancer company, Linda was hard at work as the master of Berengar's intricate spy network. What started as a small group of peasants watching and listening to potential threats and reporting them to Berenger turned into a massive spiderweb that infiltrated every noble house within the barony of Kufstein under Lindy's management. Say what you want against Berengar's lover, but she had a brain for intrigue and had been crucial in the war against Lambert and his allies. The beautiful young woman divided the network into various cells located in every major inhabited region of the barony. Through combined use of couriers, carrier pigeons, direct interaction, smoke signals, and other methods of communication, Linda was able to understand everything that was transpiring within the region of Kufstein. A complex hierarchy was established to allow the freedom of local cells to engage in espionage, propaganda, and assassination at will without it ever being traced back to Berengar's doorstep. The hierarchy was as follows. At the top of the organization was Berenger. He was referred to by those who knew of his existence as the sovereign. Beneath the sovereign was the listener. This was Lindy's job. She would listen to Berengar's orders, if he had any, and relay them to the speakers, who were the leaders of every cell. The speakers would then relay these jobs to the eyes, ears, mouths, and hands. Each was tasked with a different specialty in intrigue. Eyes and ears were generally used for espionage and gathering intelligence. Mouths were used to disseminate misinformation and engage in propaganda efforts, and the hands were used for practical jobs, primarily being assassination and sabotage. Below all of these were associates. They were not official members of the organization but were essentially pawns who unwittingly aided Berengar's spy network. The only members who knew that Berenger was the sovereign were the listener and the speakers. The rest were merely led to believe they were acting in the interest of the realm, and as such, if caught and interrogated, could not pin the blame on Berenger. Currently, Linda was expanding the network throughout the entirety of Tyrol, starting with establishing a cell within Innsbruck. She knew just the person to fill the speaker's position, someone who could be trusted and was completely loyal to her. When she wrote the letter to her personal maid informing her of the duties she would be responsible for, the young woman took extra precaution and wrote the letter in a code that only the two would understand. Lindy's maid was actually her little half-sister, a bastard of the family, and her name was Adelheid. If anything, Adelheid was the closest thing Linda had to a friend growing up. After all, Lindy's cold, sadistic, and domineering attitude had kept many people away from her. Those who stuck around were generally guys entranced by her physical beauty, like Lambert. Unfortunately for them, they were never able to win her favor. Thus Linda wrote the letter honestly to Adelheid, informing her of everything she had been through in Kufstein and her change in character. The only reason she risked doing so is that she knew Adelheid would support her no matter what she did or who she became. The letter contained some deeply personal information, including that she was currently pregnant with Berengar's child and had framed Lambert into being perceived as the father. After writing about past events, she concluded the letter asking for Adelheid's help forming a spy network throughout Innsbruck. There was sufficient pay offered, which was obviously kept off the ledgers, but more importantly, it was a personal request from Adelheid's big sister and best friend. After sending the letter with a confidant to her home in Innsbruck, Linda sat back and sighed as she drank from a glass of purified water in which Berenger had made sure to make plenty of for her consumption. After all, she could not drink alcohol during her pregnancy, and Berenger would never allow her to drink unfiltered water. Linda rubbed her belly as she thought about the child growing inside of her. Every day she prayed it was a son so that he could inherit Berengar's position one day. Having full confidence that he would become a king, she wanted her son to be legitimized and succeed his father more than anything. Of course, if she knew that Berenger had already planned a wide degree of political reforms for the future, one of which was critical to succession laws, then she would not care so much about whether or not her first child is a boy. She figured that Berenger was in his room eating snacks with Adela and talking about his plans right now. She scoffed at the little girl's sweet tooth and figured that one day it would come back to bite her. Nevertheless, she wished it was her with Berenger right now. However, she could not very well intrude on their private time. After all, she would have plenty of it for herself later, and though she was competing with Adela for Berengar's affection, she had no plans to monopolize him for herself. She had become quite accepting of her role as his lover. In the meantime, she was trying on dresses that Berenger had made for her. They were all in the colors of his house, which she took as a sign that he truly thought of her as family. If anyone asked where she acquired them from, she would say she purchased them from Berenger. Nobody needed to know that the Baron's son and heir showered her with gifts, everything from fine jewelry to exquisite dresses and shoes. Berenger made sure that both his girls were basking the most luxurious of clothing and accessories available. She looked in the mirror gauging her appearance and knew that Berenger would be delighted by her stunning beauty. She could not wait to show him how she appeared in the attire he had made for her. However, that would have to wait. For now, she passed the time mixing and matching her outfits and accessories until she found the perfect looks for each of them. Berenger was sitting in his room eating snacks with Adela. For whatever reason, the young girl decided to feed him the treats herself. He found the idea to be a bit ridiculous, but thankfully nobody was nearby to see the embarrassing scene. As such, he closed his sapphire eyes and accepted the treats his young fiancée fed him. For some reason, he could not help but feel like he had reached the pinnacle of life at this moment. Of course, a moment later, he quickly realized such a thought was absurd and his fiery ambitions took hold of his mind once more. Nevertheless, he enjoyed the time spent with Adela. Eventually, he had to stop the girl's actions. Unlike her, he could not eat so many sweets without feeling sick to his stomach. Adela pouted after seeing him resist the treats she was trying to force feed him, but eventually she accepted that he was too old to eat nothing but dessert. Berenger, on the other hand, finally had to express his concerns about the young girl's eating habits. You know it is terrible for your health if you continue eating such a large amount of sweets as you do. You should really eat more meat and grains. Once more, the adolescent girl began to pout as she heard his words. The expression on her face was too cute. Berenger could not help but tease her. What if I fed it to you? Would you eat some then? Adela could not help but become flustered by his statement as her cheeks became as red as apples. Eventually, she nodded and Berenger could not stop himself from chuckling. Wait right here, I will go get some of my favorite foods and we will share them, okay? It was not as if Adela did not like the myriad of recipes Berenger had introduced to the world. She preferred the desserts, which as a responsible adult, Berenger could no longer allow her to snack upon them constantly throughout the day. As such, he walked to the kitchen where he found the chefs hard at work. Upon seeing the young lord approach, they all greeted him. My lord, what brings you to the kitchen? Berenger smiled at the cooks as he saw their eager expressions. He came here with a purpose in mind and soon expressed it. Do you guys have any pork relatin lying around that I can snack on? A particularly young chef walked over with a plate filled with the fabled dish and brought it to him. I had just finished cooking this. It would be an honor for you to taste it. Berenger smiled, took a juicy piece from the plate and stuffed it in his mouth, a wide grin spreading across his face. Excellent, it has turned out great. Do you mind if I take the whole plate from you? The cook shook his head with an eager smile on his face. Not at all, my lord, all of this belongs to you and your family. Berenger quickly accepted the plate. The only other thing he stopped by for was a flagon of beer to wash it down with. Afterward, he walked off toward his personal room after leaving behind a message. You guys are doing an excellent job, keep up the good work. With that, he disappeared into the hallway while the cooks looked at him with excited expressions. They were just complimented by the man who came up with all these recipes. Clearly, they were doing their jobs correctly. Berenger returned to his quarters with a plate full of pork roulade and a flagon of beer in his hands. He proceeded to sit down next to Adela as he picked up a piece with his finger and stuffed it into the little girl's face. Say ah. Adela's face became flushed with embarrassment, but eventually she closed her eyes and did as she was told. Ah! Eventually, the food entered her mouth and she could not help but exclaim in excitement. It was so much tastier when being fed to her by the man she loved. Eventually, she devoured the whole thing, and before she knew it, Berenger said something to her which she didn't register because he had moved too quickly. You have something on your face, silly girl. With that said, Berenger reached out with his index finger and wiped the excess sauce off the roulade off her pretty pink lips and stuck it into his own mouth. After licking his finger for a few moments, one word escaped his lips. Tasty. Afterward, he began snacking on a piece himself while Adela nearly passed out from embarrassment. Berenger could not help but laugh at her sheepish expression. He decided to tease her a bit more. You want more? Despite her awkwardness, Adela nodded her head while her face was practically the color of a tomato. As such, Berenger repeated the process with the girl, after which she asked him a question that shocked him. Is that beer? Berenger could not help but nod his head. He was quite proud of the beer produced by the village and practically drank it full time. With his alcohol tolerance, he did not need water. Besides, he needed the calories since he was still trying to bulk up. He eventually asked her the question on his mind. Why do you ask? Adela shifted her eyes left and right before speaking her thoughts. Can I have some? Berenger was in a moral dilemma, though it was common for children to drink in this time period as there was no drinking age. Berenger could not help but have a nagging voice in the back of his head from his 21st century memories telling him it was illegal to supply minors with alcohol. However, his medieval mindset eventually won the debate and he extended the flagon for Adela to drink from. After taking a large gulp of the beer, the more the girl drank, the more her face began to become red with intoxication. She was not used to consuming alcohol and thus rapidly became drunk. Eventually, Berenger cut her off, but by that point, her small head had begun to bob as she rested it on Berengar's shoulder. Eventually, she looked up at him with a drunken gaze filled with desire and pressed her lips against his, which startled the young lord. Though it was another childish peck on the lips, the expression on her face led Berenger to believe that he had allowed her to drink too much. Thus he retreated from her grasp. The moment he did so, tears began to form in the adolescent girl's eyes as she asked the question which concerned her. Do you not like me? She stated in her drunken state. Berenger sat next to her and hugged Adela tightly as he calmed her down. It is not like that, you are just too young right now. In a few years when we are married, I promise we can spend more time together. But for now, I think you should get some sleep. As such, despite the girl's intoxicated protests, Berenger picked Adela up into a princess carry and dragged her off to her room. After placing her in her bed, the girl quickly passed out and Berenger could not help but think to himself as he looked upon Adela, who was sprawled out on her bed in a drunken stupor. This girl is too cute. With that being said, he left Adela's room and returned to his own, where he got back to work on his plans for the Demi-Lancer equipment and tactics. Before long, he heard a knock on his door and he could already guess who it was. When he finally opened the door, he saw Linda wearing one of the many dresses he gave her. She was adorned with the lavish jewelry he gifted her and wore a pair of black leather slippers. She looked at him with a slightly flustered expression and asked him the question that had been on her mind for the last hour and a half. How do I look? Berenger could not help but smile as he pulled her into his arms, shut the door, and kissed her passionately. After over a minute of making out, Berenger broke away and gave her the answer she was hoping for. "You're the most beautiful woman I have ever met in my life." Her heart nearly jumped out of her chest from the compliment her lover had given her. Berenger was honest when he said that, in the entirety of his 2 lives, the only woman he had ever met who came close to her natural beauty was Adela, and she was still a child. Maybe one day she could rival Linda, but for now, the young woman before him was the only woman on his mind. After spending an ungodly amount of time undressing Linda, Berenger finally got her onto his bed, where the two spent the night together, enjoying each other's warm embrace. Despite being already pregnant, Berenger tried his best to give her another child that night. After a night filled with passionate lovemaking, the two finally fell asleep early in the morning. It would not be for several hours before they awoke once more and began their daily routines. Chapter 44, Checking in on things. Berenger was currently in a sparring session with Eckhard with wooden swords. It had been quite some time since Berenger had first picked up the sword and had incorporated its training into his weekly exercise routine. By now he was starting to become competent in swordsmanship, at least from a fundamental level. Though Berenger still vastly preferred the use of a bayonet, he felt it was still necessary for him to master the fundamentals of swordsmanship. You never know when you might be forced to wield a sword in combat. Eckhard cut down with a vertical slash towards Berenger. The young lord quickly parried the blow before swiftly counterattacking. Ultimately, this action was dodged by Eckhard, who unleashed a flurry of blows that Berenger struggled to keep up with. After a few moments of intense sword fighting, Berenger was tripped to the ground and Eckhard pointed his sword at the young lord's vitals. Berenger was at a loss and yielded to his opponent. "Damn it. I yield once more." Eckhard chuckled as he stripped off his training gear and assisted Berenger up from the ground. After the two stashed away their equipment, they headed to the kitchen, where Berenger procured a liter of beer for each of the men. As a man of refined tastes from his previous life, Berenger was extremely dissatisfied with the quality of alcohol in this world. Aside from distilling alcohol for medical practices, he had recently begun distilling spirits for regular consumption. In fact, he had recently obtained a plot of land from his father to make a large and dedicated brewery with the intent to mass-produce a variety of beers and spirits. The fact that his favorite beers, being Doppelbock and Oktoberfest, did not exist yet in this world was a damn shame. Unfortunately, it would take him at least a year to brew the first batch of Doppelbock and close to it for Oktoberfest. Thus, for now, he regularly consumed light beer, which was common in this world. It was hard to enjoy his favorite meals to the fullest extent without his most treasured alcoholic beverages and the missing dishes that utilized chocolate or potatoes. Still, it was acceptable for now. He just feared that he would have to wait many years before he could once more taste some of his most favored cuisine that was sadly absent from his meals. After sharing a drink, the two men walked down to the training field, where they quickly got dressed in their combat attire and began to lead the troops for combat drills personally. Berenger commonly carried a flintlock musket, pistol, and a sidesword. If he lost the use of his primary weapon for whatever reason, he wanted a backup in case he was in immediate danger. Berengar's kit was relatively unique. He had a black leather bandolier that held 2 flintlock pistols and a sword belt that contained a simple sidesword. It was not the elegant sword that would later be his wedding gift from Ludwig and his workers. Instead, it was a rudimentary design that worked as an additional sidearm. His belt also contained the cartridge pouch, which held his paper cartridges for the musket. When you took into account his extra garish attire, he easily stood out from the other soldiers in his army, which was both good and bad. It made it easier for his troops to understand where their commander was, but it also made him a more noticeable target to his enemies. Nevertheless, the young lord stood by his troops and conducted firing practice with them. By now, the earliest troops had graduated basic training and were going through specialized training. The training field was constructed with makeshift buildings and barriers, acting as a simulated village for when they were in urban combat. The grenadiers would clear buildings by lobbing their grenades inside and waiting for the blast before storming in with their muskets loaded and ready with bayonets affixed. Berenger did not care about civilian casualties in a war zone. He only cared about how efficiently his army could handle the task with minimal casualties on his own side. As such, the tactics he used would be deemed excessive and possibly even war crimes in his past life. However, there were no such things in this feudal era, and he was free to conduct warfare as he saw fit. Line tactics, anti-cavalry tactics, urban warfare tactics, siege tactics, these were all things he wanted his men well accustomed to. The peaceful days he had lived in were quickly coming to an end, though Berenger had not received any recent updates on the king's status. It would not be long before the German-speaking regions found themselves embroiled in a bloody conflict for the succession of the title. It was even quite possible that the war could spread to the other regions of the Holy Roman Empire. Nevertheless, to an ambitious young man like Berenger, this war was an opportunity to seize power. When all was said and done and the war was over, the feudal powers of the German regions would be weakened and he would have the opportunity to rise like an eagle. As such, the young lord had a cruel smile on his face as he watched his men perform the tasks he required of them with ease. Soon a new era would rise, an era of steel and shot, an era of industry. After a long day of arduous training, Berenger returned to the village where he visited Gunther, who was overseeing his agricultural implementations. When he visited the man's farm, he saw that all of his advancements had been implemented and that Gunther's farm, in particular, was extraordinarily prosperous. With the introduction of animal-powered mechanization, the nearby farmlands were incorporated under his supervision as their previous workers began to shift to the industrial workforce. So many families working one plot of land was no longer necessary. Though these tools had not yet been mass-produced nor had they been outfitted to all of the farms across the village of Kufstein, the fact that Gunther and his large family alone were able to take care of such a large farm was a good sign of the future. When Gunther noticed Berengar's approach, he immediately stood at attention and smiled as he addressed the young lord. "My lord, the harvest this year is sure to be bountiful. The livestock is also growing in numbers now that they can be bred year-round." Berenger clasped the man on the shoulder as he greeted him. It had been some time since he checked up on his progress in person. "It is good to see you, old friend." "That is excellent news." Gunther smiled and accepted Berengar's greeting. "So what can I help you with, my lord?" Berenger smiled and began to walk around the farm, inspecting its progress in person while Gunther followed behind him. "Tell me, how is the implementation of the four-field system, phosphate fertilizer, and irrigation going across the barony's many farmlands?" Gunther kept track of the progress throughout the town, and word eventually spread from contact with the other townships and villages within the barony to Gunther. "As far as I know, your innovations are fully implemented here in the town of Kufstein. In the other regions, we have seen the four-field system and fertilizer being used. Though irrigation is on the rise, it will still be a few months before it is used across the board. Many of the unemployed farmers of the other regions are flocking to the town of Kufstein looking for work. As far as I'm aware, they fit in well with locals. Soon enough, this town may become a real city." Berenger smiled upon hearing such news. Clearly, construction was undergoing and the city development plan he had petitioned his father to use was currently going underway. Before long, a new city would appear here in the heart of Kufstein. Berenger had many plans underway to reduce squalor and homelessness. Keeping the city organized was a top priority. "That is exactly what I wanted to hear. Now tell me, Gunther, when will we see the new machines implemented into agriculture across the town?" Gunther smiled and shared the good news with Berenger. "Roughly 3 months, my lord, and the town's agriculture will be mechanized as you put it. Maybe a year later, the rest of the barony will follow suit." Berenger was pleased with this news. Hopefully, his barony would have mechanized agriculture powered by animals by the time the war broke out. If not, at least it would be close to it. He could not be happier with the way things were headed. After speaking with Gunther for a bit about what he had been up to since Berengar's last visit, the two parted ways for the day. Berenger still had to check up on Ludwig and the industrial sector. After returning to the industrial sector, it was a completely different sight from when he was last there. He now had 2 steel production lines, an arms factory, an armory, an agricultural equipment factory, and a textile factory. The industrial sector was bustling with hundreds if not thousands of workers who were hard at work producing the products needed to usher in the new age. The machinery used to produce equipment was all water-powered. Wherever necessary, assembly lines were in place to make the creation process smoother. As such, it was quite the operation. Berenger figured there was no city on the planet with such an advanced industrial sector. The best part is that it was growing by the day. When Berenger approached Ludwig's old shop, which was now his office, he saw the older man was hard at work looking at a set of blueprints Berenger had given him. The office was completely cluttered with designs, and paperwork was strewn about. Berenger knew the pains of paperwork all too well. After all, he had his nights filled with it. As such, he could empathize with the old man who was so hard at work that he did not notice Berengar's entry. It was not until Berenger cleared his throat that the man noticed the young lord standing in front of him. "My lord? I am sorry I did not see you there," Ludwig said as he rapidly rose to his feet. However, Berenger quickly signaled that he could sit down, and as such, Ludwig was only halfway out of his seat before he sat back down in his old leather chair. "What brings you here, my lord?" Berenger chuckled and looked over the paperwork Ludwig was currently going over before speaking his thoughts. "I am just checking in on things. How are you holding up?" Ludwig let out a deep sigh and vented his frustrations to the young lord, who he knew would take it in stride. "I am fine, just a little overworked is all, though I am sure you are the same way. Of course, I do not have a beautiful young lover to vent all my frustrations on at the end of every night." Berenger could not help but laugh at the old man's comments. It was true, he released any pent-up emotions through his nightly escapades with Linda, and as such always woke up refreshed. The same could not be said for everyone else. "So, how's it going with my factories?" Ludwig quickly smiled with a hint of pride on his face. His hard work was paying off. "What was the saying you used before? Everything is running like a well-oiled machine?" Berenger chuckled when he heard that phrase. It was definitely out of place in this medieval world. Still, he had been known to use idioms from his past life, which had caused confusion on several occasions. "That is good to hear. I see a lot of men working here. Are they properly paid and given the necessary rest breaks? Ludwig nodded with a big grin on his face as he answered Berengar's question. Of course, and they're quite thankful for it. Many of the new arrivals are men from the other regions of the barony, and they had expected to have been slaved to death here in the factories, like many of the miners used to be before you began to impose your reforms on the realm. Despite the hard work, they are quite happy about their pay and hours for the most part. Unfortunately, there will always be a few bastards complaining about their life no matter how good they have it. Berenger nodded at Ludwig's words. He spoke the truth. You could not please everyone in this world, but at least they were afforded a proper wage, working hours, and safety standards, which is more than could be said about the rest of the world at the moment. The exponential growth of his family's wealth from all of the business he had made over the past few months has allowed him to increase the workers' wages and set up performance bonuses. As such, a new middle class was finally forming in the region of Kufstein. Though it was still in its early stages, the barony of Kufstein was beginning to shift from the feudal era of nobles and peasants to an industrialized world with a multi-class structure. After having a few drinks like old times with Ludwig and talking about the past, present, and future, Berenger parted ways with his friend and returned to the castle. Everything was progressing smoothly now. All he needed was Lindy's report from the spy network she was managing, and he could finally call it a night. The life of an ambitious man was never idle. Berenger bathed before returning to his room. Before long, Linda approached as per usual, but before she could pounce into Berengar's embrace, he stopped her and asked her the question on his mind. So, how are things on your end? She instantly knew what Berenger was referring to and pouted before she sat down next to him. She exhaled deeply and gave him the latest report. Your network has penetrated the entirety of the barony and the vassals beneath your father. If anything even remotely similar to a plot against you appears, I will know about it. I've contacted my half-sister in Innsbruck and instructed her to set up a cell in her area. Before long, we will know everything that transpires in the seat of power of Tyrol. As for Ludolf, he is close to becoming a priest, and when he does so, he has orders to do as you have asked. Aside from that, your mouths are currently producing propaganda throughout the region about your exploits and inventions. They've come up with some interesting stories about how you are blessed by the divinity of Christ with knowledge of the future and will usher in a new era of peace and stability for the German people. I don't know who came up with that bullshit, but people are eating it up. After reporting to Berenger about her activities, she leaned into his chest and whispered in his ear. Have I been a good girl? Berenger smiled and stroked her glossy strawberry blonde hair before pushing her down upon the bed and whispered back to her. You have been a very good girl, and I think you deserve a reward. After which he spent the remainder of his waking hours with his lover's warm embrace. He wondered how long this peaceful and plentiful life could go on before the storm arrived. However, as of right now, that was not his concern. He needed to enjoy this time while it lasted. One thing was certain: his future would be filled with bloodshed, and that was not something he could escape now that he had embarked on the path to power. Chapter 45, Lambert's Birthday. Lambert awoke bright and early on this wonderful morning in the middle of July. Today was July 17th, 1417. In other words, it was the teenage boy's 16th birthday. Today he would finally become a member of adulthood in this feudal world. His wedding to Linda would be held in a fortnight, and he was not very excited for that day. Currently, his relationship with Linda was cold, to say the least. She no longer punished him for his mistakes and barely took an interest in him as a person. She often walked right by him as if he did not even exist. On the other hand, she had become increasingly close to his elder brother and rival. Ever since her father left the young beauty in charge of managing his transaction with Berenger, she had sought every opportunity to spend time with his brother instead of himself. Now Lambert may be considered quite dense when it comes to relationships with the opposite sex, but even he was beginning to suspect Linda was having an affair with his elder brother. He even began to doubt the parentage of his so-called child. He had never once confronted his fiancée despite his worries, as he was too fearful of the truth. The more he thought about such things, the more he began to convince himself it was the truth. After all, during his last attempt on Berengar's life, somehow the information was leaked to Berengar's militia that the young lord was in trouble, and they marched in the dead of night to Wildskana to save the bastard's life. To this day, he still had not caught the scoundrel who was responsible for leaking such information. Nevertheless, he could not bring himself to accuse Linda of such actions openly. After all, that would essentially be treason against the Count of Tyrol, who was her father. Lambert could not imagine Linda would betray her family for his brother, and thus his suspicions were kept in check. Still, he did not keep such thoughts in his head for long. He quickly got dressed as he rose out of his bed and decided to give his fiancée an early surprise. As such, he visited her quarters at the crack of dawn. However, when he knocked on her door, there was no response, which was quite worrisome. Thus he knocked louder and louder, but no matter how hard and loud he pounded on the woman's door, she did not respond. Lambert found that to be very strange. Where could she have gone at such an hour? Truth be told, she enjoyed a very early morning bath with her lover, but Lambert had no way of knowing this. As such, he waited at her door until she responded. Eventually, he saw Linda appear wearing her nightgown from the previous night, while her hair was damp as if she had just been in the bath. Her porcelain skin glistened under the light of dawn as it shone through the windows. The heavenly beauty looked at Lambert with shock as he stood outside her door, waiting for her arrival. Just how long had he been there waiting? Lambert was furious. Where had she been at such an ungodly hour, and why was she wearing her nightgown? Where the hell have you been? I've been standing here pounding on your door for 30 minutes. Linda frowned as she noticed the tone Lambert was taking with her, and she coldly snubbed her nose at him before trying to enter her door. However, Lambert grabbed a hold of his fiancée and shoved her against the wall, his eyes filled with rage as he pressed her head firmly against the cold stone doorway. I ask you a question. Linda returned his furious gaze with one of her own. However, after a few moments, her murderous gaze faded and she began to smile, which confused Lambert. Until he felt Berengar's iron grip rip into his shoulder, almost as if he were going to tear out the boy's clavicle. Lambert turned his head around with a horrified expression as he saw Berenger staring at him with a freezing glare. When the teenage boy looked into the eyes of his older brother, he could feel the cold gaze of death staring back at him. Thus he quickly released his grasp over Linda in fear. Berenger was also noticeably damp. However, that was not uncommon at this hour, as Berenger was known to wake up early and exercise heavily. He appeared to be in loose-fitting clothes he normally wore for such an occasion. Berenger still latched onto Lambert's shoulder and even dug his fingernails deeper into Lambert's doublet, inflicting pain on the boy. What do you think you're doing? Is that any way to treat your fiancée? Berengar's eyes were cold and expressionless. Yet his voice was thunderous and full of fury. This noticeably enraged tone held a hint of natural authority behind it and reminded Lambert of a tyrant sentencing a subject to death for an unforgivable crime. Berengar's eyes showed the indifference he felt towards Lambert's meaningless life, but his voice carried the weight of 1,000 stars. At that moment, Lambert felt like kneeling and begging for forgiveness, but he quickly grabbed a hold of his resolve and talked back to Berenger. After all, one day soon, he would be barren and Berenger would be a corpse. She's my fiancée. I can do what I wish with her. However, the moment he spoke those words, Berenger struck the boy with the back of his hand. It was such a violent blow that Lambert felt that he nearly lost a tooth from the impact. Berengar's icy gaze penetrated Lambert's soul, and the tone he now used was enough to awaken everyone who dwelled within this corridor. She's your fiancée and you will treat her with respect. Before Lambert could make a proper retort, he was struck again by Berengar's hand. Lambert was outraged that he was treated in such a manner, yet he did not dare say another word at this point. Instead, Berenger looked over to Linda, his tyrannical expression softening as he did so. Linda, are you okay? Lambert noticed that Berenger was incredibly informal with his fiancée, which further ignited the fire within his heart. Yet, he stood there and did nothing. Linda, on the other hand, was flushed with excitement. She had never seen Berenger so angry over the way someone had treated her before. She wanted to jump into his arms at that moment but knew she could not do so, for it would be inappropriate. As such, she merely nodded her head and bowed gracefully. I am fine, thank you for your assistance in this matter. Berenger nodded and smiled at Linda before turning his attention back to Lambert, where he grabbed a hold of the boy's hair and shoved his face into the cold stone floor. He decided to give the boy a stern warning. After all, he would not tolerate any violence towards his women. If you so much as lay a hand on her again, I swear to our Father in heaven that I will grind you up into sausage and feed you to the pigs. Do I make myself clear? Lambert tried to escape from his grasp but could not do so. Berenger had grown quite strong since he had been reincarnated into this world. Noticing Lambert's defiance, he slammed the boy's face into the stone floor once more and yelled at him. Do I make myself clear? Lambert nodded his head and hissed through his teeth in an absolute fit of rage. I understand. The ruckus in which this incident caused had awoken Henrietta, who, after exiting her room, witnessed her two brothers engaged in a bloody struggle and Linda standing in the corner sneering at Lambert's fate. If the little girl did not like Linda before, she despised her now. Thus she approached the scene and tried to coax her two brothers into settling their dispute peacefully. Big brothers. What's going on? Berenger did not notice Henrietta approaching until now, and after seeing the worried expression on the little Lola's face, he let go of Lambert, dragged him to his feet and patted him off. Nothing much, just some friendly wrestling, right Lambert? Lambert immediately noticed the deathly glare Berenger was giving him and agreed to the ludicrous excuse Berenger had come up with on the spot. Absolutely. Though Henrietta was still worried about the overall situation, she noticed that they had decided to act civil in her presence. Thus she approached them further, immediately switching the subject from whatever had caused such a scuffle. Lambert, I want pancakes for breakfast. Can we have pancakes? Though Lambert was a devious prick, he still had a soft spot for his little sister, much like Berenger, and had thus elected to put this feud to rest for now. As such, he smiled and patted Henrietta on the head before agreeing to her request. Sure, Henrietta, whatever you want. Henrietta ran into Lambert's arms and hugged him while staring down Linda with a look that said, I'm watching you. Linda was unfazed by the little girl's provocation, as she had seen it many times since her arrival. Despite her best efforts, she had proven incapable of building a bond with either of the women of Berengar's family. Which was unfortunate, but she would not lose any sleep over it. Truly, aside from Berenger, it was the women of the von Kufstein family who had the best intuition. Eventually, Adela also left her quarters and saw what was transpiring. Though she did not know what had occurred, she instinctively felt it was something serious. She would make sure to ask Berenger about it later. After concluding the violent scene, the five of them walked into the dining hall where they would await the arrival of the Baron and Baroness so that they could begin Lambert's birthday breakfast. Lately, Berenger had been ordering a beer with his breakfast, however today he suspiciously ordered a 2-liter flagon of milk to be brought to him. Despite his unusual behavior, nobody minded it. While drinking from his morning milk, Berenger could tell Lambert was glaring at him with a desire for revenge. Still, there was nothing the boy could do about it at this moment. Instead, he made a civil talk with the others. The group pretended as if the awkward scene in the corridor had never transpired. Lambert, on the other, was almost entirely certain that Linda was cheating on him with Berenger, but there was nothing he could do about it. Count Lothar would never believe his daughter would conspire against him and would probably have Lambert severely punished for suggesting such a thing. As such, all he could do was be cautious around her in the future. The group chatted for quite some time before the Baron and Baroness arrived. They were quite shocked to see that Berenger was here before them. Usually, he was either exercising or hard at work this early in the morning. Instead, he was sitting here peacefully conversing with the others. The Baron and Baroness sat down at the head of the table and ordered the food to be prepared and brought for them. While they waited for the food, they congratulated Lambert on his 16th birthday. Later that night, they would hold a coming-of-age ceremony for their second son. It was sure to be a festive occasion, one in which Berenger would take advantage of to cuck his brother to the fullest degree. He had plans to bed Linda in every part of the castle today without anyone knowing, including Lambert's bed. It was Berengar's way of saying happy birthday to his diabolical little brother who had already made multiple attempts on his life. Eventually, breakfast was served, and as Henrietta had suggested, German pancakes were one of the many delicacies served. Berenger, of course, dined entirely on wurst and sauerkraut. He would need a lot of protein if he were going to enjoy Linda to the extent he desired today. Thus he piled his plate with nothing but wurst and sauerkraut while drinking yet another giant 2L flagon of milk. Though the rest of the family was puzzled by his actions, Linda had an eerie suspicion about what he was planning for the upcoming hours and, for the first time, was slightly excited about Lambert's birthday. Adela looked at Berenger curiously, wondering why his breakfast was so weird. Berenger, are you not going to have anything else? Berenger shook his head and patted the girl's silky golden blonde hair. Sometimes a man has got to eat his wurst and sauerkraut. She did not know what to say, so she merely accepted his answer and moved on. As such, Berenger spent over an hour with his family discussing the schedule for the day while they feasted on their fabulous breakfast. Of course, he planned to be absent for most of it and only show up at the end drunk out of his mind. Still, he had prepared a gift for Lambert. The present he had planned for Lambert was the mini-balls he had used to kill the boy's assassins during his hunting trip. While cleaning up the corpses, he made sure to recover the mini-balls used to kill his opponents. He also added a fourth one which he had used to hunt a buck. The reason for this was simple: it was a symbolic gesture for used bullets for the 4 men-at-arms killed during the hunting trip. As long as Lambert thought the 4th bullet came from his assassins, it would intimidate the boy. Essentially, Berenger was using violence and intimidation to pursue his political aims. In other words, this was a symbolic act of terror against his enemies. This was only the beginning of the day in which Lambert entered adulthood. There were many things to come as Berenger played mind games with his brother on a day that was supposed to be filled with celebration. Instead, Lambert would only feel dread and terror as his older brother would torment him in more ways than had already occurred. Chapter 46, Lambert's Birthday 2. After finishing the extravagant breakfast, Berenger departed from the family. They had many plans to set into place and a luxurious feast to prepare for the coming night. As such, Berenger used this time to enact his plan with Linda. He had already enjoyed her company in the bath. So he met up with Linda in secret on several occasions that day in various parts of the castle where the couple released their carnal desires together. While that was going on, Lambert took out his pent-up fury on a training dummy with his longsword. The 16-year-old boy could not believe that today of all days he had been humiliated in such a manner by his brother. Though he had wanted to keep a close eye on Linda, the sly girl had absconded the moment breakfast was over, and despite his attempts, Lambert ultimately failed to track her down. The image of her perfect porcelain skin dripping wet with the bathwater as her nightgown clung tightly to her heavenly curves could not escape his mind. Though it would normally be a pleasant memory to have, the scene that transpired afterward where Berenger was equally damp did nothing but create paranoia as he continued to suspect a relationship between the two. The young lord wanted to get to the bottom of this, though he could not. Accusing Linda without evidence would only create further tension between him and her father. Not to manage the harm it would cause to the fragile relationship he currently had with his fiancée. Truthfully, he did not want to know the truth if it was what he suspected. The boy wanted to tear his own heart out as he slashed at the training dummy's neck, decapitating it with a perfectly placed strike. In his mind, he envisioned the scene of removing Berengar's head from his shoulders, and at that moment he felt cathartic. He swore to himself that sooner or later he would have his vengeance on his older brother for the pain and suffering that had been inflicted on him this day. Of course, it did not even enter the boy's mind that he had brought these things upon himself by conspiring against his brother for the inheritance. After a long training session, Lambert entered the bath where he cleansed his milky white skin from the sweat and grime accumulated throughout the violent display. As he gazed into his reflection within the pool of water, he could not help but feel inferior in appearance to his older brother. Though he had the charm of youth on his side, he did not have the princely features with which Berenger had been blessed. Instead, despite his youth, his face and body were more robust as he had the characteristics of a knight, which was attractive in its own right, and many women would prefer such a look. However, his fiancée obviously preferred the regal features of Berenger, which got under the boy's skin. He dashed the bathwater with his hand, causing a ripple to obscure the reflection before getting out of the pool of water and dressing in his attire. After getting out of the bath, he visited the kitchen where the chefs were busy baking a massive German cheesecake for the celebration that would occur later in the evening. He had no idea that Berenger and Linda were enjoying each other's embrace in his bed at this moment. Thus he continued to walk around the castle. Lately, he had noticed that the guards inside the castle had shifted from the usual troops adorned with brigandine and halberds to men garbed in the flamboyant attire of Berengar's militia while carrying their hand cannons. He was unaware that his father had selected Eckhart to be his next marshal, as it had not been publicly announced yet. However, unlike before when Lambert laughed at the peasants in their dirty clothes and their laughable hand cannons, their current equipment in which they issued began to intimidate Lambert. The men were clearly garbed in partial plate armor with a breastplate, backplate, gorget, and helmet, which were all made of blackened steel. These guards did not pay the slightest bit of attention to Lambert as he passed by. Lambert walked out upon the castle's ramparts and saw more of these men acting as sentries upon the castle's walls. They were currently in the process of aligning Berengar's cannons onto the ramparts. These cannons were not the 12-pound field guns used by the militia, but 24-pound siege cannons developed by Berenger and recently put into production with the intent of being static defensive guns mounted on the castle's walls. With Eckhart being made the marshal, even if it was not common knowledge at the moment, the man had begun to transition the old garrison into Berengar's training and re-outfitting them with the modern equipment. In truth, the men Lambert saw staffing the castle were the same men that always acted as the garrison. They were just equipped with the latest weapons of Berengar's design and were being trained in their use. Of course, some of Berengar's men had replaced those who had been purged from the castle garrison's ranks for being loyal to Lambert, but most of the troops stationed at Castle Kufstein were the same men who had always been there. After traveling across the castle observing the changes occurring, Lambert could not help but feel that Berenger was winning in the war. They were fighting for the succession of their father's title. Lately, his allies were beginning to back out of his plans after the death of Marshal Friedhelm, and hostile forces now surrounded him within his own home. Things were not going well for the youth, who was now in a difficult position. Count Lothar of Tyrol kept pressuring the boy into another assassination attempt on Berengar's life, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. Berenger had won the favor of the people. Thus he could no longer count on them to poison him. The castle guard who was loyal to himself had now been replaced by forces loyal to Berenger, and the man had quite possibly won over his fiancée and was using her to spy on him. As long as Berenger remained in Kufstein, it would be challenging to claim his life. Worse yet, Lambert was now aware that rumors were spreading of Berengar's divine powers to see the future, and that the inventions he had implemented were gifts from God to the people of Germany that would lead them into a new era. Many of the common folk were beginning to treat him like he was some saint. Suddenly Lambert had an epiphany: if he could not get the people to turn on Berenger, and the feudal powers were no longer supporting Lambert, there was only one potential ally he could call upon, which had enough power and authority to end Berengar's life. A devilish smile appeared across Lambert's face as he realized that this war was far from over. If he could gain the Church's support and accuse Berenger of heresy, then it did not matter if he was a baron's son and heir. The Inquisition had the power and authority to deal with any potential heretics, no matter their social status. As such, he quickly rushed to his room to draft a letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck to make accusations of heresy against his elder brother. By the time Lambert reached his room, Berenger and Linda had already moved on to another part of the castle to continue their day of debauchery. As such, Lambert was entirely unaware of what had recently transpired in his own bed. He quickly got to his desk and pulled out parchment, a quill, and some ink, where he began to draft a letter for a plea of assistance from the bishop. In this letter, Lambert brought up concerns about Berenger being the embodiment of the 7 deadly sins and consorting with witches and demons to gain forbidden knowledge that had allowed him to invent these new devices that were being implemented in Kufstein, and how Berenger was spreading blasphemy about his divinity. The list of concerns in which Lambert brought up was both extensive and almost entirely fictitious. After drafting the letter, he brought it to the local priest of the church within Kufstein. Currently, Deacon Ludolf was working alongside the priest on matters of the ecclesiarchy. Thus Ludolf, a high-ranking member of Berengar's spy network and trusted ally, was present when Lambert rushed in to gain the signature of the local priest for his approval of these concerns. Father, I have some concerns about my brother's erratic behavior lately and have decided to draft a formal inquiry to the bishop so that we may discover the truth about these matters. I would like you to read about my concerns and give your support. The priest smiled when he saw Lambert. The boy was considered a pious and graceful youth worthy of the title of baron. Unfortunately, he was born the second son and thus would not inherit the lands. The priest's opinion of Berenger was not as high as Lambert's. After all, Berenger had only shown his face in the church once in the past few months. He was beginning to believe that the young man had become an apostate. When the priest read the letter Lambert had drafted, it was as if his suspicions were confirmed. Without any evidence for the claims in which Lambert had presented, the priest signed away his endorsement on the spot. It would be good for an unfaithful wretch like Berenger to be removed from his position, especially if these concerns turned out to be legitimate. The old priest smiled at Lambert and patted the boy on the shoulder. Lambert, my child, you have always been a faithful servant to the Lord, and I will gladly endorse your letter to the bishop. If what you say is true, there is a dire need for the Inquisition to get involved. We can only pray that the devil and his worshippers are routed out from the halls of your ancestors and that the glory of God can be returned to these lands. Lambert smiled gracefully and bowed to the priest. Thank you, Father. I knew I could count on your support in these troubling times. Afterward, the priest saw Lambert off as he raced back to the castle to send the letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck. When he returned, he was given an odd stare by Ludolf, who could not help but voice his concerns. Father, you cannot possibly believe that a single thing written in that letter was the truth. It is obvious the boy is scheming to take over his brother's position as heir to the barony. The priest frowned at Ludolf as he chastised him greatly for his words. Whether it is true or not is of no concern of the church. If Berenger were to inherit his father's position, he would use the power in his hands to be rid of the Church's influence. We cannot allow such ideas to take hold over the people's minds, especially the nobility who stand to benefit from them. It is better to have a God-fearing baron like Lambert in charge who will obey the will of the papacy than a godless heathen like Berenger who would challenge the authority of the Holy See. At that moment, Ludolf knew everything Berenger had said about the church was true. They were corrupt beyond measure. They were willing to torture a seemingly righteous man to death over nonsensical claims simply because he posed a minor threat to their power. These words by the priest of Kufstein ultimately convinced Ludolf that the church needed to be reformed. However, he stood there in silence, simply nodding his head at the priest's words. For now, he would have to warn Berenger of the danger that lies ahead. Ludolf would one day come to realize that this one decision by the authorities of the church would cause Berenger to view the papacy as the greatest obstacle in his rise to power and would cause endless bloodshed in the struggle for secular authority. After Lambert returned to the castle, he quickly sent the letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck, though it would take time to approve the Inquisition's interference in Kufstein. Lambert was certain that this action would lead his brother to his demise. For in his mind, how could a lowly baron's heir defy the might of the Inquisition? If Lambert knew what his brother would have in store for the Church's forces upon their arrival, he would have soiled himself in fear of the mad lengths to which Berenger was willing to enact to ensure his dominance. Chapter 47, Lambert's Birthday 3. After successfully sending the letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck, Lambert had a wide smile on his face. His otherwise foul mood had taken a turn for the better as he could finally see an end in sight for his brother. He also wrote another letter informing Count Lothar of Tyrol of his plans to involve the church in their schemes. By branding Berenger as a heretic, they would essentially get the entirety of the Christian world to unite against him. Or so they believed. At the very least, the Inquisition would not let the young man go so easily. It was not until the evening that Lambert finally left his room, where he returned to the kitchen to see his family gathered around the table with a German cheesecake produced for him. It was a relatively recent tradition that popped up in the German world, but it was not until Berenger arrived that it had spread to Kufstein. After all, the man wanted an excuse to eat cake. Since it was a tradition that was bound to spread across Europe eventually and had already taken root in some areas of the German-speaking regions, Berenger took it upon himself to introduce it to Kufstein for Lambert's birthday. It would seem like he was generous. In reality, he just wanted an excuse to cheat on his diet and feast on the delicious cake. It was just a pity that chocolate did not exist in Europe yet. Otherwise, he would have had his chefs cook up some German chocolate cake, which Berenger was accustomed to having during his childhood birthdays from his previous life. Berenger, of course, took the liberty to add the candles himself and start that tradition a few centuries early. It was a birthday, and Berenger would be damned if he did not do it right. It truly did not matter if it was for his greatest enemy. An excuse to start a tradition is an excuse to start a tradition. The family sat around the table and lit the candles, where Berenger stared at his little brother with a gentle smile. Make a wish, Lambert, then blow out the candles. As such, Lambert thought to himself. Make a wish? I don't see the point, but whatever, I wish you would drop dead. Afterward, he did what Berenger had said and exhaled deeply onto the candles, snuffing their flames in the process. Unfortunately for him, his wish did not become a reality. Afterward, everyone lined up to give the presents they had acquired to Lambert. From his mother Gisela, he received a fine doublet manufactured in one of Berengar's factories. From his father, he received a new steel longsword superior to the one he previously had, as it was made from high-quality, high-carbon Bessemer steel. He received a childish drawing of the family from Henrietta, and from Linda he received nothing. His fiancée had not given him a gift at all. Well, technically she had. He was just not aware of it. Her gift to Lambert was cheating on him with his older brother in his own bed. Finally, it was Berengar's turn, and everyone expected him to give something outlandish to Lambert. After all, Berenger was in charge of the industrial sector within the realm. Yet before Berenger gave him the box which contained his present, he said something which unnerved Lambert. My present is a trophy from my hunting trip in which I went on with our father not too long ago. Open it up and see what it is, little brother, I'm sure it will amuse you. When Berenger said those words, he had a devilish grin on his face which gave Lambert a bad feeling about the present within his grasp. His hands began to tremble as he slowly unwrapped the box and looked inside. In the small box were 4 mini-ball projectiles, slightly bent out of shape and stained with blood. It was truly a curious thing. However, the words that came out of Berengar's words spread terror to every corner of Lambert's mind. I managed to dig those out of the corpses of my kills. It's a trophy to the success of my hunt, and I would like to dedicate such a meaningful part of my past to you, little brother. It was a weird present to give to Lambert on his birthday, and thus it confused everyone except for Lambert, Linda, and Berenger. He kept looking up between the malicious smile on Berengar's face and down at the bloodstained bullet-like projectiles in his hands. It instantly clicked in his head what Berenger meant. Lambert had sent 4 assassins to deal with Berenger on the hunt, and there were 4 bloody pieces of lead in this box. Did that mean that Berenger had killed those men after all? That they had not run away in the first place? How was that possible? According to Berenger, the hand cannons did not have a very effective range and a long reload speed. How did he manage to get off 4 shots and perfectly kill all 4 men? This was very clearly a threat by Berenger to Lambert, and there were only 3 people in the room who realized exactly what Berengar's intent was with this gift. However, the more Lambert tried to rationalize it, the more he realized Berenger couldn't kill the men with these lead balls. His brother was probably aware of the fact that Lambert had sent assassins after him and was messing with his mind. It was not as if Berenger could fire his hand cannon at the distance of a longbow. That would be absurd. Thus the 16-year-old boy finally calmed himself down and returned Berengar's gesture with a gracious smile. "Thank you, Berenger, I will treasure it always." Berenger smiled back to Lambert and nodded in approval. "I am sure you will." To everyone else in the room, it would appear that the 2 brothers were quite friendly to one another and were on good terms. Sadly, such a thing could not be further from the truth. If they knew that the 2 boys were fighting tooth and nail to find a way to put one another in the grave, it would surely cause a disturbance. After accepting his gifts, Lambert immediately dug into his cheesecake with a satisfied expression. He did not know the genius who invented such a thing, but it was truly a slice of heaven. The family mingled together as they discussed the future while snacking on the cake. Finally, Berenger mentioned something sure to antagonize his little brother. "So, little brother, I hear your wedding has been moved up. It should be just around the corner now that you're an adult, should it not?" Gisella's expression instantly stiffened as she stared menacingly at Linda. By now, Linda was used to such glances from the Baroness and could not care less. Lambert, on the other hand, nearly choked on his cake. Berenger was clearly trying to aggravate him, especially now that Lambert had suspicions about Lindy's potential relationship with his brother. However, this marriage was something he could not back out of now. Not unless he could prove he was not the father of Lindy's child. However, that would be not easy to do, and he did not even know where to begin to do so. Essentially, it was her word against his, and her father would never believe that the girl had been impregnated by a man other than her fiancé. Of course, she would never admit to such a thing, and as such, he was basically screwed. The girl he once admired as the most beautiful woman in the world was not only an enormous bitch, but quite the slut too. At least in Lambert's eyes. From Berengar's perspective, she was an incredibly loyal woman. She was chaste until the night they met, and the only reason things went down the path they had was because she tried to drug him. Eventually, Lambert smiled and hissed between his teeth as he could not think of an escape route. "Yes, I look forward to it every day. Isn't that right, dear?" he said as he glanced over to Linda, hoping to get a reaction from the girl. Now that they were both 16 years old, she no longer held that seniority over him. Linda looked over at Lambert with disgust in her eyes. However, despite her true feelings, she pretended to be kind to Lambert since it was his birthday and his family was around. "Of course, I wouldn't want any other man as my husband." The only person in the room who bought that line was Sieghard. Even Adela could tell the young woman's disgust towards her fiancé. It was not that she was a bad actor, it is just that all of the women in the room already had some suspicion about where Lindy's affection truly lied, and Berenger obviously knew her true self better than anyone. Gisela truly detested the young woman who her second son was about to marry. If she had the authority, she would have cast the girl out from her home long ago. Hopefully, when Berenger became regent, she could convince him as a mother to use his authority to move Lambert and his detestable wife into one of the estates within the town of Kufstein, which were built for the lodgings of the noblemen who visited for Berengar's engagement ceremony. Though she suspected that Berenger was having an affair with Linda, surely the boy would end things once the girl had been married to his brother. Of course, in reality, Lambert would be excluded from the best parts of marriage, as Linda would use her pregnancy as an excuse not to sleep with Lambert and would continue to maintain her distance from him even after marriage. After this morning's scramble with Berenger, he truly feared his brother would feed him to the pigs if he forced himself upon the girl. The look in Berengar's eye was inhuman and murderous with intent. He had no doubt Berenger would be so cruel to his own flesh and blood, especially since they were already both plotting each other's downfall. After a long day of festivities and celebration, the family finally returned to their rooms. As always, Berenger attempted to get some work done before going to bed. He was currently designing public schools to be built in every populated region of the barony, and the schedule in which not only the children but the adult peasants would have to go through to learn their basic education. It was an expensive investment that would take away from the massive productivity he was currently experiencing, but it would be worth it in the long run. An educated populace was a productive populace. Not to mention he would be able to use the public school system to indoctrinate the population of Kufstein into being loyal to him and his reformist cause. Thus among the list of blueprints he was creating was the printing press, so he could give everyone a copy of the Bible to study in their own time and of course the education materials they would need to cover as a class. The only problem he faced was finding educated individuals to teach the masses. Though he was certain that among the contacts he had made during his engagement ceremony he could find some educated and pampered nobles to act as teachers for a few hours each day. Thus he spent the remainder of his work hours establishing a proper curriculum, designs for school buildings, the printing press, and of course, the education manuals for each student. By the time Linda knocked on his door, it was well past midnight. Though they were both worn out from their combined exercise throughout the day, they would still enjoy each other's comfort as they spooned together and fell to sleep in one another's arms. After all, it had been a pretty exciting day for the couple. In the coming days, Linda would begin building a case against Lambert for the man she loved. Time was of the essence, and it was best to acquire these things before Berenger became regent, thus he would be able to arrest Lambert the very minute he gained the power of a baron. However, for now, the two were exhausted from their previous playtime and simply held onto one another's loving embrace and fell asleep in each other's arms. Whatever threats crossed their path in the future, the couple would face it together. Chapter 48, Gathering Evidence. Linda sat quietly at a table enjoying a cup of tea. Currently, she was within the local tea shop that had recently appeared in the town of Kufstein. Sitting in front of her was Ludolf, who was currently dressed in dark robes whose hood concealed his appearance. At the moment he was informing the spymaster of the information which he had received about Lambert's newest plot against Berenger. To any onlookers, they were merely a young lady and young man enjoying tea together. However, the gravity of the topic in which they discussed in hushed voices was immense. Ludolf took a sip from his tea before expressing his concerns to the woman who handled Berengar's spy network. Lambert has written a letter to the Bishop of Innsbruck which the head priest of Kufstein has sponsored. It contains many accusations labeled against Berenger. The most important charge is that he lies with witches and consorts with demons. When the bishop reads this letter, he will send for the Inquisition to investigate the matters. As far as the Inquisition is concerned, you probably are aware that they do not care what the truth is and will try to execute Berenger as a heretic in order to solidify the Church's power in the region. Linda was shocked when she heard such news. Lambert was truly getting desperate if he tried to rope the church into his schemes. Though after thinking it through, such actions did not surprise her. After all, the boy had been cornered by Berenger lately. Many of his allies were beginning to think twice about supporting him any further, and even Lindy's father, the Count of Tyrol, was beginning to think about cutting his losses. If she had not become pregnant, Count Lothar would have dropped his support for Lambert. After coming to her senses, Linda smiled and thanked the deacon for the important information he had provided her. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I will inform the sovereign of Lambert's schemes. I trust he will have a sufficient answer to the problem when it rears its ugly head. Is there anything else I should be aware of? Ludolf smiled at Linda as there was more good news that the man had for the woman. He took a bite out of the pfeffernuss cookie before continuing with his report. There's an ally of Lambert's who is starting to have second thoughts. If we can get to him and convince him to switch sides, he may be able to testify about Lambert's misdeeds. Linda eyed Ludolf cautiously as she thought about his words before speaking up. Who is he? And how did you come by this information? Ludolf chuckled as he sipped from his teacup before responding to Lindy's inquiry. That foolish boy Sir Ingbert has confided with me his transgressions and has sought advice on how to proceed. After the death of Ulrich and Friedhelm, he is beginning to fear the worst. If he finds out that Lambert's own fiancée is on Berengar's side, then he will no longer have the confidence to support Lambert and may even turn on him entirely. Linda mulled over Ludolf's suggestion as she took a sip from her glass. It was a risky plan. If Ingbert learned where her allegiance truly lied, he could instead report it to Lambert or her father, which would put her in a precarious position. He would need to be silenced and quickly if he were to make such a foolish mistake. Ultimately, she concluded that the potential reward outweighed the risk involved in such a scheme and nodded in approval of Ludolf's plan. Is there anything else I should know? Ludolf did have one more piece of important information to inform the listener about. As such, he smiled underneath his dark hood, which was unnoticeable by any bystanders, and spilled the details. The von Thiersee family is investigating the marshal's death for whatever reason. Lambert is their biggest suspect. As such, I have communicated with the speaker of the cell in Thiersee, and he has been using his forces to lead the von Thiersee family to the conclusion that Ulrich's treason had something to do with Friedhelm's passing. As such, they have dispatched an emissary to Wildskana under the guise of diplomatic relations. I have no idea what such an investigation may yield, but it is something to be wary of. Linda finished her tea and snacks before standing up from the table preparing to leave. If that is all, then I have work to do until we meet again, speaker. Ludolf nodded at Linda as she left the tea shop. Afterward, he snuck back to the church where he continued his work as a deacon. Linda, on the other hand, had many plans to set into motion with these developments. She may fully be able to obtain the evidence needed to bring charges against Lambert. However, Berenger would never do such a thing so long as his father remained in power. However, the moment the old baron left for the battlefield, leaving Berenger in control of the barony, he would have what he needed to arrest his brother and bring an end to this feud once and for all. For now, the young woman embarked towards the manor of the Heltzer family where Ser Ingbert was currently residing. She would need to convince him to switch sides if things were to progress the way she had envisioned. As such, she quickly got into a carriage and traveled across the barony to the land. Hopefully, she would be able to return to Kufstein Castle by the end of the day, so she could spend the night with her lover and master. She did not wish to spend the night halfway across the region in some lowly manner. Thus she wore a pouting expression as she sat in the carriage, which traversed the land at a relatively stable pace. Chapter 49. Gathering Evidence 2. While Linda was off traveling towards the Heltzer Manor, Lord Arnulf von Thiersee was currently standing in Wildskanaw Castle with his retinue. He had just arrived and was currently paying his respects to the new Lord of Wildskanaw, who just so happened to be a small child. It was a pity that both of these two lords had lost their fathers so close to one another. Granted, they were under vastly different circumstances, but he could understand the pain the von Wildskanaw family was currently going through. Though the lord did not bow to the child known as Theobald von Wildskanaw, he still acted respectfully. After all, they were two lords of the same status, and as such there was no need for overbearing formality. Lord Theobald, I offer my condolences in the loss of your father, Ulrich. I have come to pay my respects to your family. Theobald was nearly 8 years old. Despite this, he had been under strict tutelage by his regent and was aware of the matters occurring across the realm. Thank you, Lord Arnulf, that means a lot to me. I also wish to say how sorry I am that your father passed so suddenly. He was truly a staple of the realm. You are free to stay here for the time being, and I will have my servants attend to your every wish. I am happy to see that there are still men of conscience who will not forsake my family for the foolish actions of my late father. Arnulf smiled at the flattery. Clearly, the regent had prepared such an elaborate statement for such a small child. As such, Arnulf decided to entertain the regent's efforts and returned the young boy's compliments. You are wise for your age, and I am happy to see that you have good counsel. I will take you up on your offer and enjoy my stay to the best of my abilities. I thank you for the hospitality you have shown me. After exchanging pleasantries, Arnulf was led to his quarters, where he spent the remainder of the day acting cordially with the family. During the evening, he dined with them and found that the widow of Ulrich was still grieving heavily for her husband's passing. She had on several occasions made treasonous statements blaming Berenger for the death of Ulrich and cursing his name. She had completely forgotten that she was in the presence of a guest and had let her true feelings about the future baron come forth. It was not until it was late at night that he decided to sneak out of his quarters and personally investigate the late Lord Ulrich's personal study. As such, he quietly sneaked through the corridors of the castle. He was extra cautious about patrols that were ongoing throughout the night. On one occasion, he was nearly discovered by a guard who was following his route. If it were not because the man was half asleep, Arnulf would have a difficult time explaining his actions. Eventually, he found his way to the location where he desired entry without getting caught in the act. After picking the lock, Arnulf snuck inside with a small oil lamp in his hand. It was only after the door was properly closed behind him that he lit the lamp to provide illumination in his search for evidence. After spending several hours searching through every scrap of paper in the office, Arnulf realized that even if Ulrich's treason was somehow connected to his father's death like he was led to believe, all evidence of his treacherous actions would have been seized by Sieghardt's forces when they searched for proof of his guilt. Or so the man thought. However, after stumbling over a fallen chalice, the man clumsily bumped into the bookcase where a Bible fell to the ground. However, when the Bible flopped to the ground, it revealed that its contents had been hollowed out, and hidden inside the holy book was a small black ledger that was unmarked. After flipping through the ledger, Arnulf could not believe his eyes. The book was a secret journal kept by Ulrich with details of his shadowy dealings with Lambert and the Count of Tyrol. Every conversation Ulrich ever had with the two men about their plans to eliminate Berenger was recorded in great detail within this ledger. The reason this book existed must have been as a form of leverage if Ulrich were ever caught and left to hang by his sinister partners. He would use this as a means to buy his life. Unfortunately, the man had perished on the battlefield, and he was never able to trade such valuable information for his own security. Due to it being hidden in a Bible within the bookcase, Sieghardt's men who handled the investigation never even thought to open it. The most important part of this information was that Arnulf's father was never mentioned in the book. As a loyal son who considered his father the marshal, the personification of justice, Arnulf concluded that Lambert had assassinated his father because his father had discovered the boy's plot to commit fratricide and usurp the barony. He had to get this ledger to the baron as quickly as possible if this information was true. However, the more he thought about it, he figured Berenger must be aware of his brother's attempt on his life. If he handed the ledger over to Berenger to act as evidence against Lambert, Arnulf and his family would most likely be able to reap more rewards. Due to a misconception created out of ignorance of his father's moral failings, The von Thiercy family would from this day forward become ardent supporters of Berenger and all of his actions. After tidying up the study to make it appear as if he were never there, Arnulf snuffed his oil lamp and returned to his room, where he carefully read through the entire contents of the ledger he had found. It was truly a damning piece of evidence, one that, when combined with the in which Berengar's network had collected, would allow Berenger to build an ironclad case against Lambert. The Lord had no way of knowing that he would be aiding his father's killer in his plans to ensure dominion over the realm. Chapter 50. Gathering Evidence 3. During the time in which Arnulf von Thiercy stayed at the castle in Wildskana, Linda had visited the humble manor of the Heltzer family, a family of landed knights in service to Baron Sieghard and the von Kufstein family. When Lady Linda von Habsburg knocked on the door to the manor, Sir Ingbert was surprised to see her presence. Never in a million years would he imagine that the angel of his heart would knock upon his own door. Yet here she was, appearing before him like a goddess descending from the heavens. The young man quickly got a hold of himself and allowed her access to his home. He immediately prepared some wine for the young woman, whom he greatly desired, and inquired about her reason for visiting. "I must say I am shocked to see you here. Is there a reason, in particular, you have come to my humble abode?" Linda looked around to see if anyone else was nearby before asking her question. Her flawless porcelain skin glistened under the sunlight that shone through the windows. "Is anyone else here?" Ingbert shook his head as he put down the glass of wine on the table in front of the young enchantress before taking a sip of his own. However, to his dismay, she refused the drink. "I am sorry, I am afraid that I am not able to drink right now." She immediately motioned to her stomach at first. He did not understand what she meant, but after a moment, he quickly realized the secret she was trying to tell him. His face immediately became flushed as he understood what she meant. He cursed at Lambert inwardly in his mind for being lucky enough to impregnate such a heavenly beauty. Eventually, he forced himself to put on a smile and hissed through his teeth. "Lambert is a lucky man." Linda could not help but smile at the man's appearance. His envy was incredibly obvious, but surely the young man before her had to know that she was in a league far above his own. After shoving the glass of wine away from herself, Linda began to twist the boy to do her bidding. "That's actually why I'm here. I heard that you are thinking of backing out of Lambert's plots. Is this true?" Though Ingbert did not want to admit his cowardice in front of the woman he lusted after, he had no choice. The way she stared at him sent him into a trance where he could not deny her wishes. "It's true. So has Lambert sent you here to ensure my loyalty?" The thought of how she came to acquire such knowledge did not even cross the dull boy's mind in the slightest. Instead, Linda used the boy's affection for her to win him over to Berengar's cause. Actually, it is quite the opposite. Ingbert stared at her with a blank expression. He could not tell in the slightest what she meant by such a thing. Before he knew it, Linda had put her acting skills to work and had begun to form a tear in her eye as she cast a line for Ingbert to bite into. "Lambert is an exceptionally cruel man. He has beaten me on many occasions. In my despair, I ran into the arms of his brother Berenger, the very man my fiancée conspires to kill. I'm in fear for my life as I have begun to suspect that Lambert knows of my relationship with his brother and will stop at nothing to get revenge. I beg of you, please switch sides and help Berenger obtain the evidence he needs to lock that monster away." By now, the waterworks were in full effect, and they had begun to cascade down Lindy's divine heart-shaped face, the sight of which instantly enraged Ingbert. He could not accept that Lambert had abused such a kind and caring woman, driving her into the arms of someone like Berenger. Though Ingbert was not particularly fond of Berenger, the fact that Lambert would lay his hands on Linda outraged him, and Lindy's acting was more than enough to convince him to switch sides. As such, he tried to placate the crying woman before him. "I promise, I will do everything in my power to make it so that bastard will never lay his hands on you again. With what I know, I can act as a witness against Lambert's treachery and ensure that he is in no position to harm you or your child." Linda continued to sniffle, but after some time, the tears ended as she questioned Ingbert's sincerity. "Really?" Ingbert nodded with a foolish grin on his face as he confirmed his allegiance. "Of course." After hearing that her plan was a rousing success, Linda jumped into Ingbert's arms and hugged the young man platonically as she thanked him for his aid. Thank you so much. I knew I could count on you." Ingbert had no way of knowing that he was being manipulated by a pretty face and the man behind her. Instead, he enjoyed the brief moment Linda wrapped her arms around him with a satisfied grin on his face. However, the moment was far too short for his liking, and she quickly escaped from his grasp. After doing such a thing, she internally felt like she needed a bath. After recovering his senses, Ingbert voiced his concerns. "Do you wish to stay the night? I'm certain I can find some space for you." Linda shook her head and put on a solemn expression. "I'm afraid not. If I'm gone for too long, Lambert will begin to suspect I am up to something. I must return to the castle quickly, or else I will have to suffer his wrath." Though Ingbert felt dismayed that her stay was so brief, he was happy just to assist the young lady and would soon meet with Berenger to discuss Lambert's downfall. Just like that, Berenger had gained another key piece of evidence in his future efforts to bring justice upon Lambert and his dastardly schemes. After leaving the manor, Linda got into her carriage and rode off towards Kufstein Castle. She could not wait to tell her master the good news. Hopefully, he would reward her for the efforts she had to go to. Of course, he also might punish her for hugging another man, even if it was just a friendly gesture. Berenger was quite possessive with his property either way. She would enjoy the treatment she received from the man she loved. Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today.